Chapter 276. The middle-aged Taoist said expressionlessly, "That's right." Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment before holding his sabers. He bowed and said, "Su Fengnian greets the immortal elder. My father once said that Mount Longhu was the best in the mystic enlightening realm, not Taoist Qi who ascended to immortality 50 years ago." The middle-aged Taoist was indifferent as he looked down at Su Fengnian and the talisman. Su Fengnian bowed and asked, "I'm curious as to why the immortal elder can ascend to immortality but not enter the heavenly gate but not enter it?" The middle-aged Taoist said calmly, "My surname is Zhao. The same surname as the emperor?" These words were enough to explain many mysteries. Why did the previous great celestial master not hesitate to exchange his life to extend the life of the previous emperor? Why did the imperial court continue to confer titles to Mount Longhu and raise the status of this ancestral court? Why was the current great celestial master Zhao Danping like a fish in water in the capital? Why was Mr. White Lotus favored by the emperor? Su Fengnian's hands trembled as he looked up and gritted his teeth. The immortal elder is already an outsider. The Taoist whose age and cultivation were unfathomable smiled faintly. "Have you heard of the saying that when a man achieves immortality, even his chickens and dogs ascend to heaven? Besides, I haven't ascended to immortality yet, so what's wrong with protecting my descendants?" Su Fengnian asked again and again, "Immortal elder, may I know what lesson you have for coming here with your out-of-body primordial spirit?" The middle-aged Taoist did not answer the question. Instead he pointed behind Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian did not dare to turn his head as he was afraid that he would not know how he died. The Taoist frowned and said, "Although I'm not a saint, I'm not going to argue with a junior like you. Back then Su Xiao had the same principle. My descendants have their own fortune and misfortune. As long as no one deliberately deviates, even if the country is destroyed, I won't interfere with the heavenly secrets." Su Fengnian turned his head and widened his eyes. Unknowingly, a giant python with a red tongue appeared behind him, confronting the heavenly dragon Zhang Su. The giant python versus the dragon. The giant python that seemed to have occupied the entire mountain was fearless. Su Fengnian was in awe of the golden dragon, but for some reason he was not afraid of the giant python. Instead, he felt a sense of intimacy from the bottom of his heart. When the giant saw Su Fengnian turned around, it lowered its head and rubbed its head against Su Fengnian's forehead. The heavenly dragon seemed to be enraged by the giant python. The purple gas it breathed out grew thicker and its body rose higher, revealing half of its body. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws as it roared furiously at the peak of Kuanglu Mountain. The purple gas seemed to have materialized and condensed into a purple pillar that charged forward. "I don't care if you're a celestial being or an immortal. There's no reason for me, Su Fengnian, to accept my fate and beg for death." Just as Su Fengnian was about to draw his saber, the giant python at the top of the coiling dragon mountain raised its head and straightened its body. It bit the purple pillar of dragon qi and crushed it in an instant. In a trance, the middle-aged Taoist priest, who seemed to be standing on top of all living things, just watched coldly from the sidelines. The heavenly dragon roared. Su Fengnian saw that there were no longer any stars in the sky. The clouds rolled and surged like raging waves. They gathered above the heavenly dragon's head, layer upon layer, becoming increasingly dense. Fengnian. Su Fengnian was still terrified by the invincible might of the golden sky dragon when he heard a familiar voice. He turned his head abruptly and saw that person. At this critical moment of life and death, he was oblivious to everything in the world and was only crying. A white-robed woman's sleeves fluttered in the wind. She had once taken her sword out of the sword tomb. She had once played the fish dragon drum in white clothes. She had once punished him by holding a book against the wall. She had once worn the cloth shoes personally made by Su Xiao and entered the imperial palace alone. Su Fengnian's voice was hoarse as he carefully called out, "Mother?" He was afraid that if he shouted too loudly she would disappear with the wind. Her body was transparent, and she slowly floated over like a fairy from Dunhuang. She floated in the air as if she wanted to caress her son's cheeks. The middle-aged Taoist finally spoke. He snorted coldly and said, "You're going against the heavenly Tao." He waved his sleeves and smashed the giant white python's head onto the ground. "Wu Su, go to the Yellow Springs." He waved his sleeves again and a strong wind blew. The white-robed woman who was only a few feet away from Su Fengnian retreated with the wind. The woman raised her head and sneered, "Zhao Huangqiao, why didn't you enter the heavenly gate?" Su Fengnian saw his mother's body gradually becoming blurry, turning into a stream of light and dissipating. He was completely mad. His eyes were red as he stretched out his hand to grab her. The middle-aged Taoist was, after all, a well-deserved earth immortal. She, who had already defied the heavenly Tao, moved forward with difficulty and allowed her soul to dissipate. She stretched out her hand and held Su Fengyin's hand. The middle-aged Taoist's vast Taoist chi poured down from the sky. He raised his palm and said angrily, "The heavenly Tao is majestic. Demons retreat." Instantly, thunder rumbled. The Taoist slammed his palm down. The Taoist carried out justice on behalf of the heavens. The white-robed woman, from her feet to her waist, slowly disappeared like dust along with the giant python. Su Fengyin, whose face was full of tears, shouted at the top of his lungs, "Mother!" She smiled and said kindly, "Fengyin, I can't take care of you anymore. I can't bear to part with you." Su Fengyin shook his head like a madman. In that instant, 20 years of his life flashed through his mind, disappearing in an instant. Until Li Chungang said that he had a sword to open the heavenly gate. Su Fengyin only felt that his acupuncture points were exploding, his meridians were exploding, his flesh was exploding, and his soul was exploding. Everything exploded. Even if I die today, what's there to be afraid of? My mother is dead. You damn Taoist even dispersed my mother's soul. Why can't I kill you? He turned to face the golden dragon and the middle-aged Taoist and roared, F***ck the heavenly Tao. I have a blade that can slay the dragon. Su Fengyin didn't have a blade in his hand. As soon as he said that, the giant python and fireflies gathered, and a snow-white divine weapon appeared in Su Fengyin's hand. I have a blade that can kill immortals. The blade cut through the air. The color of heaven and earth changed. There were no more dragons, no more immortals. Su Fengyin slowly opened his eyes. The top of Quanglu Mountain was clear. Li Chungang, Bluebird, and the others didn't come after hearing the news. Su Fengyin looked down. The divine talisman was still in his fingers, and the embroidered winter-spring thunder was inserted into the ground. Su Fengyin touched his cheeks. They were full of tears. So it was just a dream. Su Fengyin turned his head and squeezed out a smile. He looked at the silent void and murmured, "Mother, rest in peace." Then he turned his head and looked at the starry sky. Su Fengyin said word by word, "I have a blade that can kill the dragon." Chapter 277. Su Fengyin suddenly stood up and checked the flow of qi in his body. There was nothing unusual. The fourth floor was only the fourth floor. Just as he was about to pull out the embroidered winter-spring thunder and return it to its scabbard, he focused his mind and subconsciously leaned back until he was parallel to the ground. The tip of his foot kicked the scabbard of the spring thunder. The scabbard collided with the blade and broke through the ground. A dagger dipped in poison brushed past the tip of his nose. Su Fengyin held the spring thunder with his left hand and slammed his right palm on the ground. His body floated back 20 feet. After he stopped, he looked at the cliff and saw a slender figure leaping out with a dagger in her hand. She laughed and was not in a hurry to fight. She tilted her head and asked doubtfully, "Hey, how did you know that I would climb from the cliff to the top?" Su Fengyin stared at the elusive young assassin without blinking. He suppressed the anger in his heart and said calmly, "You can crawl out from under a horse, jump out from water, and jump down from the hole in the city gate. For the 1,000 taels of gold that the king of Jing and Zhaoheng paid you, what can't you do?" The young girl said, "Oh," and didn't say anything else. She looked at Su Fengyin, who was holding the dagger in his left hand with an expression that said, "I knew you were left-handed." Su Fengyin suddenly asked, "Did you see anything strange when you climbed up?" The young girl shook her head and said, "Climbing is boring." Su Fengyin had a complicated expression. He looked at the white sky and said helplessly, "Ha, young lady, you stabbed the dagger in both hands into the stone wall and climbed for an entire night?" After the young girl who was supposed to be in the prime of her youth assassinated Wang Mingyin with her dagger hand, it had caused a huge uproar in the Jianghu. The target of the assassination was the 11th in the world who had been famous for 20 years. This news was even more shocking than a certain beauty and a certain young master. In the Jianghu, the most powerful aphrodisiacs were always secret manuals, women, and fame. There was an endless stream of people chasing after them, especially the latter. Otherwise, how could there be so many martial artists in the Eastern Sea Martial Emperor city who desperately wanted to climb up the city gate tower? Being able to go up to the second floor was enough to ensure that one would not have to worry about wealth and glory for the rest of his life. It was not that Su Fengyin had never offered her 2,000 or 3,000 taels of gold, but she had never paid attention to him. What could he do? This time he thought that he had the old god of swords Li Chungang and the others to protect him, and in front of him was a natural barrier, so he could have a peaceful night. Who would have thought that even the sword cliff could not stop Miss Hehe? Su Fengyin could not understand. Was she really after the reward of 1,000 taels of gold? Or was there some unknown irreconcilable enmity? She tilted her head in another direction and asked, "Hey, why don't you call your lackeys to protect you?" Su Fengyin said bitterly, "If I had shouted, wouldn't you have fought with your life on the line? Isn't it because I want to see if I can bury the hatchet with Miss Hehe?" She shook her head and said seriously, "No need, you can shout it. At worst, after I stab you to death, I'll jump off the cliff. Wealth and honor are up to fate, and life and death are up to the heavens." Su Fengyin smiled bitterly. "No leeway?" The girl nodded her head heavily. Su Fengyin squinted his eyes and looked at the sky. The sun was rising and he exhaled. He pointed behind the girl and said with a smile, "Because of the angle of the light, the Sword Cliff waterfall will turn into a golden yellow color. Why don't we enjoy the scenery before fighting?" She did not make a sound and kept facing Su Fengyin. She slowly retreated and stopped at the edge of the cliff. From the corner of her eyes, she really saw a golden silk hanging down from the Sword Cliff. The scenery was gorgeous and charming. Su Fengyin was in a dilemma. In the end, he gave up the idea of running away. He walked to the edge of the cliff and enjoyed the scenery together. Miss Hehe habitually said hello as a greeting. She asked, "Why are you crying?" Su Fengyin said calmly, "I had a dream. I dreamed of my mother. It's up to you to believe it or not." He thought that he was destined to get no response. He did not expect that the girl would make a sound of acknowledgement. She emphasized it with an inexplicable tremble. She squatted down and held the dagger in her mouth. She held her cheeks with both hands and muttered to herself, "Is your mother beautiful?" Su Fengyin smiled. The girl killer's mouth slightly curled up. She said vaguely, "You are so beautiful. Your mother must be even more beautiful." She slowly got up. One of her arms drooped down and a dagger fell out. She smiled. No matter how one looked at it, there was a bloody coldness. Su Fengyin was facing a formidable enemy. He cursed in his heart. This girl turned hostile just like that. He really had to find a chance to kill her. Otherwise, even with Li Chungang accompanying him, it was hard to guarantee that she would not succeed. His head was only worth 1,000 taels of gold. Just thinking about it made him angry. Miss Hehe was indeed Miss Hehe. Every time she grasped the opportunity to kill someone, her actions were strange and unpredictable. She stared at Su Fengyin and said, "Today I will not kill you. I will go back to the foot of the mountain. How about it?" Su Fengyin said without hesitation, "Okay. But if you trust me, I can promise not to let the old god of swords and the others kill you. Miss Hehe, you can walk down the mountain easily." She looked at His Royal Highness as if she was looking at an idiot. She said, "Not killing me does not mean you cannot capture me. Do you think I am that stupid, Princess Jing-en? You have a useless but not a brain." Su Fengyin laughed knowingly. To be honest, if it were not for the fact that they had to separate life and death, he really wanted to have a heart-to-heart talk with her. He wanted to know who had taught such a wonderful person. Su Fengyin stretched out a palm, indicating that he would not see her off. The girl said warily, "Don't leave the cliff for now. Let me say this first. If you dare to go back on your words, I will not follow the rules in the future. It is not easy to kill you and that old man, but it is not difficult to kill 100 light cavalry soldiers of the Phoenix Battalion one by one." Su Fengyin nodded. He watched as the assassin girl stabbed her daggers into the cliff like a gecko and slowly descended. But it only seemed slow. If one was in the situation, one would know that every time she stabbed into the cliff, there was a distance of 20 to 30 feet between them. If it were Su Fengyin, he would not have the guts to hang on the cliff. The mountain wind swept the cliff, unusually strong. Her body swayed as she descended. Even Su Fengyin, who was watching from the side, was worried for her. It was very strange. Su Fengyin did not have the slightest hope that she would fall to her death because of this. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. With her following him like a shadow, His Royal Highness did not dare to breathe for a moment on the path of martial arts cultivation. The sun rose from the east, leaping out of the sea of clouds. Su Fengyin did not know how long he had been standing there until Old Man Li slowly walked over to watch the sunrise. Su Fengyin turned around and smiled. "I have some understanding of Senior's sword opening the gate of heaven." Li Chuangong's face was full of disbelief. He said in surprise, "Oh?" Su Fengyin turned around and looked at the sea of clouds. He squinted his phoenix eyes, which could make a woman's heart flutter. He said with an intoxicating smile, "One sword after another, stacking the swords. No matter what sword move or sword technique it is, the sword intent will be endless. If one is determined not to kill with one sword, one will not use this sword. I bet my life's cultivation on this sword." If I were to learn the saber, I would do the same. I would strive to have the courage to kill the heavenly dragon with one move. Old Manly did not change his expression. He said in a low voice, "That's reasonable. But with your current realm, aren't you courting death by using the saber like this?" Su Fengyin shook his head. "Of course not now. Wait until I reach the Vajra realm." Li Chungang sneered arrogantly. "It's not that this old man is looking down on you, kid. As long as you are His Royal Highness, you won't be able to master this move. Without this old man as your protective talisman, won't Su Shao find other experts to be your death exemption golden medallion? If you have nothing to fear, how can you achieve the realm in the midst of danger?" Su Fengyin said calmly, "As long as I reach the Vajra realm and return to Bailiang, I'll immediately enter Beimeng alone." Li Chungang snorted coldly. "At least you have some ambition. You didn't waste this old man's 200 green hands snake." Su Fengyin dismissed it with a smile. The old god of swords suddenly asked, "You almost went mad after meditating last night. What happened?" Su Fengyin shook his head gently and said indifferently, "I'm fine." The old man wrapped himself in a sheepskin coat, curled his lips and stopped asking. Yu Yuwei and Pei Nanwei had also woken up to look at the scenery. Blue Bird followed behind them. He had to admit that Princess Jing'en, who had been slandered by Miss Hehe as having no brains, was indeed worthy of the praise of outshining the moon and putting the flowers to shame. When a woman was so beautiful, it seemed that it didn't matter whether she had brains or not. Moreover, how could there be so many beautiful women with such great intelligence in this world? His Royal Highness' second sister, Su Weisheng, could be said to have stunning military strategies, but wasn't she just plain looking? With Su Fengyin's 100 copper coins as a judge of beauty, among all the beauties he had seen in his life, Pei Nanwei was undoubtedly the number one. She should be at the standard of 94 to 95 copper coins. After she fell from grace, she wore a wooden hairpin and a narrow-sleeved cloth skirt, which was difficult to hide her charm. During this period of time, if she needed to appear in public, His Royal Highness would ask her to wear a soft guanine hood, with a light muslin draped over her shoulders. When conservative women went out, most of them would wear this kind of hood. Young ladies who were yet to be betrothed would generally wear a headband with a bright color. Their faces could be seen 70 to 80% clearly, so it didn't matter whether they wore it or not. Yue didn't need to be so cautious and reserved. She wore a well-styled brocade with large sleeves, exquisite embroidery, and a pair of brocade boots full of the style of the western regions. In terms of appearance, she naturally lost 2 or 3 copper coins to Pei Nanwei, whose skin was publicly recognized as whiter than snow. However, Yuyoi's bosom was as small as the mountains. As long as one had the hobby of playing with the peeled lychee meat on their chest, no one would not submit under her skirt. On this trip out of Bailiang, intentionally or unintentionally, he discussed some court politics with Yue. Perhaps it was because she was born in a family of officials and had been influenced by what she saw and heard since she was young, but she was always able to reveal a rather extraordinary view. Su Fengyin returned the embroidered winter and spring thunder to its sheath and hung it around his waist again. He walked straight back to the Phoenix Battalion's camp. Yu Yue and Pei Nanwei stood together, looking at the gorgeous sky with blurred eyes. And beneath their feet, on a cliff that looked like it had been cut by an immortal sword, a young girl held the hilt of a knife with one hand. Her body swayed, like a stubborn blade of grass between the cracks of the wind. She, who was neither above nor below the ground, stared blankly at the morning glow. She didn't laugh. She just stood there in a daze. Chapter 278. The Chang, an escort agency, was neither too big nor too small in the eyes of Jianghu, which was said to be a province without escorts. It was good that the old escorts and the young escorts were well matched. There were only 50 to 60 of them. However, most of the old escorts were heroes and retired soldiers, so their combat power was not weak. The old escorts were tired of licking blood on the blade and became escorts. Not only did they have a solid foundation in martial arts, but they also had a strong network of connections. When they went out, they relied on their friends. Since they were escorts, it was inevitable that they would pass by many local strongholds, carry the escort flag and announce their family's name that they used to be in Jianghu. Perhaps they used to snatch a maiden together. Therefore, most of them were willing to give them some face. As for the old escorts who had been on the battlefield, they might not be as clean and straightforward as Jianghu boorish men when it came to fighting, but if they were in formation, they would be able to intimidate their opponents even more. The young escorts of Chang, an escort agency, under the guidance of the old escorts, were not inferior to the disciples of the top few escort agencies. The only thing they lacked was that they did not have a top-notch secret manual to support them. This was the most helpless thing. The size of the escort agency depended on how many living escort flags were raised in the agency. The only ones that the Chang and escort agency could bring out were the head escort, Shi Qingfeng, and the martial arts instructor, Yu Hanliang, who was in charge of the escort this time. They did not have a single guest. Han Xiangma was an orphan. At that time, near the end of the Great War of the Spring and Autumn period, the infant Han Xiangma was thrown into the snow by his heartless parents and was picked up by instructor Yu, who happened to be passing by. He grew up in the Chang and escort agency. Han Xiangma was narrow-minded and active, and was willing to endure hardships when he practiced martial arts. He was regarded as his own son by the great bandit Yu Hanliang, who had washed his hands in a gold basin. Among the young bodyguards, he and the head bodyguard's son, Shi Xiangyang, each led 2 batches of bodyguards. In the agency, there was a girl who grew up together with his childhood sweetheart. Shi Xiangyang adored her to death, but that girl only cast affectionate glances at the glib-tongued Han Xiangma. Han Xiangma did not have any feelings for her, and this made Shi Xiangyang increasingly see her as a thorn in his side. In fact, when they were young, the two of them often peed together in the mud. The name of Chang, an escort agency, was derived from the meaning of long life and safety. It had been established for more than 30 years and had never once lost an escort. Therefore, it had finally gained a foothold in the Jian province, where there were as many escort agencies as there were hairs on a cow. According to the usual rules, when an escort agency carried out an escort mission, the ratio would be determined by the value of the goods. However, Han Xiangma felt that this escort mission was a little strange. He was the only one in the escort agency, and the rest were the most experienced old escorts in the agency. Father Yu was personally leading the team. Before they left the Jian province, the name of Chang, an escort agency, was still somewhat useful. However, after leaving the Jian province for more than 10 days, it had obviously become a little tricky. Father Yu was an old drunkard, but he would occasionally rest in the cooked shops and have a few cups of wine after the shop was closed to satisfy his cravings. However, this time he didn't even bring a wine pot. Han Xiangma rode the horse and guarded the escort box with his saber. The box wasn't big. According to Father Yu's private disclosure, when the chief escort received the escort that day, he said that it was a piece of family heirloom jade. There was an expert in the escort agency who specially appraised it and said with trembling hands and feet that the jade was worth at least half of the Chang, an escort agency. Han Xiangma glanced at the escort box and then turned his head to look at the heavily veiled carriage. It was 2 local Jian province girls dressed as men. Although they were wearing heavy veiled hats that covered their faces, Han Xiangma, who had accompanied his father to visit his aunts and sisters in the brothel when he was 8 or 9 years old, had sharp eyes. He could tell the truth just by glancing at them when they got off the carriage in the middle of the night. Han Xiangma, who had been making a living in the brothel since he was a child, was convinced that these 2 girls were absolutely beautiful. When they brushed past each other, they smelled good. When Han Xiangma was not on night duty, he would occasionally lie on his bed and toss and turn. He thought that it would be worth it if he could get a good look at them during this escort mission. Instructor Yu Hanliang carried an oxhorn bow on his back and a large saber on his waist. He rode his horse around the escort team. When he saw Han Xiangma smiling foolishly, he kicked him and scolded him. Han Xiangma patted his butt and said with a smile, "Dad, when are you going to pass me your bow? My hands are itching." Yu Hanliang's father was an illiterate boorish man. The name of his adopted son, Han Xiangma, was given to him by a gentleman in the escort agency. He had spent a few jeans of wine. Although he had raised him as his own son, he naturally hoped that his son would become a dragon. However, Yu Hanliang did not understand at all how to become a dragon. In any case, if he committed a crime, he would be whipped. If he felt that this brat had grown up, he would take out some money and let him have fun with his friends. Whether it was drinking or visiting brothels, they were all grown men. Why would he pretend to be a scholar? That brat from the Shi family was not pleasing to the eye. He was obviously a martial artist, yet he spent all his time reciting poems, writing couplets, and dancing in calligraphy. Did he King recite poems for a deaf person? He deserved to be disliked by Laszlo. The older generation, no matter how vicious and merciless they were when they were young, wasn't their greatest joy now that they were older, comparing their descendants to see who was more promising? Yu Hanliang felt that Han Xiangma was not bad. After a few more years of polishing, he would become a man. He would not have to worry about not being able to find a wife. Yu Hanliang was in a good mood. He pointed at the saber on Han Xiangma's waist and scolded him jokingly, "Don't be unsatisfied. Including the 2 from the head escort, there are only 6 Qilin sabers in total." Yu Hanliang's father stroked the oxhorn bow on his back affectionately, as if he was caressing the smooth skin of his lover. Seeing Han Xiangma's nauseating and disgusting expression, he glared and said, "The earliest I can pass it to you is when I'm in my coffin. If you didn't make a good trip this time, I'll take this bow with me into my coffin. Pass it to you, my ass." Han Xiangma tightened the reins so that the two horses could run side by side. He hooked his arm around Yu Hanliang's shoulder and said with a flattering expression, "Dad, you're treating me like an outsider. I work like an ox and a horse to save money for you when you're old and when you die. How can I roam Jianghu without some money? It's not like you don't know that I'm one of the best in the escort agency. Even the head escort doesn't dare to compete with me in archery. A good horse deserves a good saddle. Dad, if you disgrace this treasured bow, you'll be punished by the heavens." Yu Hanliang's father rolled his eyes and said, "Go, go, go. Keep an eye on the front. We're taking a small path this time so it won't be safe. Don't ruin the reputation that the escort agency has painstakingly built up over the past few decades." Han Xiangma smiled and said, "Understood." Then he spurred his horse forward. Yu Hanliang's father's eyes were kind. He really couldn't imagine that this fellow was a bandit who killed people like scything flax. Looking at his son's back, his heart was filled with gratification. This kid was allowed to wear the Qilin saber not because Han Xiangma was his adopted son, but because he relied on his own ability to earn a living in the escort agency. Every weapon in the escort agency had to be reported in detail to the authorities. Every addition or loss of a weapon had to be recorded. The Chang and escort agency only had 6 Qilin sabers. This type of saber was an imitation of the Bailiang saber, tempered into steel. The blade was narrow, light, and sharp. It was a first-rate treasure for both horse and foot battles. There were several Guangling retired soldiers in the escort agency. Han Xiangma's temperament was restless, but he had absolutely no qualms about learning the saber from the Guangling old soldiers. As long as he was allowed to hold a saber, his buttocks would be rooted to the ground. He could practice bitterly for an entire night without complaining about being tired. In fact, this adopted son's archery skills were even better. Even the old soldiers said that Han Xiangma's ape arms were good at shooting and that he was a good seedling. However, compared to practicing the saber, Han Xiangma was unwilling to practice his archery skills. This made Yu Hanliang's father, who couldn't do anything about it, angry. He was unwilling to hand over the ox horn bow to this little bastard. Yu Hanliang was very cautious when escorting the escort out of Jianzhou. First of all, the escorts were exceptionally precious. If they were lost, not only would the Chang and escort agency suffer a huge loss, it was also highly likely that they would no longer be able to accept jobs in Jianzhou where competition was fierce. Therefore, other than him, the martial arts instructor, and Han Xiangma, a meticulous and skillful bodyguard, the rest of the escorts were all experienced Jianghu escorts. There were more than 30 of them. It could be said that they had turned out in full force. Including the assistants and odd job workers, there were nearly 50 of them. It was a mighty force. Even if they didn't take the official road or the small path, the average mountain stronghold wouldn't dare to show their head to block the way. Chapter 279. When Yu Hanliang thought of the two people sitting inside the carriage, he frowned, thinking to himself that this escort wasn't simple at all. On the surface they were escorting that priceless jade pendant to Songzhou, which was the most common type of escort, but on the inside they were more like human escorts. The two people in the carriage lived in seclusion. Yu Hanliang had spent most of his life as a fugitive and had only managed to settle down after joining the escort agency. However, he had never met any young ladies from noble families, and he hadn't even come in contact with many pretty girls from humble families. But even if he hadn't eaten pork, he had at least seen pigs run. The two people in the carriage didn't seem like ordinary girls from noble families. Using the name of being escorts to leave Jianzhou, they looked like they were fleeing from disaster no matter how he looked at it. When the heads of the Chang and escort agency had first gathered together to discuss the matter, Yu Hanliang didn't really want to accept the escort. However, the Chang and escort agency's business had been slow for the past 2 years, and they had been squeezed quite a bit by the other big escort agencies. On top of that, the two people on the other side of the carriage had been generous enough to pay a deposit of 600 taels of silver, and they had promised to pay another 60 taels of gold when they reached Songzhou. The head escort gritted his teeth and accepted the mission. Han Xiangma, who was at the front of the escort team, raised his hand and made a gesture. The old escorts immediately drew their weapons as if they were about to face a great enemy. However, only half of the saber was unsheathed. This was an unwritten rule of escorts. Since the other side didn't launch a sneak attack, but instead openly blocked the way as long as they didn't really fall out with them, if the escort agency unsheathed their saber first, it would be tantamount to smashing the bandit's reputation. It was a very disrespectful act. When traveling the Jianghu, one couldn't be careless in the slightest. About 70 to 80 people jumped out of the dense forest on both sides of the small path with shiny sabers and spears. More than 20 riders appeared from the fork in the path, all of them strong. Yu Hanliang had been an escort for 20 years, so of course he could tell that this group of bandits wasn't ordinary. They were most likely the kind of bandit who set small shrimps to catch big fish. Yu Hanliang was puzzled. He had never heard of such a troublesome bandit king on this mountain. He had even been here last year and remembered that the bandits who occupied the mountain were Qin Yaozi's acquaintances. Qin Yaozi was an expert in the 3-emperor cannon fist and the 16-style whip kick. Yu Hanliang had no chance of winning in a one-on-one fight. However, the bandits under Qin Yaozi were not very useful. They were old, weak and disabled. Thus, when he was escorting in the past, he had only paid a small amount of silver as a tribute to the emperor. Both sides were still able to live with each other. After a while, Yu Hanliang and Qin Yaozi had become half-acquainted. According to the head escort Shi Qingfeng, this time he wanted to see if he could use this opportunity to rope Qin Yaozi in as a guest of the Chang, an escort agency. However, he didn't expect that the Bandit King's banner would be so ferocious. There were 20 bandits on horseback. This wasn't something an ordinary bandit could have. Not only was a horse expensive, but there was no market for it. Raising a horse was even more difficult. Father Yu exhaled a long breath of turbid air. He tightened his grip on the saber at his waist and urged his horse forward. First, he had Han Xiangma, a newborn calf that wasn't afraid of tigers, roll back. Facing the group of bandits, he cupped his fists and shouted, "Jian Province's Chang and escort agency's Yu Hanliang would like to borrow the path for you heroes." The other party didn't move at all. Father Yu braced himself and took out 2 bags of silver fragments. He raised his voice and said, "Tai Sui offers 20 tales of filial piety." The 20 riders didn't move an inch on the small path. Han Xiangma, who was originally ordered by Father Yu to bring up the rear, was furious. 10 tales of filial piety was already considered quite generous for an escort agency. These bastards relied on their numbers and didn't want to give them face. He turned his horse around and was about to draw his saber. Father Yu, who was familiar with this kid's violent temperament, was afraid that he would mess up the important matter. He turned his head and scolded, "Xiangma, don't mess around." Han Xiangma had no choice but to sullenly withdraw his saber. Suddenly, he opened his eyes wide and shouted with reddened eyes, "Father, be careful." A person jumped down from a tree on the side of the road. He was dressed in black and carried a saber as he rushed forward. Yu Hanliang had just felt a chill. He didn't even have time to draw his saber to block before the person drew his saber and slashed him and his horse into 2 halves. Everyone felt as if their liver and guts were about to burst. They only saw the semicircular flowing light on the saber's edge. This kind of cold and silent killing technique was truly terrifying. Blood dripped on the small path. The bodies of man and horse were cut into 2 halves. Han Xiangma, who had depended on Father Yu for more than 20 years, was extremely angry. He lost his reason. He clamped his legs on the horse's belly and pulled out his Qilin saber, urging his horse to gallop forward. The young saber man standing on the small path lightly twisted his wrist. The blood on his saber splashed onto the ground, forming a scarlet line of blood. He pointed the tip of his saber at Han Xiangma, who had borrowed the momentum of his horse to strengthen his saber. Instead of retreating, he advanced and madly galloped forward. The 2 sides brushed past each other in an instant. After Han Xiangma's saber fell, he realized to his surprise that he had not hit his enemy. The next moment he fell off his horse and rolled on the road. It turned out that the 4 hooves of his horse had been cut off by the saber man. When he looked down at himself, his legs below the knees had long been separated from his body. It was only now that the saber was too sharp that Han Xiangma felt the piercing pain. Even someone as tough as him howled in pain. His 10 fingers subconsciously bent into hooks on the road and pierced into the mud. He did not even realize that his fingernails had been uprooted. Han Xiangma, who had dreamed of being in Jianghu for as long as he could remember, raised his head and saw Father Yu not far away. He slowly crawled over. At this moment, the young escort no longer had any thoughts of being free and unfettered in Jianghu and making a name for himself in the martial world. He only wanted to see his father one last time. The saberman who committed the murder did not even look at the nameless soldier Han Xiangma. Facing the hurried formation of the escort agency, he walked forward leisurely and easily deflected a few arrows that were shot at him. The saber's edge was as clear as snow and the momentum of his saber was majestic. The old soldiers of Guangling who had formed the formation at the front could not withstand it at all. The saberman with a stiff face only needed one clean stroke each time, cutting these old escorts of the Chang and escort agency into a pool of blood as if he were cutting melons and vegetables. Except for Han Xiangma, who did not die on the spot, those who met him were all killed instantly without exception. In less than half an hour the carriages were in a mess. The old escorts protected the carriages with their lives. The workers and handymen did not have the courage to flee in all directions. The saberman also did not chase after the carriages. Naturally, the 20 valiant cavalrymen chased after them on horseback. Raising their sabers, they easily pulled out a fatal wound that was so deep that the bones could be seen. The burly young man pulled out the tip of the saber that was stabbed into the heart of the last old escort. He wiped the saber on the body that was slowly falling to the ground to wipe away the blood stains and then used the tip of the saber to lift up the curtain of the carriage. He said coldly, "You have been chosen by Ancestor Shen Yuan. Where can you escape to?" The curtain was lifted up and a dagger stabbed out. The young saberman pinched the dagger with 2 fingers and casually broke it. He threw it on the road and then reached out to grab her slender white neck. He first dragged her out of the carriage and then hung her in the air. Her veil hat had fallen off, revealing a cold and peerless face. However, the cold-blooded swordsman did not care about her appearance. He only lowered his gaze slightly and saw that her feet, which were quite high from the ground, were trembling violently. Her hands were patting his thick arm in vain. Her face turned from red to purple. Another person who stayed in the carriage came out and saw this scene. She took off her veil hat and her face was exactly the same as the woman whose life was hanging by a thread. She said in a cold voice, "Let go of my sister." He glanced at her from the corner of his eye and felt that it was interesting. There was actually someone who was not afraid of death. She suddenly pulled out a dagger hidden in her sleeve and pressed it against her neck. She pierced into her soft skin and cut a bloody groove. She said coldly, "Let's see how you will explain to the pervert Ancestor Shen Yuan if I die." The young saberman who had killed countless people frowned. Today's secret matter was nothing to him. Since he had come to Mount Hui to learn martial arts, of course he had to work hard for others. Everyone in Sword Province knew that the old master of Xuanyuan's hobby of keeping women and torturing and killing young girls. The old man was proficient in the secret sex joyful method and had been cultivating yin to yang for decades. His inner strength could be said to be mysterious and he was also a saberplay grandmaster. The young saberman received an order to intercept a pair of fairy-grade cauldrons that Ancestor Shen Yuan had chosen more than half a month ago. He turned the Sword Province escort agency upside down and hurried over, which delayed his saberplay practice at the 6-layered waterfall. This made him, who was addicted to martial arts, feel very bad. Facing the threat of the woman in the carriage, he held her neck with one hand and pressed the tip of the blade against her heart with the other. He said coldly, "Suicide? I won't stop you. However, I can guarantee that your sister will die before you. As long as I find the heart acupoint and crush her heart, I can make your sister half dead and suffer a fate worse than death. It's 100 times worse than you cutting your neck." She bit her lips with her snow-white teeth so hard that blood seeped out. The hatred in her eyes was unforgettable. She said slowly, "Who are you?" The young saberman said indifferently, "Remember, I'm Yuan Tingshan. If you want revenge, follow me back to Mount Hui and serve Ancestor Shen Yuan well. Only after a few years of pillow talk will you have the hope of causing me some trouble." She really threw away the dagger and said with a smile, "Just wait." The machete man who claimed to be Yuan Tingshan casually tossed his elder sister to the ground. The 20 riders had already slaughtered all the small fries in the escort agency. Not a single one was left alive. The machete man cracked his neck at the genuine robbers behind him. The riders whose blades were still dripping with blood all smirked and charged forward. She looked indifferently at her sister who was hugging the saberman's thigh and begging for mercy. The young saberman quietly waited for the riders to finish their work. When he saw that most of the heads had been harvested, he lowered his head and looked at them. "I heard that it's hard to tell your gender. I'm very curious which one of you is a man." As he spoke, a man wearing a white brocade robe with 2 sabers appeared at the end of the road. Chapter 280. In terms of geography, Jiangdong's Big Bulbul Gang and Jiangxi's Dragon and Tiger Demon slaying platform stood opposite each other. In terms of geography they were similar. Adhering to the principle that a close neighbor was better than a distant relative, they generally minded their own business. They were like 2 old women who treated each other with respect. Although the Xianyuan family's ancestors' morals were questionable and he was despised by the scholars of Jianghu, his martial virtues were not low. He had made friends with many heroes and warriors in the world. Some of the men who had been on the government's list and wanted to be killed could seek shelter from the Shenyuan family, which was one of the few powerful families in the martial arts world. The government could only turn a blind eye to it. The Shenyuan family's old master, who had controlled the family for half a century, was also willing to cultivate the younger generation who came to the mountain to study martial arts. After Yuan Tingshan took his revenge, he became a fugitive wanted by the government and was even on Zhao Guo's list. If it weren't for the Shenyuan family's willingness to let him go to the mountain, he would have been captured by Zhao Guo at the foot of the mountain. To the cold-hearted Yuan Tingshan, this life-saving favor aside, if he wanted to have some achievements in saber art and break through the bottleneck, he had to be willing to do some shady business for the Shenyuan family. When a steward of the Bulbul gang found Yuan Tingshan at the foot of the six-fold waterfall, this sabersman was using his back to withstand the water column falling from the cliff of 1,000 feet to temper his muscles and bones. Among the six-fold waterfall of Mount Hui, this one fell the most rapidly and was known as the dragon spitting water. In the past 30 years, no young generation of the Shenyuan family had trained their physique to such an extreme degree. As soon as Yuan Tingshan heard the gist of the situation, he led 20 light cavalry down the mountain to intercept 2 young playthings who were trying to escape from a small house. He really did not have the energy to do so, but since he was living under someone else's roof, he had no choice but to help them eliminate the disaster. As long as Yuan Tingshan agreed to do it, he would do his best. After finding out the route of the escort agency, he first chopped off the legs of Qin Yaozi, who was good at beating and kicking, and then gathered a group of useless bandits. It was not that he wanted to borrow their strength, but he wanted to create a smokescreen for the government that the bandits and the escort agency had perished together. It was said that the pair of beauties were very famous in Jianzhou. When they were only 12 or 13 years old, their beauty had already spread far and wide. Ancestor Shenyuan had taken a liking to them and regarded them as his exclusive playthings. He had already half-publicized it in River East. He was just waiting for the right time to invite them up the mountain to enjoy themselves. He never thought that the pair of beauties, who were praised as, one of them is already beautiful enough to topple a city, while the other is even more beautiful enough to topple a country, would actually run away. Yuan Tingshan, who was slow to realize many things, glanced at the 2 people who had almost the same face and body, then pointed at the one standing on the coach with the tip of his blade, laughed out loud and said, "Your skin is even better than a woman's. No wonder Patriarch Shenyuan cares more about you. I wonder how many days you can be played with by my sister with your soft and tender skin. Remember, my name is Yuan Tingshan. Before I master my blade skills, don't die. Otherwise it won't be fun anymore." Yuan Tingshan had already seen the famous uninvited guest sitting high on the horse, looking at him from afar. The corner of Yuan Tingshan's mouth curled up, and a murderous intent surged. He was born poor, and after he started practicing martial arts, he never hid his hatred for the rich and powerful. When he first entered Jianzhou, he slaughtered a whole boat of rich and powerful people on the river. Yuan Tingshan made a beheading gesture to the valiant light horse that Shenyuan had painstakingly trained. He gently tapped his shoulder with the back of his blade and walked towards the black bodyguard who was still crawling on the ground. He did not forget to turn his head and say with a smile, "I kindly remind you. I heard on Mount Hui that Ancestor Shenyuan has strange hobbies. When the time comes when the old man asks you to have sex with your sister, what will you do?" The sister with the shocking purple mark on her neck was paralyzed on the ground. When she heard Yuan Tingshan's words, her delicate body trembled and her face turned pale. The blood at the corner of the bodyguard's mouth became thicker. Yuan Tingshan made a suggestive gesture of straightening his back and laughed as he walked towards the young bodyguard who was struggling at death's door, leaving behind the androgynous pair of brother and sister. The sister who was sitting on the ground raised her head in fear and looked at her brother who had been very opinionated since he was young. The latter just happened to be looking at her coldly from above. She shivered to the bone. Yuan Tingshan did not care about being hated by the siblings at all. With their looks, if they could really curry favor with Ancestor Shenyuan, it would not be difficult for them to be favored at Bulgang for a few years. However, by that time, Shenyuan Qingfeng would already be his woman. A pair of weak pets who could not even control their fates could not cause any trouble. Han Xiangma, who had lost both of his legs, was still crawling in a pool of blood with difficulty. He was only surviving because of his stubbornness. Yuan Tingshan stood between Han Xiangma and the old bodyguard's corpse. He stabbed his saber into the ground and bent down with a smile. "Try a little harder. You will see your father's head soon." When Han Xiangma's head, which was still moving forward with its broken body, reached the edge of the saber, Yuan Tingshan sneered and slowly cut a gully in the road. He then gently cut off the head. After pulling out the saber, he kicked the head with the tip of his foot. Blood splashed out of the head and the head rolled to the old bodyguard's corpse. Jianghu men die in Jianghu. It is a worthy death. Yuan Tingshan murmured, I am a good person. This scene made the siblings feel nauseous, especially the sister who was so terrified that she fainted on the spot. The man who was standing straight on the carriage called out to Murong Wuzhu, but there was no response. He expressionlessly lifted his sleeve to wipe off the blood. She, who had been praised for her beauty in countless poems in the river east of Jianzhou, had a blank look in her eyes. The Murong family was the last aristocratic family in Jianzhou, far inferior to those powerful aristocratic families. It was said that when the Murong siblings were born, there was a magician who passed by and left a ballad. A female and a male, a female and a male and a female flew into the Wudong Palace. Everyone knew that the Wudong Palace was the palace of Great Peace City. As the Murong siblings gradually grew up, the scholars of Jianzhou praised them. The elder sister was a rare beauty, and the younger brother was as beautiful as a lotus. It was said that since he was born, the lotus pond in the mansion had never bloomed. Every year, the pond filled with green lotuses only grew to buds. Therefore, Murong Tonghuang was also known as the Lotus Man. In addition to the ballad that had been sung for many years, the Murong family had great expectations for this pair of siblings. There was once a clan member who was blinded by lust and tried to molest the siblings when they were only 10 years old. However, no one knew why he didn't succeed in the end. He was even blinded in one eye and was expelled from the family. Unfortunately, when the siblings were 13 years old, they went to Longhu to burn incense. At the foot of Mount Hui, ancestor Shenyuan saw them and regarded them as his exclusive property. The Murong family was powerless in the face of such a huge figure in Jianzhou. It was unknown whether it was because they were cornered that they endured until the end of the 3-year deadline and ran away from home. Ancestor Shenyuan didn't make things difficult for the Murong family, but the Chang'an escort agency, who was kept in the dark, suffered. At the end of the road, His Royal Highness, who had heard the news from the blue-white luan in the sky and had only rushed over to join in the fun, widened his eyes. Seeing the 20 riders charging towards him, he didn't understand for a moment. Could it be the armored soldiers of Huzhou? But it didn't seem like it. If they were really going to fight, wouldn't 20 riders be too shabby? Didn't they know that there were 100 Phoenix Battalion soldiers following behind him? Because of the blue-white luan's warning, he didn't allow the 100 light riders to pull away. His Royal Highness was already in a bad mood as he approached Mount Longhu. Especially after seeing the Machateman's cruel actions of cutting off heads and kicking heads, he became even angrier. He raised his hand and with great halberd Ning Amei in the lead, the 100 light riders split into 2 columns and stomped on the ground, creating an ear-piercing rumble. Chapter 281. The 20 riders were not stupid. After being stunned, they immediately turned around and ran away. Motherf ***, they were not blind. Who could not see that the cavalry that appeared out of nowhere not only had a standard saber, but they also had a crossbow on their back. Bows and arrows were still fine as the imperial court did not forbid private possession of them. However, crossbows were definitely not something that could be used by the military. Once found in private possession, the light punishment would be banishment to the army and banishment of 3,000 li. The heavy punishment would be the crime of treason and the head would be chopped off. What was worse was that within the He province, Jian province and Hu province, only the Goshawk camp and Falcon camp under the Duke of Guangling had the qualifications to possess military crossbows. The Shenyuan family could look down on those counties, but they did not dare to clamor against the elites of the vassal kings. Even the arrogant and domineering Yuan Tingshan could not help but frown. Duke of Guangling's men? That loathsome young master was the son of a general? If it was still the days when he was alone, he would have already pulled out his saber and rushed over. Although he had to run for his life, he had to cut that young master down from his horse no matter what. Yuan Tingshan waved his hand and signaled for the 20 riders to go to the carriage where the siblings were. He stood alone and stared at the dandy who was sandwiched between the 2 groups of riders. Meeting on a narrow path. The dandy held both sabers and slapped the horse with the scabbard. When he was 50 steps away from Yuan Tingshan, he asked coldly, "You are from the side of Duke of Guangling Zhao Yi?" Duke of Guangling Zhao Yi. Among the 6 vassal kings of the imperial family, his authority was second only to the Duke of Yen. He was very interesting. He killed people like flies, squandered money like it was dirt, and was especially lustful. After the Great War of the Spring and Autumn period ended, this vassal king had the most empresses, princesses and concubines of a fallen country. As the saying goes, one dragon gives birth to 9 sons. The king of Jing and Zhao Heng and the other imperial brothers were all considered handsome men of the present age. Zhao Yi, on the other hand, was ugly. His body was bloated and dark. Together with the Bailiang Chu Lushan, they were known as the North and South Fatties. Both of them were infamous jackals and wolves. Although the king of Guangling had a bad character, he was ambitious in leading his troops. Compared to the king of Yanqi, the head of the vassal state of the dynasty, he only lacked in numbers. The skills of individual soldiers were not inferior. Zhao Yi's territory was the homeland of West Chu, the former most powerful country of the spring and autumn period. To be able to suppress the Chu people and kill countless scholars in 20 years, one could see the iron fist of this vassal state. This time, it was Yuan Tingshan's turn to be puzzled. But soon after, this undisciplined swordsman began to sneer, appearing very sinister. Su Fengyan asked, "Are they suppressing bandits?" Yuan Tingshan smiled and asked in return, "Then are you a bandit?" Su Fengyan was amused by this cruel swordsman. He smiled sinisterly and said, "So what if I am and so what if I am not? You will know soon." Yuan Tingshan ignored the 20 crossbows of the light cavalry at the front. His body exploded, dragging his saber as he ran. 20 arrows shot out. Yuan Tingshan twisted and turned like a nimble ape. Within 50 steps he could clearly see the face of that arrogant young master. What a pretty boy. Only by cutting off the head of this kind of rich family would he be able to vent his anger. But for the sake of his future he would endure it for a while. He would let you keep your head for a while. When his saber skills surpass old ancestor Xuanyuan's, with Mount Huishan in his hands, Xinyuan Qingfeng would become his crotch. But it was true that he would let you live temporarily, but it did not mean that he would let you continue to sit on the back of a horse and order people around. But Yuan Tingshan dodged a wave of arrows. Just as he leaped into the air wanting to injure the son of a general, a black horse charged out from the side. The general held a large halberd and stabbed it straight at Yuan Tingshan's chest. If he was stabbed, there was a 100% chance that his heart would be pierced. Yuan Tingshan's body fell from the sky. When he landed, he exploded again. The famed saber in his hand just happened to slash at the horse's head. The heavy halberd swung in the air. It just so happened that it met the saber head-on. Yuan Tingshan narrowed his eyes. The saber in his hand no longer retreated. It chopped at the body of the halberd. The halberd swung backward. Yuan Tingshan seemed to have used all his strength and was forced to retreat. But his feet slid on the ground. With one hand on the ground, he raised some dust under his feet. His body rushed forward again. His speed was almost twice as fast as before. It was clear that he saw the enemy as weak first. Once he sensed the enemy's strength, he would suddenly kill him. Ning-Amei, who was wearing heavy armor, roared angrily. The hard halberd in his hand faintly shook out layers of subtle arcs, making a buzzing sound. Yuan Tingshan was fast, but his halberd was not slow either. The tip of the halberd hooked at the waist of the young saber master. Once it hooked, the assassin would be cut in half. Yuan Tingshan laughed and made a sound of surprise. His free left hand suddenly pressed on the back of the saber, making contact with the halberd again. This time he did not use brute force. Instead, he used the strength of his palm to drive the saber in his right hand. With the halberd as the center, Yuan Tingshan nimbly drew a semicircle in the air. Once again he closed in on the unmoving and ignorant young master on the horse. Yuan Tingshan was a ruthless man who had slaughtered his way through the streets and alleys of the marketplace. He dared to risk his life, but at the same time he cherished his life. Not only was he good at pestering others, but he also knew how to take advantage of the situation. He roughly knew the strength of the halberd-wielding general. After bypassing the halberd, Yuan Tingshan did not take advantage of the situation to directly strike with his saber. In this way he would leave his entire back to the heavily armored general. His father's life was more precious than the heavenly emperor's, so it was not worth it to exchange a life for a life. Therefore, not only did he not immediately strike with his saber, he instead bent his waist to the side of the horse's abdomen. Unexpectedly, the halberd did not follow him, but before the halberd arrived, a scarlet iron spear pierced towards him from a tricky angle. If Yuan Tingshan did not pull back, his temple would have been pierced by the tip of the spear, but he did not regret it. Twisting his body, this time his left hand was placed on the saber's body. The side of the saber was pressed against the tip of the spear, and the blade was bent in an arc borrowing the force of the spear. Yuan Tingshan suddenly shot backwards like an arrow, withdrawing from the abdomen of the debauchee's white horse. Then he slid out from the abdomen of Ning-Amei's black horse. With a tap of his toes, He lifted his body and knocked into a light horseman on the side of the road. After knocking him down, he successfully entered the dense forest. Yuan Tingshan laughed loudly and said, "We'll meet again someday." Previously, under the white horse's abdomen, he clearly saw the red spear and the pair of blue embroidered shoes. Could it be that the one who brandished the spear was a woman? From beginning to end, Su Fengyin did not make any movements. Seeing Yuan Tingshan escape into the dense forest, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Yang Qingfeng, you and Xu Xiu follow this guy. General Ning, take 10 cavalrymen and follow him. If you can't catch up before dark, then forget it." The 20 cavalrymen on the other side of the road looked a little sluggish. Everyone knew that Yuan Tingshan practiced his saber skills on the mountain. This guy's saber skills were learned from a pile of dead people. It was not an ordinary fierce saber skill. Although it was amazing that the light cavalrymen went in and out of the crowd, the fact that the disciple of the military family was unscathed was more than enough to explain the situation. The guy who could resolve Yuan Tingshan's killing intent so easily must have a strong family background. What's more, except for General Great Halberd and the woman in blue who really attacked, the rest of the people were just watching. The next few retainers who jumped into the dense forest to chase after Yuan Tingshan did not seem to be simple. What to do? Nonsense, the leading cavalryman did not care about Yuan Tingshan's safety. He turned his horse around and directly retreated. When he passed by the carriage, he bent down and picked up Murong Wuzhu, who was sitting on the ground in a daze, and put him on the horse's back. Another cavalryman followed suit and wanted to kidnap Murong Tonghuang, who was standing on the carriage. Unexpectedly, this beautiful woman stretched out her hand and stabbed him. The cavalryman who was unprepared felt a burst of pain. He looked back and glared at her fiercely before continuing to rush forward. Murong Tonghuang did not wait for the next cavalryman to make a move. He quickly retreated into the carriage and hid in a corner. Su Fengyin turned his head and smiled at Yuan Meng, who was eager to give it a try. He ordered, "Field Officer Yuan, take some people and chase after them. It's up to you whether to leave them alive or not." The two groups of light cavalrymen chased and fled. The small path was very noisy and lively. Su Fengyin came near the carriage. He lifted the curtain with the scabbard and saw a slightly immature but cold and beautiful face. He also saw a pair of cold and hostile eyes. Su Fengyin just opened his mouth and smiled. This lady, the lady, who had escaped from the tiger's mouth, glared at him and scolded ungratefully, "You are the lady." Chapter 282. Su Fengyin was only slightly absent-minded. Fortunately, he had Bai Huer's face in front of him, so he quickly came to his senses. But he still found it somewhat inconceivable. It was not difficult to find a beautiful woman around 70 coins, but the one in front of him was at least 90 coins. How could he be a man? Wasn't this a waste of natural resources? His Royal Highness was not like Li Hanlin, who had a penchant for men and women. Su Fengyin was not even interested in young prostitutes, let alone those creepy *C's. There were many famous scholars in Gangnam-do. There were experts in Guangling who specialized in training them. When they were young, they were bought cheaply for a few dozen taels of silver. When they were 12 or 13 years old, they were sold at a sky-high price of 10 or even 100 taels of gold for the scholar officials and dignitaries to play with. This had become a common practice in the group of scholars in Jiangnan. It was regarded as a wonderful and elegant thing. The scholars were tired of competing with poems, songs, and gold, stone, and jade. It was not easy to usher in the golden age of peace, so they began to compete with the singers and beautiful maids at home. Su Fengyin carefully looked at this girl. Sure enough, her chest was flat and did not look like a woman. Murong Tonghuang was obviously accustomed to Su Fengyin's gaze. The corner of his mouth was cold. Was he trying to drive the wolf away by accident? The world was as black as all crows, and the one in front of him was not a good thing either. Su Fengyin had been in the flower bush for a long time, so he knew how to grasp people's hearts. He smiled and said, "Yes, I am indeed not a good thing." Murong Tonghuang, whose thoughts were seen through, became colder and stiffer. His body instinctively shrank back. Su Fengyin did not care and asked curiously, "It seems that you are not with the cavalry. What's going on? Is this a local tyrant robbing a woman?" Murong Tonghuang bit his lips and ignored this guy with a foreign accent. Su Fengyin turned his head and looked at the light cavalry that was chasing after them on the small path. With the Phoenix Battalion's horsemanship and the horse's leg strength, it was 90 against 20. There was a great disparity in the number of people on both sides. There was no need to worry about the outcome of the battle. If Yuan Meng couldn't eat it, he would be beheaded. As for the young machete man who killed decisively, Yang Qingfeng was proficient in the art of tracking, Xu Xiu had a variety of martial arts, and Ning Amei the Great Halberd, the 10 White Horse followers, and even Grandpa Wei said that he wanted to stretch his muscles and bones to participate in the encirclement. The machete man was ferocious, but he was still in a perilous situation. Su Fengnian was not worried that someone was trying to lure the tiger away from the mountain. After the battle at the Reed Marsh, the green and white luan above his head would alert him if there was any movement within a radius of 10 li. Not only that, Su Fengnian had carefully selected 5 nimble and agile soldiers from the Phoenix Battalion to serve as roaming scouts, to ensure that they would be able to seize the initiative at the first opportunity. Su Fengnian asked calmly, "Who was the one who was taken away? I didn't see it clearly at that time. If you practice the vow of silence with me again, I won't care if you live or die when my men bring him back." Murong Tonghuang seemed to have been caught in his Achilles' heel. He hesitated for a moment and said, "My sister." Su Fengnian asked, "Then who was the one who took you?" Murong Tonghuang gritted his teeth and smiled nervously. He said with a cold face, "Have you heard of Jiangxi Longhu Jiangdong Shenyuan?" Su Fengnian pretended to be crazy and said, "Those old Taoists of Mount Longhu want to take you up the mountain? Do you want to be Taoist companions and practice the art of sex?" Murong Tonghuang turned his head away fiercely. He was too lazy to talk nonsense with this guy whose head was caught by the door. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Jiangdong Shenyuan? That's great. Do you know that there's a woman called Shenyuan Qingfeng in this family?" Murong Tonghuang's mind was full of thoughts. He said in a flat tone, "Shenyuan Qingfeng is even more prestigious than the princess in Jianzhou. What? Did you come here because of her?" Su Fengnian, who had been lifting the curtain with the scabbard, laughed out loud and said, "Because of her? That's right, that's right. I'm about to fall in love with this woman. That's a good way to put it. That guy Wen Hua must be rolling on the ground when he hears it. You know, when he was chased and beaten by this woman, he even flirted with her because she didn't shave her armpit hair clean." Murong Tonghuang stared at this guy in a daze. Was there really something wrong with his head? Su Fengnian put away the embroidered winter and slowly let down the curtain. His stomach full of evil ideas began to ripple. They were actually the private soldiers of the Shenyuan clan. If they wanted to sleep, they could just hand over a pillow. If this crime of killing dozens of people from the escort agency was spread out, he wouldn't be afraid that the 2 provincial governors would be blinded. Right now, the provincial and county system was changing. The 30 or so provincial governors originally in the imperial court were all sharpening their heads, wanting to reach a higher level of enlightenment. During this period of time, it was estimated that the threshold of Grand Secretary Zhang's mansion had been trampled to pieces. There were at least 8 or 9 baskets of name tattoos that had been handed over. This was because regardless of whether it was the administrator or the Jidushi, they could both be said to be real officials of the border. Just in terms of the territory under their jurisdiction, they were practically no different from the monarchs of a country during the spring and autumn period. Although the provincial governors of Hezhou and Jidushi were suppressed by the vassal King Zhao Yi and had no hope of becoming the Jidushi, they could still fight for the administrator's throne. At this critical juncture, Su Fengnian had poked the hornet's nest. He didn't believe that the 2 provincial governors wouldn't admit defeat. Su Zhao's strength lay in that he couldn't make these 2 important ministers become the administrator, but he definitely had the ability to make them lose their positions. When Su Fengnian saw Blue Bird holding the Xana spear, he felt that something was off. He helplessly asked, "Are you tired?" Blue Bird shook her head very seriously. The 90 Phoenix Battalion Light Cavalry swiftly pursued and attacked. The horses' hooves shook the ground and the crossbows shot out violently. As soon as someone fell off the horse, they would stoop down and stab him, or the crossbowman in the back would accurately shoot another arrow, nailing him to the ground. Fortunately, this was not an official road. Otherwise, the commoners would be scared out of their wits if they saw such a bloody scene. Once defeated, it would become a lifeless hunt. The Bailiang cavalry was originally selected from the Baimang cavalry who were good at fighting. Their horsemanship could compete with the nomadic cavalry of the grasslands of Baimang. Although the Bailiang army could not be said to have swept across the desert in recent years, the border cities and towns of the 2 countries were crisscrossed with each other. Every year there would be small and medium-sized fierce battles. This was especially so under the purposeful arrangement of the Great Pillar State Su Xiao and the tacit cooperation of the Baimang side. The scouts from both sides were habitually grouped into a group of 100 to 120 people to fight in pairs. Once they came into contact with each other, it would be a cruel battle of hunting and counter-hunting. The excellent horsemanship of the Bailiang cavalry was forcefully honed in this way. The soldiers of the Yan Imperial and Guangling vassals were also considered ferocious soldiers in the past. Why was it that in the past decade or so, they were unable to compete with the Bailiang army and fight for the title of the world's greatest hero? It was because the Bailiang had the Baimang as a whetstone. The whetstone had the blood of both sides flowing on it. Before it dried, fresh blood would splash on it. The 20 riders were not able to withstand the slaughter. Soon, only the rider with the woman on his horse was left. Yuan Meng and the rider advanced side by side. The Bailiang knife in his hand was not in a hurry to be unsheathed. He grinned and said, "Brother, if you turn around and obediently go to our family's young master and offer this beauty to him, we will spare your life. If you continue to run, you will become a hedgehog." The rider from the Shenyuan family did not dare to believe it. He wished that his mount had 4 more legs and ran wildly, lashing the horsewhip to death. Yuan Meng laughed coldly and said, "Are you in a hurry to be reincarnated?" Chapter 283. With a flash of the blade, the head of the knight flew up. The headless corpse swayed and finally fell on the road. Yuan Meng leaped from the back of the horse and jumped onto the horse that had no one to drive it. He pulled the reins and the horse finally stopped. Yuan Meng laughed loudly and said, "Let's go back." Passing by the corpses of the enemy cavalry that were scattered on the road, Yuan Meng said viciously, "Give me another arrow. Remember to shoot the head. If any bastard dares to miss, get off the horse and pick up the arrow." The fearsome light cavalry roared with laughter. It turned out that one of them was trying to show off his skills on the white horse and tried to shoot the eyeball of a corpse. In the end, the eyeball brushed past his face and fell on the ground. Yuan Meng turned his head and scolded with a smile, "Wang Donglin, get off the horse and pick up the arrows one by one. If there is one arrow missing, I will make your ass bleed." The valiant light cavalry soldier called Wang Donglin scolded and got off the horse. He used his Bailiang saber to chop the corpse that caused him to lose face into a pile of mud. Then he obediently went to the corpses one by one to pull out the arrows. He didn't forget to shout at the top of his lungs, "If anyone dares to talk to His Royal Highness about this, I will not let him off." Yuan Meng's laughter came from afar. "Young chick that hasn't even grown hair yet. How dare you talk about me?" His Royal Highness said that when we reach Jianzhou, he will find 2 courtesans for each of us. Wang Donglin, who was pulling out the arrows from the corpses, wiped the saliva from the corner of his mouth. As a result, his face was covered in blood. Su Fengyan had nothing to do, so he personally drove the carriage that Murong Tonghuang was in. The 3 carriages slowly moved forward. The 3 coachmen were His Royal Highness, Spear Immortal Wang Xiu's daughter, and the old god of swords Li Chenggang. This group of horses was really terrifying. After meeting up with Yuan Meng, this general tried his best to gently hand Murong Wuzhu over to His Highness the Crown Prince. He scratched his head and grinned, "Killed all of them. No one was left alive." Murong Wuzhu had already fainted after seeing Yuan Tingshan's decapitation technique. It could be said that she was fortunate in her misfortune. Unfortunately, she was picked up by the Shenyuan family's cavalry and jolted violently. She woke up with a start. Her willowy waist was almost broken and she was in so much pain that her face was covered in cold sweat. After she was brought back to the carriage by the warm hands of an unfamiliar young master, she only knew that her future was uncertain. She was in a daze and did not dare to raise her head. Murong Tonghuang did not look at his sister. He lifted the curtain and looked at the broad back. He asked coldly, "Going to Sword Province?" Su Fengyan didn't turn around. He nodded and said, "Let's go to Mount Longhu and meet Jiangdong Shenyuan." Murong Tonghuang asked, "Who are you? You knew that these knights were puppets of the Shenyuan family, yet you still dared to kill them?" Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Me? My surname is Fu. My given name is Jun. Jun means gentleman." Murong Tonghuang sneered and let go of the curtain. Out of sight, out of mind. Murong Wuzhu hid in the carriage and endured the pain. She said timidly, "Thank you for saving my life, young master." Fortunately, Su Fengyan had sharp ears and heard it. He said with a smile, "According to the rules of Jianghu, young miss, you have to give yourself to me." Murong Wuzhu was stunned and her cheeks turned red. Murong Tonghuang saw this and frowned. His sister saw his expression and immediately kept quiet out of fear. Her face turned pale. Su Fengyan touched the sore spot and asked, "Why did the Shenyuan family catch you? You and your sister are unarmed. You don't have to become enemies with such an aristocratic family that can be ranked in the top 3 in Jianghu, right? Or is it that young Master Shenyuan covets your beauty? Since the soft approach didn't work, he used the hard approach?" Murong Tonghuang was silent. He pursed his lips tightly and looked cold and determined. It was a sharp contrast to his delicate and weak sister. Even with his Royal Highness's imagination, he still couldn't imagine that the ancestor of the Xinyuan family had taken a fancy to this pair of jade discs. Murong Wuzhu was old enough to be the old man's great-granddaughter. The old cow nibbled on the young grass to the extreme. Su Fengnian waved his hand and said to Yuan Meng, "Take 50 riders to the Hezhou provincial governor's office and tell him the situation here. If the old man is playing dumb with you, you can directly mention Chu Lushan. If not, damn it, I'll have to do it myself." Yuan Meng took the order and left. Murong Tonghuang's face finally became as pale as his sister's. He said with a trembling voice, "You're Chu Lushan's subordinate in Bailiang?" Su Fengnian was a little jealous of this damn fatty's reputation. He said angrily, "Don't worry, Chu Lushan won't touch you." Indeed, according to Lu Qiuer's temperament, this fatty would even worship his Royal Highness's dog like his own father and mother. However, how could Murong Tonghuang, who didn't know the inside story, be at ease? Wouldn't it be equally miserable if he fell into the hands of Chu Lushan and that old freak Xuanyuan's hands? He handed the dagger to his sister and said coldly, "Without the dagger, I know you don't have the courage to bite your tongue and commit suicide. This is the last one. Hide it well." Murong Wuzhu took the dagger with trembling hands. She lowered her head and didn't dare to look at Murong Tonghuang. The convoy drove into Xichang City at the border of Hezhou. In fact, His Royal Highness had all the official plates, but whether he wanted to show them or not depended on his mood. Su Fengnian looked up at the top of the city wall. This city was unfortunately massacred by Su Xiao during the Spring and Autumn War. Not 1 out of 10 families was left alive. It was only slightly better than Xiangfan. Su Fengnian drove indifferently into the city gate. Although there were only more than 30 light cavalry guards behind him, the gate guards didn't have the courage to be difficult to deal with. They could make things difficult for anyone, but they couldn't make things difficult for the soldiers. It would be strange if they didn't have a layer of skin ruthlessly peeled off when they encountered a military ruffian with a background. Su Fengnian had a deep impression of Xichang City. The tragic massacre was secondary. The most important thing was that there was a scholar here that Su Xiao admired the most when he was young. His surname was Sun and his name was Ping. It was a very simple name that didn't even appear in any official history. There were no poems that were passed down, no romantic affairs or confessions. However, Su Fengnian knew that this young scholar, who argued with the old Grand Secretary until his lips turned blue, was the most far-sighted scholar in Tian City. There, Su Xiao, who returned to the capital for the first time, and Yang Taisui, who was not yet the state preceptor, met Sun Ping, a scholar from the Imperial College who was well-versed in Confucianism and had extraordinary debating skills. Sun Ping wasn't even 20 years old yet, but he wrote a total of 21 books to the late emperor, such as Military Affairs, Selected Scholars, and Shu Shu. Unfortunately, all of them sank like stones into the sea. At that time the emperor was only the most unremarkable prince. He visited the Imperial College 3 times and was regarded as a think tank. In the end he was attacked by the Qing currents and retreated to his hometown Xichang City. During the chaotic times of the spring and autumn period, Sun Ping took the blame for the current emperor and was cut in half at the waist in the downtown area of the city. At that time, it was still under the rule of West Chu. That year he was only 24 years old. The 21 books from back then had already become the guiding principles of the country. Su Xiao often repeated the words that this scholar, who didn't even have the strength to truss a chicken, had said to him. Scholars can only add flowers to embroidery. Only martial artists can help the common people in their hour of need. The 9 kingdoms of the spring and autumn period are like a large chopping board. Su Xiao, you can just treat yourself as a butcher. Don't do anything else. As long as you chop people up, 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 and chop people up, you'll be able to chop out a peaceful and prosperous era. Su Xiao had done this and thus became the only prince with a different surname in the dynasty. Sun Ping didn't have the opportunity to add flowers to embroidery. Chapter 284. It's on the shelves. Tomorrow I'll have a proper outburst. Every 10 monthly votes I'll update it with 1,000 words. The maximum is 15,000 words. P.S. You're also casually smashing the recommendation tickets? After Su Fengnian entered the city he chose a large inn. According to the dynasty's military regulations, the light cavalry behind him had to go to the government office to submit a military document. Then Zhejiang City would arrange for a military camp to be stationed there. How could His Royal Highness take this seriously? When they alighted from the carriage, Murong Wuzhu and Murong Tonghuang had already put on thick curtained hats to cover their faces. When Murong Wuzhu saw Yu Yue holding Wu Mainyang she was stunned. Clearly, she didn't expect that there would be such a beautiful woman in the cavalry. After that soul-stirring robbery and counter-robbery, her spirit was at rock bottom. She lowered her head and followed closely behind Su Fengnian. When she stepped onto the stairs, she suddenly bumped into His Royal Highness's back. She was overwhelmed with shock. She was afraid that she would offend this foreign general who was gentle in speech but ruthless in his methods. However, Su Fengnian only raised his head to size up the two large red lanterns hanging at the entrance of the inn. There was a couplet written on them: "Not too late, first cast 28, the rooster crows earlier, C33. In the past, he couldn't figure out the meaning of this couplet. When he asked old Huang and Wenhua, he was even more clueless. He beckoned Yu Yue over and asked her. Only then did he know that it was a missing character couplet. The Taoist had a saying that there were 28 constellations and 33 heavens. It was very humorous to use this couplet on lodging. It was enough to show how much the Taoist ancestral court, Mount Longhu, had infiltrated the secular world. When the innkeeper saw that the young master had brought along beautiful women and a large group of tiger wolf armored soldiers, he didn't dare to be negligent and personally went out to welcome them. He didn't care about the fact that it was difficult for him to bend his back. After seeing this handsome young master in luxurious clothes and jade belt, he couldn't straighten his back and eagerly recommended the inn's signature wine and meat. After receiving the room number, the hungry Su Fengnian asked the innkeeper to set up a table in the small courtyard. A middle-aged woman personally brought a pot of wine. When Su Fengnian wolfed down the food, he only caught a glimpse of her extremely slender waist. Therefore her plump buttocks were especially shockingly curved. Moving his gaze up, he saw that her chest could also be considered spectacular. The innkeeper had a shifty-eyed appearance and wasn't very likable. However, this young woman, who was probably the innkeeper's wife, was plump and attractive. It seemed that the inn was determined to serve this group of foreign military lords well. When the young woman saw that the guests at the table had brought their own bowls and chopsticks, silver chopsticks inlaid with jade, emerald wine cups, and a servant girl in green clothes to test for poison, she was even more alarmed. Su Fengnian nibbled on a piece of pastry and raised his head to ask with a smile, "This pastry is not bad. What is it called?" The young woman carefully placed the pot of wine on the table and bent her waist to curtsy. Her plump chest bounced up and down as she spoke with a unique charming voice, reporting to the young master, "This is my inn's specialty lampcore cake." When Su Fengnian heard that pleasant accent, he exclaimed in surprise, "Madam is from Wuzhou? This accent is authentic Wu Honghu dialect. It's very pleasant to the ears. Compared to the Piling Creek dialect, it's softer and more glutinous." The young woman covered her mouth with one hand and held her chest with the other. She smiled sweetly and said, "Young master has good hearing. Even some Wuzhou natives can't distinguish between Wu Honghu and Piling Creek accents." Su Fengnian waved his hand and smiled with squinted eyes, "If madam doesn't mind, please sit down and chat. I'm afraid that madam will be tired if she stands." The quick-witted young woman, who was looking around, saw that when the handsome young master said this, his eyes quietly swept across her chest. She secretly rejoiced in her heart and did not pretend to be shy. She openly sat down. She knew that she was no longer in her prime. If she pretended to be a young girl, it would only annoy people. She might as well be straightforward and rely on her mature and plump body to tease men. However, after entering the courtyard, she did not dare to look carefully. She only focused on the handsome man in front of her. After sitting down and looking around, she suddenly felt ashamed of her inferiority. The woman with the white cat in her arms was really beautiful. Although she could not see the faces of the three women with curtains covering their faces, her refined temperament made her feel as if she was sitting on pins and needles. She wanted to cry but had no tears. This time she had lost a lot of face. Fortunately, the young master did not dislike her and talked to her about the local customs of Wuzhou. This made her originally dead heart reignite. She thought to herself, could it be that this handsome young man is tired of eating bird's nest and shark's fin and wants to try this unpresentable but tasteful lampwick cake? Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Who has Xianyuan taken a fancy to recently?" The young woman subconsciously said, "Young master, are you talking about the brother and sister of the Murong family? I heard that recently they will be brought to Mount Hui. The young scholars in Zhenzhou who are in love with them are stomping their feet and cursing them." Su Fengnian gently smiled and said, "Which Xianyuan young master is so lucky? The elder sister is called Murong Wuzhu and the younger brother is called Murong Tonghuang. They are the most famous pair of beauties in the neighboring Zhenzhou. There is even a ballad to praise them. It is said that they will be able to go to the imperial palace in the capital in the future. Isn't there a Wudong palace in the capital?" When the siblings were born, an immortal elder revealed the will of heaven and left a ballad as a prophecy. The general meaning is that the male and female will enter the Wudong Palace together. The young woman saw the gentle smile on the young master's face and drank a mouthful of wine. She became bolder and whispered, I also heard that the Xianyuan family is afraid that the siblings are too famous and will spread to the imperial palace. Isn't there a rouge review in the Jianghu? In order to prevent the Murong family from being listed on the review board, the Xianyuan family's ancestor put in a lot of effort. Su Fengnian narrowed his phoenix eyes. The purple-red mark between his eyebrows was like a vertical eyebrow. He became more and more elegant. He said softly and playfully, then isn't the taste of the Xianyuan family's ancestor a bit too heterogeneous? You won't even let Murong Tonghuang go? The young woman was already stunned. She only came back to her senses when the maidservant in green coughed. She lowered her head to drink wine to cover up her embarrassment. She raised her head to look at the young master and smiled charmingly. I heard that Murong Tonghuang is more beautiful than a woman. Chapter 285. Princess Jing, and sat at the table while the Murong siblings stood behind Su Fengnian. Their expressions were different. Murong Wuzhu was sad, worried, and helpless. She just stared at the back of Xianyuan and felt that she had luckily grasped onto a life-saving straw. No matter how big of a storm Xianyuan would cause or whether this straw would be broken by the deep-rooted Xianyuan family, she was not a tenacious woman. If it wasn't for her brother's insistence, even if she was taken to Mount Hui to be Xuanyuan's plaything, she would only cry a few times and accept her fate. Murong Tonghuang was furious. He pursed his lips and didn't say a word. Su Fengnian laughed and said, Madam, tell me how handsome Murong Tonghuang is. I don't believe that a man can be that handsome. Murong Tonghuang snorted coldly behind him. If the last dagger wasn't given to Murong Wuzhu, he would have stabbed him in the back. The proprietress had a strange look in her eyes and goosebumps. She mistakenly thought that the young master in front of her had a scholarly hobby. Su Fengnian's face was full of grievances, causing the lady boss's heart to ache so much that she wished she could pull him into her embrace and show him some tender affection. Immediately, her expression returned to normal, her elegant eyebrows raised, and in an instant she displayed the flirtatious charm of a young married woman. A woman's charm indeed, the young had their good points and the mature had their good points. She charmingly said, This servant has also not truly seen him. I only heard that his appearance can cause the lotus to not bloom. Su Fengnian nodded and said with emotion, Xianyuan is indeed worthy of the name of a womanizer. No matter how ignorant the young woman was, she still knew that Xuanyuan's family background was splendid. She nervously reminded him, Young master, you should be careful with your words. Although this is not Zhenzhou, it's better to be safe than sorry. Su Fengnian smiled and nodded, I appreciate your kindness but I can't repay you. I can only ask for more wine and snacks. The proprietress was very tactful. She enchantingly stood up and curtsied again. Her chest immediately trembled as she turned and walked out of the courtyard. Su Fengnian waited until she left the courtyard before he let the three beauties take off their restraints and sit down to eat. When the Murong siblings saw Princess Jingin's appearance, they were stunned. Obviously, they didn't expect that there was such a cool beauty in this world. Murong Wuzhu's eyes dimmed. Murong Tonghuang quietly sighed in relief. His hostility towards the unfathomable general's son dissipated a little. Su Fengnian looked at the three people eating slowly. He asked Bluebird to fetch a Bailiang short crossbow from the Phoenix Battalion. In the world's military, custom-made, was a very sensitive key. From the Bailiang army to the small bows, crossbows and sabers, all of the regulations were clear and organized. Not to mention the Bailiang sabers, the crossbow in His Royal Highness' hands was also very particular. The crossbow was a crossbow with a horizontal posture. It was different from the bow which could be shot immediately. The advantage of a crossbow was that the string could be drawn and the shot could be separated. The Bailiang crossbow had the ability to shoot continuously. This crossbow could shoot 4 pearls consecutively. Su Fengnian lowered his head. His fingers stroked the short crossbow's hanging blade and the hook with a concentrated expression. Murong Tonghuang asked seemingly unintentionally, Crossbow? Su Fengnian did not pay him any attention. He just remembered the Bailiang army's famous flowing crossbows. The crossbowmen rode their horses and roamed the battlefield, shuttling back and forth, sniping the enemy's generals and taking their lives from a distance of 100 paces. They were one of the Bailiang's renowned elite troops. It was not easy to become a flowing crossbowman. One's horsemanship and archery had to be outstanding. They were ranked first among the 6 classes of soldiers in Bailiang. There were more than 1,200 of them in total. Among them, 600 were organized into the Big Hut Battalion, and the rest were mostly scouts and roaming sentries. There was an unwritten rule in Bailiang. If a Baimang's son wanted to go to the border to earn real military merit, he must first be trained by the old soldiers to lose a few layers of skin and a few pounds of meat. If he was qualified and outstanding, he would be thrown into the sentry battalion as a scout. Only after fighting with the Bailiang spies with real swords and spears and cutting off 3 heads would he be considered to have a foothold in the Bailiang army. Not long ago, Li Hanlin sent a letter saying that he had successfully become a roaming sentinel. He had dreamed of running into those barbarians in Baimang. In the letter, he said that when his father heard that he was not content to stay in the rear and instead went to work as a scout, he was so angry that smoke was coming out of his 7 orifices. He did not have time to attend to the government affairs and rushed to the border military town, wanting to kidnap the only son of the Li family who was going to carry on the Li family's ancestral line and bring him home. He almost had a conflict with the Bailiang army. Fortunately, De Zhuge rushed back to the border from the capital and persuaded Li Hanlin, who was about to take the post of Bailiang's Taoist strategist, to go back. It was the Baimang that had been waging war all year round in the Liang dynasty. Su Fengyin was in a daze. The frontier poets of the dynasty liked to view the barbarians as animals that drank raw meat and drank blood. In the 100 barbarian country the people were valiant. The barbarian soldiers were all armored cavalry, and there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers who controlled the strings. From the emperor to the common people, there was a custom of widowing after the death of the father, the wife after the death of the mother, the wife after the death of the elder brother. In the eyes of the dynasty, this was simply shocking and had no morals to speak of. However, the biggest scandal of Baimang in recent years was that a woman who had caused chaos in the palace had become the emperor. In 30 years she had served 3 emperors, of which 2 were father and son. The last emperor, who had only ascended the throne for 13 days, could even be considered her nephew. This was something that was absolutely unimaginable in the Liang dynasty. It was said that this empress had 3,000 male companions. She was over 50 years old, but she was still very lustful. A few years ago she had even sent a secret envoy to send a message to Su Xiao. As long as Su Xiao was willing to surrender to Baimang, she was willing to be his wife and share the world with him. Su Xiao was also straightforward with this huge meat pie that could sow discord and win him over. He first killed the envoy and then sent a message to Baimang. It was just 5 words. "Slave Su still thinks I'm too old." Su Fengyin smiled. Su Xiao was too vicious. That old woman was the empress of Baimang, but he still thought she was too old to be his servant. However, that old woman's scheming was really terrifying. She was not angry at this monstrous humiliation. She just laughed it off. Su Fengyin put down his crossbow and looked up to see the unhappy Murong Tonghuang. He frowned and said, "Don't put on airs in front of me. Even a stray cat or dog on the roadside knows how to wag its tail." Murong Tonghuang's eyes were cold as he stared at Su Fengyin. Su Fengyin stretched out his hand and flicked the embroidered winter's scabbard. The embroidered winter rose up and with a bang, the most famous beautiful youth in Zhenzhou staggered back and fell to the ground. Su Fengyin sneered and said, "I'm not that pervert Xinyuan Pan. I'm not interested in you. So what if you look like a woman? Can you give birth to a son for me? A mule born from a donkey and a mare. Do you know that? You're one." Murong Wuzhu was stunned by Su Fengyin's vicious words. Murong Tonghuang lowered his head and squeezed out a laugh from the gap between his teeth. It was unknown where Murong Wuzhu's courage came from. He held a dagger with both hands and faced Su Fengyin. Su Fengyin picked up the crossbow again and pressed it against Murong Tonghuang's head. Murong Wuzhu, whose face was full of tears, cried out in alarm, "No!" Murong Tonghuang raised his head. The crossbow was pressed against his forehead. He looked up at Su Fengyin and unexpectedly smiled. His smile could bring disaster to a country and its people. It was especially natural and charming. He said softly, "I know I'm wrong." Murong Wuzhu's dagger fell to the ground. He stared at Murong Tonghuang in a daze as if he was staring at a stranger. Princess Jing, and smiled strangely. Yiyue did not look at this scene. She stroked Wu Meinyang's soft hair. Su Fengyin squatted down and looked at that face. He said calmly, "So pitiful." Chapter 286. Chapter 1, 4,000 words. Yang Qingfeng participated in the hunt for Yuan Tingshan. He had learned a wide variety of skills and was proficient in unorthodox methods. He was good at controlling animals. Xu Xiu, who was born as a witch in Nanjiang, was not bad either. She had many secret techniques. She kept a distance of 100 steps from Yang Qingfeng and advanced side by side. Ning Amei threw away the bow, iron halberd. With the halberd pouch on her back and 2 flying halberds in her hands, she led more than a dozen light cavalry to abandon their horses and enter the forest. Assuming a fan-shaped formation, she held short crossbows and charged forward. Judumi priest Wei Xiang's body was like a mountain elf, leaping from branch to branch, coordinating with Ningame. The 3 tracking forces cast an inescapable net in pursuit of the young swordsman. After Yang Qingfeng entered the forest, he bent down from time to time to check for clues on the ground. At first he could still see footprints in the forest, deep and shallow. It was easy to chase, but soon the footprints began to fade. His footsteps suddenly widened. The escape route was no longer as simple as simply stepping on the ground. Instead it was placed on tree trunks or rocks. Yang Qingfeng stopped and squatted down. He stretched out 2 sickly snow-white fingers to pinch some soil and sniffed it. His other hand took out 3 red-clawed black rats from a small pouch tied around his waist. He sprinkled the soil on the tips of their noses, and the little fellows scurried into the depths of the forest. Xu Xian came to Yang Qingfeng's side at some point and said lightly, "I didn't expect this kid to have some skills. I think we should just split up and completely widen the distance between us. Otherwise, if we accidentally hang ourselves on a tree, we won't have the face to see His Highness." The gloomy Yang Qingfeng nodded. He didn't want to work with this woman. It would be best if he could do it alone. He could also use some of his hidden tricks. Xu Xiu didn't dare to neglect His Royal Highness's important task. She waved her sleeves and changed direction. Like a goshawk, she soared into the sky. She stepped on the branches like a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water. After several bounces, she stood at the top of the tree. However, she didn't open her eyes to look into the distance. Instead, she closed her eyes and wrinkled her small nose. She suddenly opened her eyes and the corners of her mouth curled. Her delicate body swooped down quickly. She changed direction in the forest and chased after a breath. The swordsman was very cunning. He had already carefully and deliberately concealed his footprints. However, Xu Xiu was still able to follow him by relying on the breath that was against the wind. She muttered seductively, "Little guy is really naughty. Sister is so tired that I'm sweating all over. If I catch you, I'll skin you alive and pull out your tendons." In less than an hour, Xu Xiu successfully saw the swordsman's back twice. One time, the swordsman didn't run away. Instead, he ambushed Xu Xiu. His whole robust body was like a gecko sticking to the trunk of a tree. If Xu Xiu hadn't sensed that the breath had become heavier and determined that the swordsman was nearby, she would have been cut in half by the swordsman's saber. After Xu Xiu nimbly dodged this fierce and murderous strike, she retreated. Her hands and feet were glued to the trunk of a nearby tree. She looked down at the young swordsman who was grinning maliciously. She gently patted her heavy chest with one hand and said with a charming smile, "Oh, little brother, you don't even know how to have tender feelings for the fairer sex. Sister was worried about you all the way here for nothing." Yuan Tingshan, who was being chased by this woman like a shadow, wasn't flustered at all. He sheathed his saber and said with a mischievous smile, "My little brother isn't small. If sister doesn't believe me when it's just the 2 of us later, Yuan Tingshan will definitely make sister ecstatic." Xu Xiu, who was glued to the tree like a spider, said with a charming look, "Your little mouth is really sweet." Yuan Tingshan's ears kept trembling slightly. He tapped his legs with his saber. The 2 heavy lead weights wrapped around his calves shattered and fell to the ground. He said with a smile, "Sister's lover will be here soon. Little brother doesn't have the hobby of fighting 2 dragons and 1 phoenix. I'll leave first." If sister's mother was still here, she could have called sister to roll in bed with little brother. Sister is so beautiful, presumably mother's charm is still there. With 2 peaks confronting each other, little brother will be captured without a fight. Unfortunately, only sister is here today. Forgive me for not accompanying you." While he was flirting, Yuan Tingshan, who had lost more than 10 jin of weight on his legs, retreated with unusual agility. In a flash, he disappeared without a trace. Xu Xiu, who wasn't in a hurry to chase, slowly landed on the ground. She stuck out her small lilac tongue and licked the corner of her mouth. She clicked her tongue and laughed, teasing this old lady. After this close combat, the quick-witted Yuan Tingshan began to flee with the wind. He no longer went against the wind and left clues for Xu Xiu. This made Xu Xiu's anger soar. After she reunited with Yang Qingfeng by the stream, she saw Yang Qingfeng squatting on the ground to pick up a heavy iron inner jacket. Nearby, a black rat was nailed to the ground by a branch. Xu Xiu's mood improved. She looked across the stream and sniffed. She frowned and said, "This boy's martial arts are still okay, but he's as cunning as a fox. It's not a good idea to continue chasing him." Practicing lightness kung fu is clearly the stupid path of carrying a monolith. I estimate that he's carrying at least 20 gene of weight. You and I are not afraid of competing with just the strength of our legs. But he's going to attack faster and faster. The one surnamed Yang, don't fail miserably at such an easy task. Lu Qiantang is dead. Don't fall here. Sister is very lonely. Yang Qingfeng snorted coldly. Stepping on a rock, she prepared to leap across the stream. Although Xu Xiu seemed to be chatting idly, she had been sniffing Yuan Tingshan's scent all along. It drifted over from a distance. In addition, there were footprints on the ground by the stream. Logically speaking, they should have crossed the stream and entered the forest. But as Xu Xiu sniffed, her expression changed dramatically. Be careful. Her voice had barely faded when the water in the middle of the stream splashed up violently. He had accurately calculated the flow of Yang Qingfeng's qi. At the critical moment when Yang Qingfeng's body was slanting downwards, this ruthless saber stabbed out at the perfect moment. Fortunately, Yang Qingfeng's legs kicked against the cloud and rose up, forcibly raising her body by 10 feet. But if she stopped there, Yuan Tingshan's determined saber strike could still seriously injure Yang Qingfeng's legs. Xu Xiu's mind was instantly filled with hundreds of thoughts. Gritting her teeth, she kicked out a pebble with the tip of her foot, which violently shot toward Yuan Tingshan's Taiyang acupoint. In this rapidly changing situation, the outsider Xu Xiu held the initiative. If she did not interfere, Yang Qingfeng would most likely be at a disadvantage. Xu Xiu's kick could be divided into two subtle situations. If the pebble hit the blade, it would be most beneficial for Yang Qingfeng to get out of this predicament. But this pebble was aimed directly at Yuan Tingshan's Achilles heel. Xu Xiu's plan of sitting on top of the mountain and watching the tigers fight could be said to be ingenious. Without the slightest hesitation, Yuan Tingshan withdrew his saber and blocked the pebble. His body sank into the stream, and then he exploded the stream water and swept to the opposite bank. Laughing loudly, he said, "Sister, you have a new lover, but you still don't forget your old one. You're so greedy. Be careful not to overfill your stomach." Expressionless, Yang Qingfeng's toes tapped on the surface of the water. Like a swallow, she swept to the opposite bank. She said flatly, "I owe you one." Xu Xiu narrowed her eyes and did not say anything. Chapter 287. Chapter 2. With a calm and collected face, Su Fengyin left the city together with the old god of swords to visit the tombs. The accompanying green bird brought along Zhichang City's most famous Angelica wine. Li Chungang mocked, "How can such a soft-hearted person accomplish such a dog-fart important matter? There are so many pitiful people under the heavens. Do you have 3 heads and 6 arms or what? Can you take care of them all?" Su Fengyin rolled his eyes and said, "I already don't like the Xinyuan family, which is one of the top 3 families in the martial world. Now that I finally have something to use against them, if I don't go to the bull gang and cause a ruckus, I'll be sorry for being chased out by Xinyuan Qingfeng. Doesn't the Xinyuan family see siblings as food on the plate? I'll make the meat in my mouth fall into my own plate. If he's not convinced, he can make a move. When the time comes, it's no big deal for the old senior to open the gates of heaven again." The old god of swords glanced at him and said, "Can you stop scheming against this old man all the time? Now that you don't have Jiang and I to support you, if you really annoy this old man, he'll open the gates of heaven with his sword." Su Fengyin changed the topic and asked, "What kind of person is that old Xinyuan guy? I heard that if this pervert doesn't have a woman for a day, his eyes will turn red, his cheeks will become red like fire, and his skin will crack and his tendons will twitch. It sounds like he's possessed by the devil." The old man with the sheepskin fur coat thought for a moment and said with a crooked mouth, "What else can he be like?" Su Fengyin said helplessly, "Tell me in detail. We're about to go to Mount Hui to cause trouble, so we have to know ourselves and the enemy. If we go down the mountain with great fanfare and end up rolling down the mountain with our tails between our legs, that woman Xinyuan Qingfeng will laugh her head off." Li Chungang had an impatient expression and said lightly, "This old man can probably be considered half a martial genius, but he can't compare to Wang Xianji." Su Fengyin whispered, "Nonsense, if he's the same as Wang Xianji, why would I go to the bull gang?" The old god of swords kicked his royal highnesses but and turned around to ask Blue Bird for Angelica wine to quench his thirst. In the end he was met with a cold look. He sighed and said, "Brat, you only care about showing off in front of the siblings, you don't know the immensity of heaven and earth." If, goo. And? It sounded like he had been lustful and disrespectful all these years, but it was not that simple. This fellow had been proficient in Buddhism since a long time ago. In addition, his inner strength was already profound when he was in the prime of his life. He used the yin cauldron to supplement the yang cauldron to adjust the hard obstacle. Once he succeeded, he would have achieved immortality and his cultivation would be comparable to the great Jinren of Taoism. It's up to you whether you want to go to Mount Huishan. Su Fengyin rubbed his chin and thought about it seriously. The old god of swords asked softly, which one do you like between the siblings? Su Fengyin's mouth twitched. Old senior, you're wrong. The old god of swords said, indeed, with that guy who borrowed your spring thunder embroidered winter double blades, I'm afraid Murong Tong Huang won't catch your eye. Then when do you make a move on that white fox face? The later it is, the more you can't beat him. You won't even have the chance to force yourself on him. Actually, this old man can teach you a simple method. You just have to think of yourself as a woman. That white fox face is a man. Anyway, he's the most beautiful woman in the world. You won't lose out. Su Fengyin felt his hair stand on end and goosebumps appeared all over his body. He was full of grief and indignation. Li Chungang said disdainfully, what? You want to fight with this old man? Su Fengyin immediately flattered, how can I? I'm still waiting for old senior's sword to go against the flow of the six-layered waterfall and flood that bull mound. Li Chungang said disdainfully, virtue. After leaving Zhejiang City, they walked for 2 hours before they finally found a lonely grave. Weeds grew crazily in the 3-foot-long grave. Su Fengyin squatted down and pulled out the weeds that wrapped around the tombstone. He looked at the tombstone that was less than 3 feet tall and remained silent. After more than 20 years of cold wind and rain, the writing was already mottled and unclear. He could only vaguely see the fragmented sentences. The sun rises from the East Sea, the earth's chi surges boundlessly. The sun sets in Kunlun, the vault of heaven returns to rest. Spring and autumn return to spring and autumn, the sound of horses' hooves breaking the sound of reading books. I will encompass the universe, the vastness is the same as Qing Ming. The old god of swords had nothing to do, so he squatted down and squinted at the broken text on the tombstone, clicking his tongue in wonder. Su Fengyin took the wine from Blue Bird and slowly sprinkled it in front of the grave. The grave was at the top of the mountain. After offering a pot of wine, Su Fengyin sat on the ground and looked at the fields in the distance. He muttered to himself, I've always been good at writing, so I can only spend money to buy some poems from the scholars of Bailiang. Second sister was right, most of the poems I bought were just to express my worries. When read out loud, it's like a resentful woman crying for love. It's unbearable to the ear. But why can't the one in the grave live a few more years and write a few more sentences? 50 years of great work, told to the mountain ghosts. The old god of swords sat cross-legged and took off his boots. He picked his toes with his fingers and brought them to his nose for a sniff. He chuckled and said, if he's dead, he's dead. The one in the grave is not bad. There are still people coming to visit his grave. Like this old man, who would bring wine to the grave after his death and sweep the grave and pull out weeds. Su Fengyin nodded and said, that's true. The old man rubbed the soles of his feet and turned his head to ask, young Su, do you think you're pitiful? Su Fengyin laughed involuntarily and said, me? I'm the Motherf * king heir of Bailiang. Didn't someone from the previous dynasty say that I'll be the food of a cauldron when I'm alive and be cooked in a cauldron when I'm dead? I was born with mountains of gold and silver and didn't have to worry about food and clothing. There aren't many people in the world who care about food and clothing more than I do. Now that I even have hereditary inheritance, I still * king feel pitiful. I'd rather hang myself with my hair or suffocate myself to death with a woman's breasts. That's why I only feel pity for the descendants of a fallen country and the Jianghu assassins who went to Bailiang Palace to seek death. I don't think they're hateful. Since I'm Su Zhao's son, I should have this awareness. There's no such thing as enjoying life without suffering the cold or hunger. I still had some resentment before I left with old Huang, but it's gone now. The old god of swords laughed and said, you're quite open-minded. Su Fengyin said self-deprecatingly, actually, I'm also worried. Li Chungang smiled and asked, what are you worried about? Su Fengyin pulled up a weed and flicked the dirt off its roots. He put it in his mouth and chewed carefully. He said, I'm just worried about not being able to learn the two-sleeved green snake. The old god of swords said heroically, this old man's supreme art isn't something that can be learned so easily. Su Fengyin said softly, actually, I know that Senior's 216 green snakes are like forging iron, making the big yellow cord in my body more stable. As for how much of the two-sleeved green snake's essence I can learn, it's all up to fate, right? Li Chungang narrowed his eyes and said slowly, you're indeed not stupid. To put it bluntly, the two-sleeved green snake's sword moves are already extremely complicated, almost untraceable. Even if you wanted to learn it, you wouldn't know where to start. As for the sword opening the gate of heaven, it's purely sword intent, so you won't be able to learn it. Su Fengnian sighed bitterly while Blue Bird smiled behind him. The old god of swords also picked up a weed and chewed it. He spat it out and said, "Next, this old man will have to trouble you a little to feed you moves. Kid, don't bite off more than you can chew. First, you'll have to work on those 20 moves that you've pieced together. Actually, this old man's punches and kicks are enough to deal with Wang Mingyin." Without waiting for Su Fengnian to speak, the old god of swords wiped his face and said, "If little Jiang was here, she would definitely say that this old man doesn't even have a draft for bragging." Su Fengnian chuckled. He thought about which corner Miss Hehe was hiding in, waiting to make a move. The three of them went down the mountain and walked on the path in the field. "Kitsu, you really don't have any thoughts about that beauty called Murong Tonghuang? This kind of twin lotus flower on one stalk is hard to distinguish between male and female. It can be called an immortal item. Even with this old man's outstanding eyesight, it's a once-in-a-century chance. Are you really not tempted?" "You can be tempted. This old man can turn a blind eye to your beastly behavior this time. Just think that Murong Tonghuang is a woman. When the lights are dark at night, can you tell who is Murong Wuzhu and who is Murong Tonghuang? Can you tell who is male and who is female?" "Kid, why don't you fart? Old senior, I can't beat you in a fight now." "What? Little brat, don't think that this old man will feed you moves. In the future I'll still use the two-sleeved green snake to take care of you." "Don't? Then do you want to eat this pair of twin lotus flowers on one stalk? Get lost. Kid, you've been holding it in for more than a year, haven't you? Get lost." How can the word miserable be enough to describe it? There are so many peerless beauties in front of you, but you can't even eat a single one of them. Miserable, miserable. "Old senior, can I get lost?" Blue Bird walked behind. Listening to His Royal Highness and the old god of swords bickering, she smiled like a lotus flower in clear water. Chapter 288. Chapter 3. In the mountain forest, danger lurked everywhere. Xu Xiu, Yang Qingfeng, Ning Mei and Wei Shuyang's groups gathered together. They all felt a sense of powerlessness and frustration. Several times they wanted to surround and capture him, but in the end, that brat found an opportunity to escape. He was as slippery as a loach. One time, Ning Mei's short halberd even pierced that person's arm. That brat forcibly withstood a blow from old Taoist Mi's sleeve and used the momentum to roll a few times. Full of viciousness, he left behind a sentence, "Grandson, this grandfather will definitely return the favor double in the future." His shoulder knocked aside a Phoenix Battalion light cavalry behind him, and he once again fled into the shadows of the forest. The light cavalry was heavily injured by that ferocious collision. Yang Qingfeng's 3 red-clawed rats were all dead, and the last 2 had been crushed to death by that brat. Xu Xiu's expression was extremely unsightly. The best opportunity had been when that brat with a mouth full of obscenities had been shot by a powerful crossbow and forced into a dead end. However, with Xu Xiu's 2 hands and the vigorous internal energy that could activate the red armor of the Talisman General, she was only able to slap that brat surnamed Yuan into a tree. The thick tree had already been snapped, but he was still alive. This definitely wasn't Xu Xiu's intention to slowly play with him like a cat catching a rat. With one hand she should have slapped that brat until his insides split open. Xu Xiu couldn't figure out the strangeness of this situation. If it was a simple superposition of martial strength, this side was definitely much stronger than that brat. However, Yuan Tingshan's bladesmanship was firm and unyielding, and his temperament was rather cautious. In addition, he seemed to have a keen sense of danger. Twice, when the net was just a hair away from closing, he was able to escape. Ning Mei cupped some water from the stream and patted his face. He calmly said, "This person is a natural scout." Xu Xiu was slightly angered. "General Ning, if we can't capture this person, then we shouldn't leave the mountain." The paralyzed Yang Qingfeng expressionlessly said, "With His Royal Highness Gerfalcon's helping to keep an eye on him, we can capture him." Xu Xiu's anger flared even more. She mocked, "You're really promising." Wei Shuyang acted as the peacemaker. "No rush, no rush. The Phoenix Battalion is familiar with traveling at night. We'll chase for one more night. If we still can't find him tomorrow morning, we'll immediately leave the mountain and head to Zhejiang City. At that time, if your highness is angry, this humble Taoist will bear it." His expression he turned his head and asked without a change of expression. He turned his head and asked. Because they were busy chasing after the enemy, they didn't have time to retrieve many of the arrows that were shot out. Other than the one who was heavily injured, The other 9 members of the Phoenix Battalion reported the number of arrows they had shot out. Ningame said, "Let's redistribute it. Zhuji Yijinfu, you two escort the injured Xiaodonglu. Purposely keep a distance from us and act as bait." Without any hesitation, the 2 white horses replied, "Understood." Wei Xiang couldn't bear it. He said softly, "General Ning, isn't this a little?" Ningame, whose voice was as soft as that of the young woman from Wuzhou in Jigang City, smiled. She did not explain anything, but Xu Xiong could see the determination in this general's eyes. Xu Xiu couldn't help but ask, "General Ning, are you sure that kid will fall into the trap?" Ningame said calmly, "Yuan Tingshan has a vengeful personality. He's also very opportunistic. Even if there's a risk, he's willing to take a gamble. In this encirclement, I can see that this person has always believed in his gamble." Xu Xiu said, "Oh." She didn't say anything else. As long as the mission was completed, the death of a few light cavalry was nothing to her. But in her heart, her evaluation of this good-tempered Bailiang general increased. An hour later, Yuan Tingshan squatted on a branch and stared at the 3 light cavalry that had left the formation. The wound on his arm had been bandaged, and the short halberd was in his mouth. To kill or not to kill? Yuan Tingshan was hesitating. He could kill people with a sharp blade, but he could also cut flesh with a blunt blade. Even with his strong will, he was cursing in his heart. An originally easy mission had turned into such a miserable state. Even a clay bodhisattva would have some anger. Yuan Tingshan believed that in terms of talent, he was not inferior to the disciples of the aristocratic families. Among the Xinyuan brothers on the Bull Mound, 2 of them had left the mountain to travel the Jianghu to earn their reputation as heroes. One of them had almost had the tendons in his arms and legs broken, while the other had some real skills. They fought to a draw, but Yuan Tingshan only lost in terms of moves. If he really fought with his life on the line, he was confident that he could cripple the elegant aristocratic family disciple within 100 moves. A cold smile appeared on Yuan Tingshan's face. Reincarnation was very important. If one was born into a good mother's womb, they would be able to easily obtain top-tier secret manuals. With the guidance of an expert in the family, they would be stable. The people of the same age from the aristocratic families would pretend to be extraordinary. If they could not beat them, they could just cry to their parents. It would be difficult to suffer even if they wanted to. Song Kelly was undoubtedly one of the best among these people. Yuan Tingshan lowered his head and looked at the padao that was as inconspicuous as his own. What could he rely on? He could only rely on this damn padao to carve out a future for himself. Hateful. Hateful, I should kill. I don't believe that I will die here. As long as I don't live long enough, even the king of hell will not be able to take my life. Yuan Tingshan bit the short halberd and was about to jump down from the branch. His body instantly stiffened like a full moon bow. Someone above him laughed. At this critical moment, Yuan Tingshan was about to fight to the death. That person said softly, "Don't regret it." Yuan Tingshan did not move at all. He did not hesitate to reverse the flow of his qi. Blood oozed out from the corner of his mouth due to his internal injuries. However, his mind was extremely clear. No one wants to buy your life. I'm too lazy to kill you. I just find it fun to see you running around. I don't want you to die so early. Yuan Tingshan gritted his teeth and asked, "Who are you?" There was no response. Yuan Tingshan risked looking up and saw a little girl squatting on a swaying branch. She was carrying a golden sunflower. On the tree and under the tree they stared at each other. Other than an old man who taught me how to kill, I usually only talk to the dead or those who are about to die. If you speak more than 20 words, you will die even if you don't. How many words have you seen? The girl spoke very stiffly. At the end of her sentence, the corners of her mouth curled up. Yuan Tingshan's qi surged. He was not only bleeding from the corner of his mouth, but also from his 7 orifices. However, at this moment, his blade emitted an inch-long bluish-purple glow. That day he went deep into Mount Longhu with Xinyuan Qingfeng and saw a middle-aged Taoist fishing. He was the only one who ate all the vermilion fruits. At first, Yuan Tingshan did not think much of it. However, when he went down the mountain and boarded the boat, he heard a voice. It was that Taoist's voice. He only said the words "dragon spits water." However, when he looked around he could not see that Taoist. Then his qi began to roll. When he arrived at Mount Hui, he vomited blood all the way up the mountain. When he arrived at Sixfold Waterfall, he almost crawled under the dragon spits water. Later he had to carry the torrential water on his back. With his physique, it was reasonable to say that he could hold on for half an hour. Any longer and he would hurt his internal organs and meridians. However, he sat there for 24 hours. It was indescribably mysterious. His realm advanced rapidly. This was the biggest reason why Yuan Tingshan dared to use his blade against that young master on the white horse. Now he only lacked a secret blade technique manual. Yuan Tingshan raised his blade and chopped off half of the branches of the towering tree. At some point the little girl was squatting on a nearby tree. She was still carrying that eyesore of a sunflower. She said calmly, "Hey, your realm advanced." This time Yuan Tingshan was really running for his life. Chapter 289. The original name of Yanqi Pass had long been forgotten. It became Yanqi Pass only because a poet from the frontier fortress of the previous dynasty said that the southern geese wept to the north. This pass was heavily guarded by Bailiang. With one man guarding the pass, it forcibly blocked the northern barbarians' passage to the south. Dark clouds covered the city, wind and rain filled the buildings, and sand and rolling stones were flying in the desert. However, in the distance one could vaguely see Bailiang soldiers continuing to train in the sandstorm. Bailiang was as cold and bitter as the Bailiang cavalry. Further north, although there were more deserts, there were also patches of fertile water plants. The area around Yanqi Pass was completely desolate and barren. A white-clothed man stood at the top of the city wall. On his left was Dian Xiongzong, who looked like a western lion. On his right was Wei Fuqing, who looked like a poor old pedant. Dian Xiongzong, who held 6,000 iron stupa heavy cavalry, opened his bloody mouth and stood at the top of the city wall for a long time. In the end he couldn't help but roar, "General, now that Bailiang Road has been established, it's natural for the great general to be the Jidushi. Whoever dares to snatch this position, old Dian will chop him down with an axe." But why should the governor of Feng province, Li Gongda, be the administrator? This old fellow claims to be the second best at making money, and no one says he's the first. How can he govern Bailiang? Bah, I'll spit on his face. Old Dian, I'll say the ugly words here. If Li Gongda has the guts to be the administrator, we'll take 6,000 cavalry and slaughter him. Wei Fuqing's body was weak. As the wind and sand blew, he coughed repeatedly. He raised his sleeve to cover his mouth and said vaguely, "Don't talk nonsense. The administrator is not a rare thing. It doesn't matter who sits in this position. As for the supervisor, I don't know which guy the imperial court will send to take this position." Dian Xiongzong said carelessly, "Wei Fuzi, you're King poor and fastidious. How is the administrator not a good thing? Shouldn't the second most important official in Bailiang be our general?" Wei Fuqing waved his sleeve and said with a helpless smile, "You're a guy who only has strength but not brains. If the administrator is the general, then it will be a big problem. If the imperial court wants to do this and the general doesn't refuse." Teacher Wei stopped speaking halfway. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the rolling black clouds in the sky. He sighed softly. Stunned, Dian Xiongyo said, "What do you mean?" "Wei Fuzi, it's not like you don't know that old Dian's head was kicked by a horse when he was a child. It's useless. Whenever I move my head hurts." This was absolutely true. The third-rank military officer, Dian Xiongzong, had incomparable strength at a young age. One time he was dragging a horse in reverse on the street. In the end he was turned around and trampled by the crazy horse. Not to mention his body, his head was ruthlessly trampled by the horse's hooves. It was a miracle that he didn't die. However, everyone in Bailiang was well aware that General Dian's brain had nothing to do with whether it had been trampled by horses or not. Wei Fuqing was rendered speechless by this scoundrel's scoundrelly behavior. After carefully weighing his words, he said slowly, "You want the general to go to Liangzhou City to be the administrator, to deal only with official documents all year round, and to ignore all military affairs in Bailiang?" Dian Xiong was stunned. This? From beginning to end, the white-clothed Chen Zhibao turned a deaf ear to him. He only turned his head to look at one of Bailiang's newest young generals. His surname was Che and his name was Yi. He was born in Beimang, but he was a slave of the lowest status. He was skilled in archery and horsemanship, and he was good at fighting. He was originally a man of sacrifice raised by the nobles, but he had committed a heinous crime in Beimang. All the way to the south, he had killed more than 20 Beimang's wolf and eagle guard with one man, one horse and one bow. This Wolf Fang soldier was already the second best warrior in Beimang, second only to the great Tiger Ben. He was roughly equal to the Iron Soldiers of Bailiang. It must be known how cruel the Iron Soldiers' selection process was. They were given a short crossbow or a hard iron bow, 20 arrows, a Bailiang saber and 3 days' worth of food. 5 people in a team were thrown into Beimang's territory. Each person had to cut off 6 heads of Beimang soldiers before they could return. After that, there were still tests for infantry and cavalry. After Che Yi defected to Bailiang's army, He joined the scouts and immediately became the crossbowman who had beheaded the most people. Last year, he followed Qin Jibao and personally led 600 cavalry to raid Beimang's White Sun City. With one arrow, he shot through a certain member of the Beimang royal family who was patrolling the border. When this kid returned with Qin Jibao, he had a total of 30,000 Beimang cavalrymen hanging on his tail. Taking everything into account, Che Yi was only 19 years old this year. Che Yi was wearing silver armor and holding a helmet in his hand. The wind and sand blew in his face, but he remained motionless. Qin Jibao gently waved his hand, indicating for Che Yi to take 2 steps forward and stand side by side at the top of the city wall. He smiled and said, "Do you think it will rain in this weather?" Dian Xiongnan slapped his forehead. The general was really too much. If he had the time to ask about such trivial matters, he might as well tell old Dian about the administrator. Wei Fuqing rubbed his eyebrows with his thumb and smiled without saying a word. The young Che Yi shook his head and said, "Reporting to the general, it won't." Qin Jibao made a sound of acknowledgement and then fell silent again. Dian Xiongnan couldn't bear the loneliness, so he wanted to go down the city wall and train those bastards outside the city. All of a sudden, a crack appeared in the thick black clouds, and a ray of sunlight shone on the city wall. It shone on the white-robed Qin Jibao and the scout Che Yi. Because the latter was wearing silver armor, he immediately shone with golden light, like a divine soldier and celestial general. At this time, howls shook the sky at both ends of the Yinma River about 5 kilometers away from the city. There were more than 100 iron chains hanging on the Yinma River all year round. At this moment, all of them were pulled taut by the soldiers standing on both sides of the river. It was a tug-of-war between 50 people. Regardless of whether they were soldiers or captains, regardless of whether it was winter or the scorching sun, they all had to bare their upper bodies. Their skin was soft and tender. If they were pulled out once or twice in June or July, their skin would explode. Now that autumn was coming, they could be considered lucky. But in a few months it would be the worst. According to Beiliang's military rules, how could the loser of a tug-of-war lose? That was to drag the other party into the river with the iron chains. In summer it could be used as a bath, but in winter how could it be comfortable to fall into the river? Beiliang's army had many small hills, and the pillar state didn't care about it. However, private fights were prohibited. This was an iron law. If there was friction, it was fine. Either go to the drill ground and have a fierce fight, or each side brought 50 people here for a tug-of-war. When a hunchback old man accompanied by White Bear Yuan Zuozong came down to the Yinma River, all the shirtless men instantly felt their blood boil. Oh my God, the great general is here. There was no harmony in a tug-of-war. When the great general returned from the capital to Beiliang, who the hell wanted to lose face? Su Xiao, who wasn't wearing armor, came near a group of 50 Beiliang soldiers with his hands behind his back. He smiled and didn't say anything, just looking at the iron chains across the river. Gradually, people fell into the river from the 100 iron chains. After a whole incense stick's time, only the iron chain beside Su Xiao remained across the Yinma River. Su Xiao squinted and saw that more than half of the 100 people on both sides of the river had blood on their hands. Their shouts were hoarse. Someone on the left bank shouted, "Zhao Teju, you didn't drink milk when you were young, right? Stand up for me." Someone on the right bank shouted, "As long as your hands aren't broken, stand up for me one by one. Whoever slacks off first, I'll make you raise your ass when we get back to the barracks." Bastard. Do you really think you're a coward? Come on, kid, didn't you claim to be able to draw a 3-stone bow? This time beat those bastards on the other side. Huang Qiong, you're the bastard. No one expected that the iron chains would be broken by 2 groups of people. The 100 people were all lying on the ground, unable to move a finger. Their hands were all covered in blood. Su Xiao smiled and said, "Okay." No one knew who was the first to shout, but all the soldiers who could still move shouted at the top of their lungs, "Long live the great general! Long live the great general!" The hunchback old man didn't stop them. If he didn't say anything, who would dare to go to the capital? Su Xiao turned to look at the top of the city wall and said to himself, "Why are you standing so high up?" Chapter 290. News of the sudden death of 20 riders near Zhejiang City in He Province had already spread throughout Mount Hui, and there was no news of their leader, Yuan Tingshan. For a time, all kinds of rumors and slanders were flying around. Some said that Zhao Yi, the prince of Guangling, had mobilized his armored cavalry to steal a woman. Others said that Yuan Tingshan, who was destined to be a lone star, had brought disaster upon himself and had been targeted by Zhao Go, implicating the cavalry team that the clan had spent a great deal of money to train. Others said that the young male and female of the Murong clan were not ordinary people and had the protection of immortals. All kinds of rumors were said and all kinds of sneaky. Because the old family head had been in closed-door training for many years, and Xinyuan Guiqi, who was in charge of Mount Hui, was having a sword competition with someone at the Dongyue sword pool, the Xinyuan mansion on Bull Mound was without a leader. In addition, there were many factions within the clan to begin with, and the eldest branch and the other branches appeared united in appearance, but were divided at heart, so there was no one who could suppress the growing clamor. Xinyuan Qingfeng was from the eldest branch of the main branch, which was the main branch of the Xinyuan clan. Unfortunately, no matter how much effort the ancestors put in to nurture her father, Xinyuan Jingqing, he was not of much use. What could they do if they couldn't be helped? A large clan also had its advantages. Xinyuan Qingfeng had two uncles, Xinyuan Jingqing and Xinyuan Jingxian. One was calm and steady, while the other was determined to make progress. The latter's talent in martial arts was particularly astonishing, and he was only a thin layer of paper away from the realm of grandmasters. It felt like he would break through with a single poke if he dipped his finger in saliva. Therefore, in Xinyuan Jingshuan's line, the mother's status depended on the son's, and the son's glory depended on the father's, so they were domineering in Mount Hui. However, in the entire Mount Hui, the man that Xinyuan Qingfeng least wanted to see was her biological father, the man who only knew how to nod his head and say yes. In an ordinary landowning household, the behavior of the eldest grandson of the main branch might be barely enough to maintain the image of a gentle and well-mannered man. However, this was Bull Mound, and the Xinyuan clan was a martial arts clan that stood on equal footing with the Wu clan and the Lu clan of Western Shu. So what if he was well-read? Could he compare to a pair of fists that could destroy mountains and shake cities? Everyone on the mountain knew that not only did Xinyuan Jingqing grant his only daughter's request, he was also extremely fearful of his wife, and never had the slightest thought of taking in a concubine. Although the Xinyuan clan was so domineering that anyone who wanted to come up the mountain had to change their surname to Xinyuan, and there was no lack of martial arts heroes who married into the Xinyuan clan, but the dignified eldest son of the main branch did not have a single heir to carry on the family name. Even if Xinyuan Qingfeng succeeded in getting a talent to marry into the family in the future, the main branch of the main branch would never be able to lift their heads up high. In these years, there was discord, and many people changed their allegiance to the other two branches that were flourishing with each passing day. Xinyuan Jingqing completely became a loner, and everyone even knew that the wife who gave birth to the eldest grandson of the main branch still loved someone else to this day. At the beginning of their marriage, she made a defiant promise with Xinyuan Jingqing that she would only have one child, and whether it was a son or a daughter would be left to fate. After Xinyuan Qingfeng was born, Xinyuan Jingqing really kept his promise. When Xinyuan Qingfeng was young, she still ignored her mother's gloomy expression that could never be resolved. She felt that her father, who never lost his temper, did not do anything wrong. As she grew older, she finally understood how fatal her father's indifference was in the Xinyuan clan, who had worshipped martial arts for hundreds of years. The older she grew and the more she was exposed to the ways of the world, the more Xinyuan Qingfeng wanted to stay as far away from this mediocre man as possible. When Xinyuan Qingfeng saw Song Kelly off Mount Hui, she naturally felt guilty towards this young phoenix of the Song family. The Song family was a first-class noble family in the dynasty. Moreover, the Song family had only one son in 3 generations. Song Kelly's importance was self-evident. Interacting with Xinyuan Qingfeng was already degrading his status. The Xinyuan clan could do whatever they wanted in Jianghu, but this was not worth mentioning to the important officials of the imperial court. After Xinyuan Qingfeng met Song Kelly, who was escorting the coffin to the south, she used many tricks to get to know him. With Song Kelly's eyesight, he should have seen through it long ago. However, he still didn't mind Xinyuan Qingfeng using him, or rather using the Song family to show off within the Xinyuan clan. Not only did he come to Mount Hui, but he also seemed to have a pleasant conversation with Xinyuan Jingqing at the Bull Hill, giving Xinyuan Qingfeng a lot of face. Even though Xinyuan Qingfeng didn't have a good impression of scholars, she still felt some inexplicable feelings towards Song Kelly. She didn't know whether it was out of gratitude or admiration. That Yuan Tingshan who was so conceited that he didn't even try to hide his wild ambitions? Xinyuan Qingfeng asked himself, would I feel regret if he really died? Walking down the mountain on the limestone path, Xinyuan Qingfeng glanced at the 6-fold sisters' waterfall. Song Kelly smiled and said, I learned some physiognomy from my father. It's not easy for Yuan Tingshan to die. His fate is very bad, but he's very tough. Xinyuan Qingfeng was a bit frightened and was about to explain. Song Kelly said gently, Miss Shenyuan, you're overthinking. Shenyuan Qingfeng didn't say anything else. He was afraid that he would add fuel to the fire. The two walked silently on the path. When they reached the foot of the mountain they saw a boat. Song Kelly suddenly stopped and hesitated for a moment. In the end he said, Mr. Shou Zhuo is very knowledgeable and has analyzed the three doctrines in simple terms. I've been talking with Mr. Shou Zhuo through candlelight for the past few days and have learned a lot. Mr. Shou Zhuo said that learning from reading scriptures is like looking at plum blossoms and drawing pancakes. His words enlightened me. In the past, I remembered my family's teachings to be humble and respectful in all matters and not to be overbearing. However, in the end, I didn't understand why I had to be humble. In the eyes of a wise person, my childish words and actions would only make me a laughing stock. Miss Shenyuan, please forgive me for speaking bluntly, but Mr. Shou Zhuo is definitely not a mediocre person. Shenyuan Qingfeng smiled and didn't think much of it. He only joked, Did my father ask you to be a lobbyist? How many books did he give you? Song Kelly was stunned and murmured, A father knows his daughter best. Everything is within Mr. Shou Zhuo's expectations. While Shenyuan Qingfeng was puzzled, Song Kelly turned around and bowed to Bull Gang. He said happily, I admire you. Looking at Song Kelly's back as he boarded the boat, Shenyuan Qingfeng was confused. Chapter 291. Song Kelly stood at the bow of the ship and slowly sailed towards the Shi River. He didn't forget to wave at Shenyuan Qingfeng who was on the shore. After going up the mountain, Song Kelly's bearing was impeccable. Not to mention talking about Buddhism and Taoism with Shenyuan Jingxian, he was also neither servile nor overbearing when exchanging martial arts experiences with Shenyuan Jingxian. In fact, the truth was that Shenyuan Qingfeng didn't need to make any arrangements. He would go to Mount Hui to visit Shenyuan Jingqing. Putting aside whether this person was hiding something, just his meticulous planning in politics was enough to impress his grandfather. Song Kelly's deceased teacher greatly praised him. Song Kelly went south to Jianzhou to escort the coffin as a disciple, but more importantly he wanted to test Shenyuan Jingqing's ability. If he was truly talented, the Song family wouldn't mind promoting a scholar from a common family to help him consolidate his position in the family. If he was only an armchair strategist, Song Kelly could also turn to Shenyuan Jingxian. After all, this power had been rooted in Jianzhou for hundreds of years and could help him do many things that scholars couldn't do. Before going down the mountain, Shenyuan Jingqing smiled faintly and said, When the scholar and the butcher become neighbors, let the scholar use his mouth. When fighting, the butcher will use his hands. There's no harm in helping each other. Although this reassurance was not small, it was still not enough for Song Kelly to make up his mind to marry Shenyuan Jingqing. Marriage between a noble family and a commoner family was a big taboo in the scholarly community, second only to the loss of descendants. The ship sailed into the Shi River and the view was broad. Song Kelly had the impulse to sing a song about the heroism of the great river. Deep down, the young phoenix of the Song family was not very courteous. The ghosts of Xiang Fan cried, the monkeys of Shu Dao cried, and the waves of the river were vast and boundless. He wanted to write a poem to express his feelings. Unfortunately, Song Kelly's family had learned a lot and he was not inferior to a famous scholar. However, during the journey, Song Kelly would send out beautiful poems into the scholarly community every once in a while. The unknown inside story was that many of these poems were written by his father or even his grandfather. How difficult was it for a scholar to become famous? Hoping to write a poem that would shock the world? It was almost impossible. Without the support of the seniors in the literary world, and without the support of the students, no matter how well it was written, it could only be described as passable. Nowadays, the famous works were not famous when they were first published. It was only after hundreds of years of being passed down through generations and generations that they were gradually recognized by the giants in the literary world. Song Kelly could not be more familiar with this. How many Wang Dongxiang were there in the world? What's more, the first Snow was a voluminous 500,000 words long. While Song Kelly was having mixed feelings, he saw a tall ship coming towards him. A handsome young man with a sword was standing at the bow of the ship. Beside him was a maid in green and a one-armed old man wearing a sheepskin coat. Song Kelly didn't pay much attention to them and just thought that they were ordinary pilgrims visiting Longhu. Song Kelly stayed in Mount Hui because he wanted to wait for the Bailiang crown prince. Unfortunately, he still had things to do under his father's orders. He couldn't wait any longer. The two tiger kuei that finally didn't have to stay in the carriage played coquettishly at Su Fengyan's feet. Su Fengyan pointed at the bluestone roof of Mount Hui and asked, Bull's gang? The old god of swords nodded. Su Fengyin squinted his eyes and rubbed the handle of his spring thunder. Unexpectedly, the operation to capture Shenyuan Yuan Tingshan some time ago had ended in failure. According to Wei Shuyang's detailed description, this Machateman's martial prowess couldn't be considered world-shocking. There was still a large gap between him and the outstanding talents of the younger generation, Qi Xinxia and Wu Luding. However, his intelligence and luck were excellent, so His Highness the heir of the crown wasn't angry. Even though Prince Jinggan Zhaoheng had suffered a double loss at the Reed Marsh, how could he not be able to kill Yuan Tingshan? Then there was Yuan Meng's visit to the Hezhou provincial governor with Bailiang's military edict. It was a fact that the Shenyuan family banned people by force. However, the old man ignored it. Looking at his attitude, he didn't even care about Chu Lushan, who had already caused chaos in Xiangfan City. Su Fengyin muttered to himself, "What a tough guy." The old god of swords used his finger to pick a vegetable leaf between his teeth. He grinned and said, "There are as many scholars as there are fish in the river. It's normal to have a few who aren't afraid of death." Su Fengyin didn't comment on this. The boat turned to the foot of Mount Hui. Su Fengyin was in a hurry to go to Mount Longhu, so he didn't want to cause trouble for Shenyuan. He just chatted with the old god of swords. Shenyuan Qingfeng stood at the foot of the mountain for a long time. When she was finally about to turn around and go up the mountain, her delicate eyes suddenly widened. She jogged a few steps and saw the guy standing at the bow of the boat. She was furious. This bastard. She would recognize him even if he was reduced to ashes, let alone changed into luxurious clothes. It was this bastard who claimed to be surnamed Su. He and a wanderer with a wooden sword had humiliated her in every possible way in Wuzhou's lantern market. Shenyuan Qingfeng looked carefully and sneered. "Don't think that you can pretend to be a noble just because you swindled a few taels of silver." Without needing Shenyuan Qingfeng to say anything, Su Fengyin, who had been pointing at the scenery of Mount Hui, also saw this woman. He had searched high and low for her, but to no avail. He laughed and steered the boat closer to Mount Hui. He leaned on the railing and looked at Shenyuan Qingfeng, who was less than 10 zhang away. He deliberately mispronounced a word and shouted, "Guliang." Shenyuan Qingfeng didn't care about ladylike etiquette and angrily said, "Surnamed Su. What a heartwarming reunion." Su Fengyin clicked his tongue and said, "Since we parted at the lantern market, how did Guliang gain weight?" Shenyuan Qingfeng gritted her teeth and sneered, "If you have the ability, come to Mount Hui as a guest. Shenyuan Qingfeng will definitely be a good host." Su Fengyin rested his chin on his hand and said with a smile, "You miss me so much?" There was a Shenyuan ship at the foot of the mountain. Shenyuan Qingfeng ran onto the ship and tried to catch up. One ship wasn't in a hurry to escape, while the other chased relentlessly. Soon the two ships were only 50 zhang apart. Su Fengyin slowly walked to the stern of the ship and suddenly sped up. He leaped onto the railing and shot towards Shenyuan Qingfeng like an arrow. Under her dumbfounded gaze, Su Fengyin stood on the railing of the ship she was on and looked down at this arrogant woman from the Shenyuan family. Su Fengyin glanced at the restless Shenyuan retainers. Just as he was about to speak, something strange happened on the surface of the river. A sloppy old Taoist came over on a raft. The skinny young man on the bamboo raft pursed his lips and gently breathed in and out. One end of the bamboo raft suddenly pierced into the river while the other end was raised high. He used the momentum to bounce onto the ship and spread his legs like a wild horse. Then, with a kick, he actually caused the entire ship to sink. The strength? The young man instantly jumped high and crashed onto the bow of the ship where Shenyuan Qingfeng was standing. The ship shook violently again. Other than the old god of swords, Li Chungang, all the passengers on the two ships were slightly agape. Not to mention this Qinggong, but the strength to cause the ship to sink several feet? After the ordinary-looking skinny young man landed on the ground, he turned around and hugged His Royal Highness's legs tightly. He cried out at the top of his lungs, "Brother!" Chapter 292. The two warships that had accurately calculated the depth of the Green Dragon stream slowed down after the withered young man stepped on them. The Shenyuan family's private warship wanted to quietly increase its speed and keep the two brothers with different appearances on board, but the warship in front would not let it succeed. Swords were drawn and swords were unsheathed, but Shenyuan Qingfeng only saw the withered young man with bamboo-like arms carry Brother Su to the back of the bed. He hugged him tightly and refused to let go. The Shenyuan family dominated the southeast Wulin, and those who were qualified to stay on the warship were all elites. After receiving a signal from Shenyuan Qingfeng, the two swordsmen swung their swords like dragons and stabbed the young man's back. They wanted to pierce through the brothers and nail them to the warship's railing like sugar-coated haws. They wanted to show their power to those foreigners who had angered Miss Shenyuan. 2 lives were nothing to Shenyuan. Why had the governor's office of the Sword Province been able to operate smoothly all these years under the suppression of the Prince of Guangling? Wasn't it because they had the full support of the Flood Dragon that had dominated Mount Hui for 500 years? Otherwise, when a scholar encountered a military ruffian, he would have been suppressed by the powerful Prince Zhao Yi to the point that he was worse than a stray dog. Since the governor's office of the Sword Province was mutually beneficial, the governor's office of the Guangling army was not a mediocre person. He had given Shenyuan a great deal of power and authority, and had spared no effort in eliminating dissidents through bloody means. He had secretly supported Shenyuan. Otherwise, how could Mount Hui have cultivated a 200-man private cavalry under the nose of the imperial court? Shenyuan Qingfeng frowned. She clearly saw that Brother Su only touched the young man's head and did not seem to notice the 2 swords. This was not in line with this guy's cowardly demeanor. Although Huang Manor's heart acupoint was not opened, his sense of danger was probably above that of Yuan Tingshan's. The 2 swords came at him, but he did not seem to move skillfully. He only turned around and held the sword with both hands. The swordsman suddenly exerted force, wanting to crush the ignorant young man's palm. Huang Manor's face was as ferocious as a vajra. He suddenly twisted, easily twisting the sword as if it was a reed pole. He then pulled it again and rushed forward, dragging the 2 swordsmen who hesitated and did not have time to let go of their swords in front of him. His 2 fists smashed into the swordsmen's chests. A thick mist of blood exploded from the swordsmen's chests, and they died on the spot. Their corpses fell into the river like kites with their strings cut. The rest of the Shenyuan men of sacrifice who were originally watching the show saw that the situation was not good. In order to protect Shenyuan Qingfeng, who was standing on the bow, they had to brace themselves and go forward. As a result, the young man was still stabbed between his eyebrows by a sharp sword. He laughed and raised his arms, causing his clothes to flutter. Everyone saw that the sword formed a large arc between the 2 of them, but it did not pierce between his eyebrows at all. The sallow and emaciated young man stepped on the right foot, raised his left knee and placed his center of gravity on his right foot. His right foot rotated forward and his left knee turned inward, and the instep straightened outward. He suddenly jumped into the air and whipped out his lower leg. The force of the kick reached the instep of his foot, and the result was that when the young man landed on the ground, the body of the man of sacrifice was still in the forward position, but his head flew several feet into the air. The young man stretched out his hand to push away the headless corpse, and stared at Shenyuan Qingfeng, whose lips had turned pale. The few men of sacrifice who knew each other well looked at each other and saw the shock and fear in each other's eyes. No wonder this monster could shake the boat with one step. Not to mention the strength of the dragon and elephant, his attack speed was also extremely fast. Damn it, this young man actually had the legendary indestructible body of a Vajra? Amidst the dead silence, 2 supernatural beasts leaped across the river one after another. They were completely red, covered in armor and scales, and dragged their tails behind them. They jumped from the boat in front to the Shenyuan ship, and their front claws just happened to grab onto the railing. After a few struggles, they finally squatted on the railing and bared their fangs and claws. The young man leaned forward and let out an angry roar. Shenyuan Qingfeng was so scared that he staggered back. Outside the ship, a sloppy old Taoist was walking on a raft. Coincidentally, a head smashed towards him, and he rudely slapped it into the river with a bamboo pole. He clicked his tongue and said, "How can a short donkey and a horse bear the stampede of a dragon and elephant?" The old Taoist was like a 1,000-year-old tortoise. He stretched his neck and shouted, "Your Highness, we're about to reach my Xiaoyao temple." Zhao Shituan hesitated for a moment and said with a smile, "Tell Shenyuan Great Pan to stop being a coward. If he doesn't come out, he'll be waiting for his nest to be destroyed." Su Fengyan no longer paid attention to Shenyuan Qingfeng. He pulled Huang Manor and didn't return to the ship. Instead, he jumped onto the bamboo raft, and the 2 tiger kuei followed closely behind. The King Kong's eyesight was obviously not as good as its sister Bodhisattva's. It directly dove into the water, causing countless splashes. Bodhisattva, who was on the bamboo raft, saw her brother having fun in the river and also jumped down. Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Old Taoist, I didn't say that I'm going to Mount Hui to cause trouble. What are you blindly making a fuss about? Are you planning to divert the trouble from the west to the east?" The old Taoist, who was the quietest and most unknown Taoist in the Taoist master residence, purposely exclaimed in surprise. He was afraid that the eccentric crown prince of Bailiang would turn hostile. To be honest, as the second Taoist master of the Taoist immortal abode, Old Taoist Zhao Shituan's seniority in the Taoist orthodoxy could be said to be superior to the 33 heavens. Mount Longhu and Bailiang were separated by thousands of li, so the old Taoist had seen all kinds of storms. When he was in Bailiang's territory, he didn't mind putting his arm around this junior's shoulder. It wasn't necessarily because he was afraid of the great pillar state Su Xiao. It was just that he had a carefree temperament to begin with. When he was young, he was also an extraordinarily frivolous and alcoholic. He was truly a rare talent with great ambition. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left the country to travel far away with his sword. Once he left the mountain, he didn't return to Mount Longhu for a whole 20 years. Now that he met His Royal Highness, who was frivolous and unrestrained, he was quite suitable. If it were Zhao Danxia and Zhao Dongping's nephews, one of whom was a minister of Yue and the other a prime minister of Qingxi, who were together with Crown Prince Su Fengnian, they wouldn't have such an attitude. Su Fengnian glanced at the giggling Huang Manor, then raised his head to look at the old Taoist. He asked in surprise, "You're not afraid of water anymore?" Chapter 293. The old Taoist nodded. "I've been afraid for a long time. Xiaoyao Temple is right next to the Green Dragon Stream. I told him to follow the stream to Mount Hui where the Dragon King River enters the Shi River, then keep going north until it reaches the Spring God Lake. We'll be getting closer and closer to Bailiang. I told him that your brother will come to Mount Longhu in autumn. Dragon Elephant will wait for you at the stream if he has nothing to do. Then he won't be afraid of the water anymore." Su Longxiang hit the water with his palm and a big fish was shaken out of the water. His claws were like hooks. After catching the fish, he looked at his brother and grinned foolishly, as if he was asking for credit. Su Fengnian patted Huang Manor's head and shook his head. "When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Just eat some vegetarian food. Let the fish go." Huang Manor put the fainted fish back into the water, but it was eaten by a tiger kuei chasing after the bamboo raft. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Is there an old Taoist called Zhao Huangchao in Mount Longhu? A very old senior?" Old Taoist Zhao Shituan thought for a while and shook his head. "There are many century enlightened masters in seclusion on the mountain, but none of them are called Zhao Huangchao." The boats and rafts sailed up leisurely while the Xinyuan cruise ship turned around and returned to the Mount Hui pier. Xinyuan Qingfeng stood at the window of the cabin. His lips were livid and his body was trembling. It was hard to tell if he was scared or angry. She wasn't blind. Although her martial arts talent was mediocre, she had a good memory and was outstanding on Mount Hui. No matter how complicated the moves were, she would never forget them. To put it nicely, Mount Hui was a place where people from all walks of life accepted talents. To put it bluntly, it was a place where people of all walks of life lived together. The Xinyuan family had a rich collection of books. Other families and sects regarded them as treasures, but the aspiring tripod pavilion in Mount Hui had countless books. In terms of the number of books, it was only inferior to the Tide Listening Pavilion in Bailiang. Yuan Tingshan said he wanted to marry her because he saw her as a shortcut to the peak of martial arts. Even if she couldn't enter the aspiring tripod pavilion, as long as Xinyuan Qingfeng personally taught her, all problems would be solved. How could Xinyuan Qingfeng not see how terrifying the yellow-skinned youth was? Perhaps in the entire Hui Mountain, there were no more than 10 people who could create such a huge commotion. If the invincible Vajra behind the youth was included, the number of people who could be counted on one hand. That was fine. This unfamiliar word made Xinyuan Qingfeng's heart tremble. After the spring and autumn period, although the title of crown prince had a tendency to spread in the dynasty, as long as one was a legitimate son of a noble family or a bastard son, they were qualified to hold this title. However, the title of crown prince became more and more precious. Only the princes and princesses of the imperial family could be called crown prince. In the southeast of the dynasty, according to the law, only the descendants of Zhao Yi, the crown prince of Guangling, could be considered crown prince. Zhao Yi had 3 sons and 6 daughters. The crown prince, Zhao Yu, hadn't been hereditary. Speaking of which, it was strange. It was probably due to the heavenly Tao's retribution that the lecherous Zhao Yi had snatched countless beauties. The 7 concubines who had broken the rules were all beautiful enough to captivate the birds and beasts. However, their children all resembled Zhao Yi. All of them had big heads and ears and were as fat as pigs. They did not inherit the looks of the concubines at all. If that was the case, who was the fellow whom the Longhu Taoist addressed as Your Highness? There was no need to doubt the identity of Crown Prince. If he wasn't a descendant of a Crown Prince, who would dare to bring elite soldiers with him? Even the powerful Guangling Duke, Zhao Yi, would not hand over such information to the imperial court. His children leaving the duke's manor to play was even more relaxed than ordinary families. His surname was Su? Xinyuan Qingfeng's face was pale. After all, Xinyuan was one of the top aristocratic families and was well informed. She also heard that the eldest son of Su Xiao, who had a different surname, traveled for 3 years before returning to Bailiang to avoid marrying into the crown prince's family. For some reason he went out again this time. Not long ago he caused trouble in Gangnam-do. Thousands of scholars from the Imperial College in the capital clamored for the emperor to issue an edict to Jiangnan. Otherwise the country would be in chaos and the law would be against the law. Unfortunately, the butcher who took away the title of pillar of the country was still favored by the emperor and protected his royal highness. As long as the king of Bailiang was in the capital, no official above the 4th rank dared to impeach him. Only the scholars of the Imperial College wrote tearful letters in blood, which made them a joke. Shenyuan Qingfeng still remembered the arrogance of the Bailiang cavalry under Mount Longhu when the older generation of Mount Hui talked about it. At that time, it wasn't because of her family's righteousness, but because after the iron hooves flattened Mount Longhu, they were intimately interdependent. Shenyuan also didn't have a good ending, so she had to bite the bullet and stand with the Taoist priests of Mount Longhu. If it really was the crown prince of Bailiang, what should she do? It was fine if she had to swallow this anger, but if that beggar turned into Crown Prince Su came to Mount Hui to denounce her, how would her family deal with it? Her father was cowardly and would definitely be too scared to argue. Because of her father's decline in power, the other branches wouldn't hit him when he was down. Her family originally wanted to marry her to Zhao Yi's 6 sons, but because of Song Kelly's arrival, there was a slight silence. Once her uncle Shenyuan smelled the opportunity, how could he show mercy? Who didn't know that this uncle had openly teased her mother, saying, "The dumplings are delicious, but not as delicious as sister-in-law?" Her father only knew how to study behind closed doors, so how could he say anything about it? Was there a lack of such jokes? Shenyuan Qingfeng walked out of the cabin in a daze when the boat docked. A lone boat shot over. An old Confucian scholar with white hair flew across the river and landed at the bow of the boat. The boat was filled with spiritual energy as it slowly approached the riverbank. Seeing the only old man in her family who cared about her, Shenyuan Qingfeng's eyes welled up with tears. The old man with an ancient sword at his waist said kindly, "Who dares to bully my granddaughter? Which family's brat is it? Grandpa will teach him a lesson for you." Shenyuan Qingfeng lowered his head and didn't say anything. The old man smiled and said, "It can't be the crown prince of Bailiang who went to Jianzhou, right? This is going to be troublesome." Shenyuan Qingfeng raised his head, his face full of shock. The old man who returned from the Dongyue sword pool was Xuanyuan's national weapon. Rumor had it that he could ride a sword for 100 feet and decapitate someone. His sword skills were outstanding in the southeast. Even the Dongyue sword pool, whose sword skills were second only to the Wu family's sword tomb, saw him as their number 1 threat. The old man said proudly, "So what if he's the crown prince of Bailiang? Can he bully my granddaughter? I'd like to see if that one-armed Li Chungang can still open the gates of heaven with his sword." Chapter 294. I'll update tomorrow. 3 guaranteed for guaranteed. They could already see the Xiaoyao temple by the Green Dragon stream. The big boat and the bamboo raft slowly docked together. Before getting off the raft, Huang Manor bent down and turned to look at Su Fengnian, indicating that he wanted to carry his brother. Su Fengnian smiled and shook his head. The old Taoist Zhao Shituan felt a little sad. The Zhongding family was cold-blooded. There were several brothers who loved each other so much. Thinking about it carefully, the Su family had few male descendants. The second son, Su Longxiang, was born mentally retarded. Of course, the 2 princesses were destined to be married off. In this way, the Bailiang palace would not leave any room for outsiders to interfere in the succession. Anyway, the eldest son, Su Fengnian, would be the heir. No matter how idle His Royal Highness was, there was no suspense. On the other hand, the Zhao family is the first Taoist master's residence in the South Kingdom. Although there is an ancestral rule that only Zhao can be a Taoist master, Qi Xuanzhen suppressed the Taoist master's residence 50 years ago. Now, in the Jing generation, there is Mr. White Lotus in immortality and Qi Shenxia in martial arts. They are all outsiders. No matter if it is fated chances or Taoist spells, the Zhao family can't compete with them at all. During these years they have been scheming against each other. If the Taoist master's residence didn't worry about the strength of the main branch, Zhao Danping wouldn't have become the ridiculous prime minister. Zhao Shituan sighed worriedly. A group of people walked along the bluestone path to the Xiaoyao temple. In the past, the old Taoist master lived alone in the Taoist temple, so there was no such path. After Su Longxiang went up the mountain, the old and the young had nothing to do, so they paved the path. Zhao Shituan hesitated for a moment and approached the old man wearing a sheepskin fur coat. He smiled and said in a low voice, "Old Li, how have you been?" The old god of swords snorted. Li Chungang had visited Longhu twice in his life, and both times he met Zhao Shituan, who was about the same age as him. As a result, he was pestered by Zhao Shituan. The first time it was Zhao Shituan who led him to the devil-slaying platform. Li Chungang did not have a bad impression of this guy, who was highly regarded by both the old Taoist master and Qi Xuanzhen. Everyone in the Taoist master's residence was as old-fashioned as clay statues, with neither immortal nor human aura. Li Chungang had already scolded them for being neither human nor ghost. He remembered that the first time he went down the mountain, this Taoist master's residence finally had an unrestrained young Taoist, who insisted on following him to Jianghu for several months. Zhao Shituan Taoist master said shamelessly, "Old Li, my kung fu is far worse than yours." Li Chungang thought of Jiang and I and his own difficulties in accepting a disciple. His Achilles heel was poked and he was furious. He pointed at Su Fengnian and glared at Zhao Shituan. "Look, my new disciple. Even if Su Longxiang becomes invincible in the future, do you think he can beat this old man's disciple?" Old Taoist Zhao was angry at first. Back then, when the Taoist nuns on the mountain heard that Li Chungang had come to the mountain, they all rushed to the devil-slaying platform like crazy, screaming as if they had seen an immortal descending to the mortal world. Zhao Shituan thought that when he was young he was also very handsome. Although Li Chungang's kung fu was a little higher than his, he was a little more handsome and he was a little more famous. This group of women who were supposed to be pure and devoted to the Yellow Court would not be so crazy. However, at that time, Li Chungang held his sword and came with an unparalleled momentum. Zhao Shituan was not convinced. Until today, it was not that old Taoist Zhao thought that he could beat old Li in a fight, but when it came to competing with disciples, Zhao Shituan was confident that no one dared to jump out and compete with him. But no matter how much he thought about it, he did not expect Elder Li to bring up His Highness the Crown Prince. The old Taoist was immediately discouraged. There was no way to compare. Even if Su Longxiang was really ruthless and dared to drag Wang Xinji down, how could he be unreasonable to His Highness the Crown Prince? Li Chungang was in a good mood when he saw that Zhao Shituan was defeated. He patted Zhao Shituan's shoulder and comforted him. Maybe Su Longxiang is the reincarnation of Zhenwu Great Emperor. Such a good thing hasn't happened for at least 700 or 800 years. You're lucky to have picked up such a good deal. Old Sword God changed the topic and said with a smile, "Now that you have a beautiful wife, you should be happy in your bed. If you dare to show off in front of this old man, Zhao Shituan, who had once roamed the Jianghu with the god of swords Li Chungang in the same era, immediately saw the wind and said flatteringly, "Brother Li, you're treating me like an outsider. We've been friends for decades." Li Chungang said bluntly, "Don't try to worm your way into being friends with this old man. We don't have any friendship." Zhao Shituan sighed with a melancholy expression. He was too embarrassed to stick his warm face to old Li's cold butt. He turned to look at the troops brought by His Royal Highness. Other than old Li and 100 light cavalry, as well as a few personal retainers who could be considered top-notch in martial arts, there was no other force to be used. Looking at the signs, they did not intend to stir up trouble in Mount Longhu. This was a good thing. Otherwise, he would be stuck in the middle of both sides and would be in a dilemma. While Zhao Shituan was muttering to himself, he caught a glimpse of the three women in curtain hats. Then he saw the maid in green and the beauty holding the cat behind His Highness the Crown Prince. They all had the style of immortal women. The old Taoist pondered over His Highness the Crown Prince's good fortune. In the southeast, only old man Shen Yuan, who enjoyed the good fortune of the land alone, and Prince Guangling Zhao Yi, who collected beauties from all over the world, could compare. Su Fengnian walked to the door of the Taoist temple and stopped. Zhao Shituan's expression was ugly. He admitted that he was in the wrong. It was not easy to trick Su Longxiang from Beiliang to Mount Longhu, but in the end he was cultivating in this dilapidated Taoist temple. He was really embarrassed. Just as he was thinking about how to explain to His Royal Highness, Su Fengnian, who had never treated the old Taoist master as an expert, slowly turned around and faced Zhao Shituan, bowing deeply. Zhao Shituan was flustered. He was pleasantly surprised but also fearful and restrained. He hurriedly helped him up and said, "I don't deserve such courtesy from your highness. It's too much." Chapter 295. The old god of swords looked on coldly from the sidelines. He was still a little surprised in his heart. Li Chungang, who had experienced many hardships, had long since figured out Su Fengnian's temperament. Now that he had bowed so openly and sincerely, it could be considered that he had given Zhao Shituan and Mount Longhu enough face. Otherwise, given Su Fengnian's stubborn personality, he would have fought to the death even if he had provoked some king of Jing and Zhao Heng, or some scholarly group of Gangnam-do. Yu Yue held Wu Meinyang between her breasts. The white cat was comfortably pretending to be asleep and half awake. Occasionally, it would use its furry head to rub its perky bosom. Princess Jing'an did not know Zhao Shituan's identity, but she guessed from the scene that this foolish youth was Su Fengnian's younger brother, the future prince of Bailiang. She could not imagine that the two brothers of the Marquis clan could get along so well. As for why the young prince was cultivating with a sloppy old Taoist in a shabby monastery at the foot of Mount Longhu, Pei Nanwei did not bother to make wild guesses. What shocked Zhao Shituan even more was the following scene. After His Royal Highness bowed with his hands clasped, the White Horse Cavalry, led by Ning Mei, gripped the hilts of their Bailiang sabers with their right hands and crossed their left arms before their chests. They took a step back in unison as a sign of respect. Everyone knew that the Bailiang cavalry were the best in the world, arrogant because of their proficiency in battle. During the Spring and Autumn War, when they traveled with Gu Jiantang and the other vassal armies, they always took the lead and no one dared to cut in. Throughout the Spring and Autumn War, only once did the Bailiang army give way to a scholar-led brigade that achieved great merit. Within the Northern Liang army, this tradition had always been passed down. Those who did not have great military exploits would have to give way to those who had great military exploits. Even if it was a military officer with a high military rank, he would have to give way to those who had great military exploits. For example, the scouts who accumulated their reputation by killing the barbarians' heads, even if they were just low-level armored soldiers in Bailiang's military towns, even if they ran into border officials at the level of county governor, they could still advance on the official road without getting off their horses or bending down. Zhao Shituan sighed inwardly. His Royal Highness had changed. It was a good thing for him, but it might not be a good thing for Mount Longhu, especially the Celestial Master residence. The old Taoist brought the group into the Taoist temple with mixed feelings. Su Fengnian, who was sitting beside the secluded ancient well with Su Longxiang, smiled and said, "Old Celestial Master, please help me arrange the Phoenix Battalion." Zhao Shituan nodded and said, "There's no need for your highness to say anything. Mount Longhu will naturally make the appropriate arrangements." Su Fengnian joked, "I heard that this Taoist ancestral temple Yuzhang Qinglin was imposing, and that the Yi sect was like the heavenly gate. Old Celestial Master, your temple is deserted to a whole new level." Zhao Shituan blushed with shame and smiled. "My social relations are poor. There's nothing I can do about it. I've made His Royal Highness laugh." Su Fengnian waved his hand and said, "In any case, Huang Man doesn't care about this. I see that he's quite happy here. It's not any worse than when he was in Bailiang Palace. Isn't that right, Huang Man?" Su Longxiang grinned foolishly. On this side they kept talking about His Highness, Bailiang, and the old Celestial Master. The authorities were calm and indifferent, accustomed to it. As a result, the Murong siblings who were outside the situation and were kept in the dark, were greatly frightened. Although Murong Tonghuang had long expected that Su Fengnian's identity was very special, no matter how he thought about it, he felt that being able to rank with Chu Lushan in the front line was already extremely shocking. For the remnants of the spring and autumn period, specifically in the provincial capital, the most unforgettable thing for the Bailiang army was undoubtedly the ghost city of Xiangfan, which had been completely massacred after the city was breached. There was also Jianzhou where the Western Lady sat. Longhu and Shenyuan faced each other from east to west. How could they forget the humiliation brought by the Bailiang's iron armor? Murong Wuzhu was in high spirits. She was overjoyed when she mistakenly thought that she had caught a thin straw in the wind and waves, only to discover that it was a towering tree. It was like she had accidentally fallen in love with a poor scholar, only to find out that the scholar was the heir of a wealthy family after eloping with him. Murong Tonghuang could not help but tremble. His face was flushed, and he stared at His Royal Highness with a complicated expression. Other than the master of the Wudong Palace, who in the world was the most feared figure in the world by Jiangdong and Shenyuan? It was Bailiang. Su Shao, the butcher of Jianghu. Bluebird and Yu Yue went to the Taoist temple to clean up the house. Pei Nanwei had to lower her head under the eaves. Most of the time she was no different from a maid. She had already accepted her fate. Ning Mei and the others were taken to the nearby Taoist temple by the old Taoist master Zhao Shituan. The old god of swords went to take a walk by the Green Dragon stream alone. In the end, only the brothers and siblings with different identities were left in the courtyard. Su Fengnian touched Huang Manner's head and glanced at Murong Tonghuang who was looking straight at him. Murong Wuzhu was peeping at His Royal Highness, but soon he lowered his head and looked at his feet. His Royal Highness said calmly, "You finally know my identity?" Murong Tonghuang bit his lips. Su Fengyin smiled and said, "Did you pee in your pants?" Murong Tonghuang was stunned. Su Fengyin smiled and said, "If Wen Hua was here he would definitely say that I peed in my pants." Murong Wuzhu did not feel disgusted when he heard such frivolous words. He just felt unbearably shy. His ears and neck were red, and he did not dare to look at his Royal Highness who had a prominent identity. Murong Tonghuang could still hold on and looked at Su Fengyin from beginning to end. Su Fengyin thought for a while and said with a naughty smile, "I do have a little grudge with the Xinyuan family, but don't think that you can just watch the flood leisurely. When the time comes, you will go to the Bull Gang to discuss the Xinyuan family. I'll have to trouble you and your brother to cooperate and act closer to me." Murong Wuzhu quietly raised his head and quickly lowered it. Murong Tonghuang asked straightforwardly, "Are you really the Prince of Bailiang? The eldest son of the King of Bailiang?" Su Fengyin nodded and said, "Otherwise, would I dare to use 100 light cavalry to slaughter 20 Xinyuan cavalry?" Murong Tonghuang smiled. Sure enough, he was more charming than a woman. He slowly walked toward his Royal Highness. Su Fengyin quickly raised his hand and said with a frown, "Don't do this, I can't stand it. How can I be looked at by a man? Fine, when we go to Mount Hui, your sister will be the only one to suffer. Let's make it clear in advance that I am taking advantage of you. There is no room for discussion. However, if you shamelessly snuggle up to me, I will always feel that you are taking advantage of me. Both of us will have goosebumps." Murong Wuzhu covered her mouth and let out a soft and light laugh. Murong Tonghuang was stunned and turned around. Murong Wuzhu and Murong Wuzhu were laughing and crying. Perhaps to an outsider, it was just a crying and laughing scene, but to the Murong siblings, it was 10 years of bitterness and sorrow. Su Fengyin said calmly, "Don't be in a hurry to be grateful. The reason why I helped you is because I feel that you are pitiful. Of course, if you feel that you can't repay me, you can also repay me with your body." Murong Wuzhu plucked up her courage and looked at him in a daze. Su Fengyin smiled, but soon he couldn't smile anymore. Murong Tonghuang, who had tears on his cheeks, turned his head and asked, "Can't I?" Su Fengyin had the intention to kill. He made a chopping gesture and said angrily, "Murong Tonghuang, if you dare to disgust me again, I will chop off that part of yours. When we go to Wudong Palace in the capital, I guarantee that you will be justified." Su Fengyin's heart skipped a beat as he recalled the prophetic ballad. Overturning a country? Could this guy really do something that millions of soldiers from the 8 countries couldn't do? Chapter 296. Chapter 1. Su Fengyin had just asked Murong Xiongju if she had been scared to the point of wetting herself. Soon he was frightened by his own thoughts. Those beauties with elegant clothes beside the emperor in the smoke of spring and autumn, no matter if they were the empress who had caused the emperor's relatives to rise to power or the concubines who had seduced the emperor, they were nothing more than scapegoats. The scholars who had lost their country and were loyal to the former emperor did not dare or did not know to get to the bottom of the matter. They could not see the root of the problem and could only use poems and articles to vent their anger on those beautiful women. They used the excuse that demons and monsters had come into being. In the eyes of discerning people, it was absurd and unreasonable. Murong Tonghuang was a beautiful young man who could not even defeat the Xinyuan family. How could he collapse a prosperous dynasty? Su Fengyin, who had come back to his senses, laughed at himself. The imperial harem had Zhao Ji as the mother of the country. This empress's iron fist was not inferior to that of a famous general. No matter what, there would not be chaos. In the capital, there was that emperor who was adept at controlling all factions and parties. Inside, there was the empress who was recognized as virtuous to take care of the inner chamber. Outside, there were civil and military officials and generals who looked at all directions. What a big iron bucket of country. The thin-skinned and shallow Murong Wuzhu was short of breath. She carefully sized up this young man whom she had only known for a dozen years. His Royal Highness in Bailiang? How high was his official position? Murong Wuzhu did not understand these things. She only occasionally heard some bad comments about Bailiang when she was socializing with the scholars of Jianzhou. They said that the king of Bailiang was a tyrannical executioner who had killed the most people in the dynasty. He used to like slaughtering cities. As for the eldest son, he was very foppish. He could not write or fight. He only knew how to bully good women in Bailiang. Sooner or later he would lose the family property and was not worth mentioning. No matter how simple Murong Wuzhu was, she knew that seeing was believing. First impressions were the strongest. She had a good impression of Su Fengyin who had saved her and her brother. Under the premise that he was in control of their lives, he could resist the temptation and did not bully them. This was 100 times better than those aristocratic scholars who were full of benevolence, righteousness, and morality but secretly had obscene eyes. She was so simple. In the past, she had accepted her fate to be captured and played by ancestor Shen Yuan. Now, she accepted her fate to warm the bed for His Royal Highness one day. Murong Wuju looked at the handsome face. Even if she took 1,000 steps back, he was very good-looking when he was young, wasn't he? Among the siblings, Murong Tonghuang, who was the one who made the decision since childhood, saw the look in his sister's eyes and felt helpless. Su Fengyin was extremely disgusted with the scholarly men's penchant for cutting off their sleeves. Of course, he kept a respectful distance from Murong Tonghuang. However, he quite liked this guy's unscrupulous ruthlessness in order to achieve his goal. He was truly ruthless if he dared to be ruthless to himself. If a man could endure the disgust and throw flirtatious glances at another man, he would be unlucky to be born in a small family. If he was given a bigger stage, he would be good at dancing. Since Murong Tonghuang's words and actions were straightforward, Su Fengyin couldn't disappoint him. He gently kicked away the tiger Kuei King Kong who was biting his robe and said with a smile, "If you want to use Beiliang's tiger skin as a banner to intimidate others, you don't need to hide it. Since I've eaten my fill and have nothing better to do, I won't be so shameless. However, I'll say the ugly words first. At least we're in the same camp now. Don't stab me in the back and think about giving Mount Hui a proof of your allegiance. We can't let you and your sister take all the good things." Murong Tonghuang nodded and said gloomily, "After we stepped out of the family, we didn't think about going to the Xinyuan family to live an ignoble existence. However, since His Royal Highness said so, I also hope that Your Highness won't use us to win over Mount Hui. So." Su Fengyin waved his hand and shook his head. "Then you're underestimating me, Su Fengyin." Murong Wuju whispered softly, "Su Fengyin?" Su Fengyin said with a smile, "Isn't the name nice? A phoenix won't perch unless it's a parasol tree. You two are quite fated, right? My courtyard in Beiliang Palace is called Parasol Garden. If you have the chance, you can go there and play. Don't worry, I really don't have any thoughts about you two. I also feel that it's a waste of saliva to keep talking about this. In the future, don't be on guard against this. Do you see the big sister holding the white cat? I like her. If we're talking about her face and smooth skin, then Big Sister Pei or Aunt Pei, who wears the veil hat with you two, is definitely more outstanding than you two. You two are guarding against me like you're guarding against a thief. It's very hurtful." Murong Wuju giggled. As a result, she was glared at by Murong Tonghuang, but this time she didn't shrink back for the first time. Su Fengyin looked at Murong Tonghuang and said helplessly, "You can't protect your sister for the rest of her life. She has to get married and take care of the family alone. When that time comes, don't tell me that you're still following behind your sister. Aren't you afraid that your future brother-in-law will dislike you for being an eyesore?" Murong Tonghuang coldly snorted and said, "That'll have to wait until she finds that kind of man. Once she finds that kind of man, it's fine even if she wants me to die." Chapter 297. Su Fengyin was speechless. He could only turn around and smile at Huang Manor. In the next few days, His Royal Highness unexpectedly did not go to the Taoist Master Mansion, nor did he go to the Mount Huinyo Gang. He stayed at Xiaoyao Temple obediently. He would either ask the old god of swords about the flaws in his life-saving saber techniques or ask the old Taoist master about the essence of the talismans in Mount Longhu. Especially the latter, he rarely met a junior at the foot of the mountain who was willing to let His Royal Highness enjoy being his master. He told him everything he knew. During this period, he especially went to the library at the top of the mountain and brought down many Taoist cloud talisman secret scriptures. The old and the young talked until dawn. Probably because he was afraid that His Royal Highness would say that he did not know anything, Zhao Shituan even picked up a few talisman incantations that were feared by ordinary Taoists. While he was cramming, he explained the mysteries to His Royal Highness. It should be known that Zhao Shituan was very talented when he was young. Unfortunately, he had the same problem as the Shenyuan Great Plate. In every field, he did not ask for in-depth knowledge. After being provoked by His Royal Highness, he gritted his teeth and even piled the extremely obscure book of Taishang Jingyi Dongxian Law collection on the table. On this day, Su Fengyin finally stopped strolling around at the foot of the mountain. He pulled Huang Man'er called Murong Wuju and Murong Tonghuang to go to the back of the mountain behind a Taoist temple. Only Qing Niao followed them, holding a bamboo basket. Murong Wuju was probably careless that day, but after confiding in His Highness, who was wearing a tiger skin, she was much more at ease than her younger brother. She softly asked, "Your Highness, what are you doing?" Huang Man'er said honestly, Picking hawthorns. Su Fengyin nodded and smiled. When the old Taoist master went to Bailiang to take my brother as a closed-door disciple, he talked for a long time but did not get to the point. Only hawthorns are more pleasing to Huang Manor. Murong Wuzhu felt that this was unimaginable. Su Fengyin picked a hillside and sat down. Huang Manor came and went like the wind. One handful of hawthorn after another, he quickly filled up the small bamboo basket. Blue Bird simply placed the bamboo basket on the ground. Murong Wuzhu was still at a lively age, so she went to pick the hawthorn with Blue Bird. Su Fengyin and Murong Tonghuang were sitting at a distance from each other, while the two tiger kuei were rolling all over the mountain. A cool breeze brushed past his face. Su Fengyin closed his eyes and concentrated. He stroked the overlapping spring thunder embroidered winter and let his imagination run wild. The stones of other mountains could be used to improve jade. Even with the help of the 9 bushels of rice Wei Shuyang, it was still difficult to study the cloud pattern of the Fujiang red armor. However, after the guidance of the old Taoist master Zhao Shituan, many of the obstacles were easily killed by the sloppy old Taoist who knew the secrets of heaven. This made him suddenly enlightened. The only pity was that he lacked a Buddhist monk who knew the secret. Otherwise, Su Fengyin was confident that he could completely turn the Fujiang red armor into something in his pocket. Murong Tonghuang asked softly, "I heard that your Royal Highness killed many scholars in Gangnam-do." Su Fengyin said calmly, "Compared to Su Xiao, it's still much less." Murong Tonghuang frowned, "Why do you want to go against scholars? Don't you know that public opinion can confuse gold and make you and your father go down in history and infamy?" Su Fengyin wiped the spring thunder with his slender fingers and said slowly, "The winner takes all. Think about it, the history books of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn were all written by the historians of the Liang dynasty. For those who wanted their ancestors to be known as loyal ministers, even if they only left a dozen words for their descendants, they would not hesitate to become officials in the new imperial court. For those who wanted their fathers not to be known as traitorous ministers, they would even rush to the capital and rack their brains to please the Hanlin emperor. They would cry and shout, wishing that they could present their wives and concubines with both hands. Isn't there a ridiculous story of someone who asked his wife to take off her clothes to warm his hands with her breasts?" Murong Tonghuang said seriously, "Your Royal Highness, you can't generalize." Su Fengyin opened his eyes and said calmly, "I understand this. It's not that Su Xiao didn't admire scholars from the bottom of his heart, but it seems that not many of them had a good ending. Sun Ping of Hezhou, who submitted the 21 treatises on governance, was cooked by the people. Zhao Guangling vomited blood and died in the military tent outside the West Shu imperial city. Li Yishan, who used to be a judge of civil and military affairs, was killed by some literary giants who were also scholars. He was implicated and finally escaped to Su Zhao's side to survive. Of course, you can continue to say that this is a generalization. However, as a member of the Northern Liang Mansion, I have seen the graceful bearing of many famous people. Indeed, they can write beautiful poems. Regardless of whether it is killing with words or singing praises, they are all top-notch. Fame and fortune, fame and fortune. Do you know why the name comes before the word fortune? Saint Zhang of the North once said that there were 3 immortals. The first was to establish virtue, the second was to establish one's words, and the third was to establish merit. This was the answer and also the basis of why scholars look down on martial artists. How many scholars went to establish virtue? Studying back and forth, the most they did was to establish their words. Establishing one's words, accumulating one's character, earning fame, bringing honor to one's ancestors, leaving one's name in the annals of history, how could they care about the people's hunger and hunger? Su Fengyin said softly, "When I was in Gangnam-do Baogua Temple, I heard the famous scholars of Jiangnan talk about righteousness and profit. In the end, it was just a poor scholar who originally didn't have the qualifications to enter the banquet who sought profit for the people. What kind of scholars do you think those famous scholars are? They only know how to recite the wind, the flower, the snow and the moon, talk about profound mysteries, and if the whole world applauds, is it really good? Reading 10,000 books, there's no book that you don't read, no scriptures that you don't understand. Don't you know that there is a frozen bone outside the Vermilion Gate? Is that a scholar's scholar?" Su Fengyin laughed and said, "You might not believe it, but after Xiang Fan Confucian Wang Yangming committed suicide, he was originally at the top of the list of traitorous officials. It was Su Xiao who had a quarrel with the old Grand Secretary, rolled up his sleeves and personally cut it off. And the history books of West Chu did not leave half a word about this scholar who once sat alone on the fishing platform for West Chu for 10 whole years. This time, it was the old leader of the imperial court, Westchu's old Grand Preceptor's son Shiji who personally erased it. Murong Tonghuang was still persisting, but he was no longer as confident as he was at the beginning. Lowering his head, he said, "Scholars are still mostly good people." Su Fengyin said self-deprecatingly, "I didn't say that I have to make life difficult for scholars. Besides, there are a lot of people and things that have no right or wrong to speak of. If we get into a dead end and insist on either one or the other, then there's no reason to speak of." Murong Tonghuang grunted. Su Fengyin propped his chin on his hand and looked toward the bull, De Gang. He muttered to himself, "That kid Wenhua is still open-minded. I wonder where he is right now." Murong Tonghuang was in a daze, lost in thought. Su Fengyin turned his head and stretched out 2 fingers. Imitating the Taoist priests of the charm and spell sect who subdued demons and exorcised devils, he pointed at Murong Tonghuang. Laughing heartily, he joked, "Urgent as the law commands, you evil creature who brings disaster to the country and the people, why haven't you shown yourself yet?" Chapter 298. Chapter 2. Murong Tonghuang hesitated for a moment and hammered His Royal Highness's chest with all his might. At this moment he no longer pretended to be seductive and charming, nor was he gloomy. Instead he exuded an unfamiliar aura of awe-inspiring heroism. Su Fengyin lay on the slope and said with a smile, "Qinyu, who is ranked second in the Rouge ranking, is said to not lose to Nangong. Do you know that?" Murong Tonghuang nodded, but he was confused as to why Meng Qi mentioned Qinyu and Nangong. Su Fengyin said with a smile, "That Nangong is the same as you. He is a man with a white fox face. He is even more good-looking than you. Now he is reading secret manuals in the tide-listening pavilion of Bailiang Palace. When he comes out of the pavilion he might be the number 1 in the world. These 2 sabers of mine, Spring Thunder and Embroidered Winter, were originally his. Later I gave one to him and borrowed the other." Murong Tonghuang laughed and said, "If you continue to explain, be careful that you don't say that you are trying to hide 300 taels of silver." Su Fengyin felt relieved. There were thousands of knots in his heart. If he could help this pair of siblings untie one by one, he would deal with the mess of the Shenyuan family. As for Murong Tonghuang's life, he only needed to lay down some foreshadowing. After that, he would no longer pay attention to him. He really needed to learn from that old monster Huang Sanja to play chess. Regardless of whether he was drawing a tiger or a dog, he needed to learn first. Su Fengyin suddenly thought of the celestial being from Mount Longhu, Zhao Huangqiao, who came by dragon in his dream. This Zhao was not the Zhao from the Zhao family of the Taoist master mansion. Su Fengyin still had not figured out whether it was a dream or reality. If it was the truth, why didn't Miss He, who was climbing the cliff all night long, respond? Even the old god of swords, Li Chungang, did not notice it. However, if he were to treat it as a dream, then everything the white python told the black dragon and the middle-aged Taoist priest, Zhao Huangqiao, said was reasonable and well-founded, especially the bearded heavenly dragon that rose from the cliff. It was almost exactly the same as the one in the evil Spring Thunder Flood Dragon painting. This painting of the Heavenly King and the Heavenly Maiden came from the hands of a great Qi practitioner and was supplemented by an ominous prophecy. Su Fengyin frowned. For the time being, he did not dare to mention this strange matter to anyone. Perhaps he would only be able to mention it to Su Xiao and Li Yishan once he returned to Bailiang. His Royal Highness didn't know that not long ago, someone had coincidentally arrived at Mount Insignia. Shenyuan Qingfeng and his grandfather, Shenyuan Guiqi, were standing on the Wangjiang terrace of the Aspiring Cauldron Pavilion. The 2 of them were leaning against the railing. The Aspiring Cauldron Pavilion was built against the cliff, while the Wangjiang terrace was abrupt. The mountain wind was blowing and it was very cold at the top. Shenyuan Qingfeng pulled the collar of his fur coat. The old man with white hair on his temples smiled and said, "Are you cold? You mischievous girl. You're just like your father. Both of you are unwilling to work hard on the path of martial arts. Practicing martial arts doesn't necessarily mean you have to fight and kill. Strengthening your body is fundamental." Shenyuan Qingfeng's cheeks were flushed from the strong wind from the river to the wall of Bull Mound. He shrunk his neck and said coquettishly, "It's not too late to learn now." Shenyuan Guiqi, who had an ancient sword hanging from his waist, smiled but didn't say anything. The old man was the only son of Shenyuan of Mount Insignia's generation. After his ancestor, Shenyuan Great Plate, suffered defeat after defeat, he went into seclusion to cultivate. It was Shenyuan Guiqi who single-handedly supported him. When he was young he was a nobody. He missed the opportunity to fight Li Chungang, the god of swords, who was known as the invincible god of swords. It was only in the recent 20 years that he rose to fame. His first battle after leaving the mountain was the toughest Wu family sword tomb as a whetstone, forcing the Wu family Su of Gojoseon to unsheath his sword. Although Xinyuan Guichi was defeated, it was still a glorious defeat. He was praised by the martial arts world as a late bloomer. All the friends he had made over the years were old. Not long ago he went to the Dongyue sword pool and defeated 6 sword puppets with 1 strike. His reputation was right behind Dong Tai's. Xinyuan Guichi said softly, "I heard that Li Chungang is by the side of the crown prince of Bailiang." The old man flicked the scabbard with his finger, and the ancient sword in the scabbard hummed, even louder than the whistling of the mountain wind. However, Xinyuan Qingfeng did not react at all. The old man sneered and said, "Li Chungang used to be a sword immortal. When did he become a lackey of the Bailiang? How disappointing. I wanted to find this sword Dao Senior to spar with him after I returned from the sword pool. Although it's convenient now, I don't know if Li Chungang is worthy of unsheathing the plain sword." Xinyuan Qingfeng smiled and said, "A starving camel is still bigger than a horse. Isn't that old man the 8th? Xinyuan Guichi smiled indifferently and said, "Girl, don't try to goad me. Do you know that once one sword Dao realm regresses, the difficulty of advancing again, especially for an expert at Li Chuangang's realm, is comparable to ascension? As long as he's not a first-stage sword immortal, your grandfather can fight him. If this 8th rank is real gold and silver, then that's fine. But if it's only because of Li Chuangang's unparalleled heroic figure that they gave him a title, then I might as well expose this fig leaf. The former sword god without the wooden horse and 1 arm being defeated by the plain embracing sword is better than being used as a stepping stone by those young people." Xinyuan Qingfeng was about to say something when the old man waved his hand and said, "Girl, go first. Don't catch a cold from the wind. That bookish father of yours is going to nag me for a month or so." Xinyuan Qingfeng left the aspiring cauldron pavilion with a gloomy expression. How could one survive in the Xinyuan clan where martial arts fanatics gathered? Xinyuan Qingfeng walked in the pavilion. There were bookshelves on both sides, and her slender hands slowly touched the secret manuals arranged according to the pronunciation of the first word. Her eyes were dull. The ancient books that her fingers touched were all martial arts secret manuals that Jiang Hu dreamed of. She had read most of them and memorized them in her mind. Because she knew that once she got married, she would no longer be allowed to enter the aspiring cauldron pavilion, even if it was to find a son-in-law. Therefore, she had been painstakingly memorizing the contents of the secret manuals all these years, page after page, book after book, hoping that she could find a man she could rely on in the future to revitalize the first wife's branch whose spirit had been sapped by her scholarly father and restore the glory of a great sect. After walking out of the aspiring cauldron pavilion, Xinyuan Qingfeng's face was filled with determination. An old woman who had taken care of Xinyuan Qingfeng since she was young hurriedly ran over and whispered, "Miss Yuan Tingshan is back. There are signs of him being seriously injured and dying." Xinyuan Qingfeng calmly asked, "Can he be saved?" The old woman shook her head and said, "Using normal methods, he'll definitely die." Xinyuan Qingfeng stood there in a daze, as if her soul had left her body. The old woman said sympathetically, "Miss, if Yuan Tingshan dies, then so be it. Just find another young man and nurture him with all your heart." Xinyuan Qingfeng's lips turned pale as she murmured, "There's no chance for that." She suddenly turned around and walked past countless bookshelves in the pavilion to the Riverview Terrace. With a plop, she knelt down behind Xinyuan Guichi. The old man, who had mastered qi cultivation, remained silent and didn't ask anything. Xinyuan Qingfeng put her hands and knees on the bone-chilling green jade floor and said in a low voice, "Grandpa, please save Yuan Tingshan's life." Xinyuan Guichi said something that others couldn't understand. If you want to have the ability to humiliate others, you must first have the ability to humiliate yourself. Xinyuan Qingfeng's body began to tremble more and more violently. In the end, she lay on the ground, feeling as if a knife was twisting in her heart. She sobbed and said, "Grandpa, why did the great ancestor choose me for dual cultivation? Why? As long as Grandpa can save Yuan Tingshan, as long as Yuan Tingshan can withstand 10 strikes from the great ancestor, Qingfeng won't have to be a bull anymore." Xinyuan Guichi shook his head. A middle-aged Confucian scholar who resembled Xinyuan Guichi walked into the Riverview Terrace while coughing. His hair was tied up in a bun, and he held the forbidden thunder mantra of virtue in one hand and covered his mouth with the other. After releasing his hand, he put his hand behind his back, leaving behind a pool of blood. Xinyuan Guichi was slightly angry. "Jingqing, since you're not well, don't walk around." Xinyuan Jingqing said bitterly, "Life and death are predestined. Just accept your fate." Xinyuan Guiqi, who had his back to the father and daughter, waved his sleeve. Clearly he was quite angry. Xinyuan Jingqing took the Taoist book from his bloody hand and held it tightly. He bent down, freeing his hand to support his daughter. Xinyuan Qingfeng's limbs were already weak, but at this moment, a surge of strength surged up and she threw her father's hand away. She cried and cursed, "You don't deserve it." The eldest grandson of the Xinyuan family, Xinyuan Jingqing, had a bitter expression on his face. He said softly, "Let's go. Your mother has warmed a pot of Angelica wine for you to warm your stomach." Xinyuan Qingfeng stood up shakily and staggered out of the Wangjiang terrace, leaving Xinyuan Jingqing with a resolute and desolate back view. Xinyuan Guiqi was angry at his son's lack of struggle and lamented his misfortune. He raised his voice and reprimanded, "Look at you. Back then, in order to marry a loose woman who could be anyone's wife, you disgraced the family. What have you been doing all these years?" Xinyuan Jingqing said calmly, "Reading. Reading the spring and autumn annals of righteousness. Reading Taoism without action. Reading Buddhism with compassion." Xinyuan Jingqing said word by word, neither warm nor angry. His tone was extremely slow. Indeed, if it wasn't for his gentle temperament, how could he have endured 20 years of supercilious suppression? The other two branches were already riding on top of his head to shit and piss, but this scholar never uttered a word, only reading his book. Jingqing wants to let the ancestor know that his so-called understanding of the three religions is bullsh*t. Xinyuan Jingqing walked to the railing and stood side by side with Xinyuan Guiqi. Xinyuan Guiqi was so angry that his eyebrows were twitching. He wanted to slap this good-for-nothing son of his to death. Xinyuan Jingqing smiled. He held the forbidden thunder spell of virtue tightly. Blood seeped into the pages. He said, "Since I can't become an immortal Jinren, shut up. You disgraceful thing." Xinyuan Guiqi slapped his son's face and walked away. Obviously, if this middle-aged scholar was allowed to continue, his words would only shock people to death. Xinyuan Jingqing, who was slapped, was indifferent. He looked at Longhu. Logically speaking, with the strength of Xinyuan Guiqi's hand, even if he restrained it, the slap on Xinyuan Jingqing's face would not disappear in a flash. When there was no one left in the Wending pavilion, he threw out the forbidden thunder spell of virtue and leaped over the railing. He flew out of the bull mound and went straight to the surface of the Dragon King River. When he fell in midair, he stepped on the book with the tip of his foot and swept across the sky like an eagle or a falcon. The world's Jinren was so close that they could not recognize him. Xinyuan Jingqing floated across the Dragon King River. The first time his foot landed on the shore, it created a big pit. The second step was slightly smaller and the third step was even smaller. He took 7 consecutive steps, each step stepping on the pit like a blooming lotus. A lotus appeared with each step. After 7 steps, the ground was already covered in dust. Chapter 299. Chapter 3. His Royal Highness's talk about fame and fortune is quite insightful. If a scholar fishes for fame and compliments, it may seem easy, but in fact, it's no different from a merchant. A famous scholar's mysterious talk harms the country. This scholar is not a scholar. Holding the scriptures at home, laughing at the frozen bones outside the door. This kind of reading is indeed not reading. It's just reading the impolite, heartless and unrighteous heavenly book. Mount Hui Xinyuan Jingqing, on behalf of Zhang Xuanping, who is both a teacher and a friend, pays his respects to His Royal Highness. Xinyuan Jingqing, on behalf of Wang Yangming, a scholar from Xiangfan, pays his respects to the King of Bailiang. Finally, Xinyuan Jingqing pays his respects to the King of Bailiang on behalf of all the poor scholars in the world. Su Fengyin widened his eyes and looked at the scholar in green who was walking towards him. He didn't know that this guy was eavesdropping just now, and he couldn't detect the flow of his qi at all. When they were 30 steps away, the man who called himself Xinyuan Jingqing bowed 3 times in a row. After straightening his back, he stopped moving forward. Murong Wuju, who was squatting beside His Royal Highness and picking hawthorns, dropped her hawthorns on the ground when she heard the 2 words Xianyuan. Murong Tonghuang was a little calm, but his knuckles were blue, revealing the panic in his heart. For the siblings, the Xianyuan clansmen on the Bull Mound were not the Jianghu individual immortals who enjoyed the good fortune of the land alone, but the devil who played Jianzhou in the palm of his hand. However, Murong Tonghuang still fiercely pulled away his sister who was trying to grab Su Fengyin's sleeve. He almost helped her stand up and walked away. It seemed that he didn't want to be implicated, but Su Fengyin and Murong Tonghuang's lips almost curled up at the same time after they separated. Obviously they had a tacit understanding. Since someone from the Xinyuan family had taken the initiative to attack instead of defending, even knowing Su Fengnian's identity, Su Fengnian didn't dare to slack off in the slightest, even if it was the infamous Xinyuan Jingqing. This person had respectfully bowed 3 times, so there must be something fishy going on. After Su Fengnian stood up, he caught a glimpse of Huang Man-er and Qing Yao approaching. They were both in a horn-like position. He smiled and asked, "Mr.'s 3 bows are enough to shock the heavens and make ghosts weep. I just don't know if Mr. dares to do such a thing on the bull mound?" Xinyuan Jingqing said calmly, "If you say I don't dare, His Royal Highness doesn't seem to believe it. If I say I don't dare, His Royal Highness will draw his knife on the spot." Su Fengnian stared at the eldest grandson of the Xinyuan family who had become the laughingstock of the Xinyuan family. He didn't want to be deliberately mystified anymore, so he said impatiently, "Say it, why are you looking for me? If it weren't for your friendship with Mr. Sun, why would I talk nonsense with you?" Xinyuan Jingqing went straight to the point and said calmly, "Your Highness, do you know why my daughter, Xinyuan Qingfeng, made things difficult for you in Wuzhou?" Su Fengnian clenched the spring thunder in his left hand. He wanted to kill with one blow with the knife in his left hand. "You didn't go to Mount Hui to look for trouble with the Xinyuan family, but dared to come down the mountain to provoke me? When did the Xinyuan family have a scholar who worried about the country and the people?" Su Fengnian exhaled softly, the qi in his body surging like a river. He smiled and said, "Sir, please speak." Xinyuan Jingqing said calmly, "You look very much like someone. You look like 4 or 5 years old, but your spirit is very similar." Su Fengnian's spring thunder exploded and arrived in front of Xinyuan Jingqing in an instant. It was born out of Spear Fairy Wang Xiu's famous skill, Overlord Armor Removal. The spring thunder struck down, entering Xinyuan Jingqing's neck and coming out from his waist. With one successful strike, it was about to cut him in half. Xinyuan Jingqing frowned. His left foot didn't move, but the tip of his right foot spun, drawing a semicircle on the ground. His left hand held the book behind his back, and his right hand reached out with 2 pale fingers to pinch the spring thunder, following the momentum of Su Fengnian's knife to remove the force. The middle-aged scholar made a sound of surprise and was slightly surprised. The scholar's cuff holding the knife fluttered even though there was no wind. Su Fengnian turned the blade and Xinyuan Jingqing let go of his hand and stepped back. The tips of his feet crisscrossed, and his figure was indescribably light and graceful. He continued, "And this person is the man that Qingfeng's mother couldn't let go of. If this man didn't die of illness, she definitely wouldn't have married into Mount Hui. Qingfeng's calligraphy and painting were all learned from her mother. There is a portrait that has been hanging for 20 years. When Qingfeng saw you in the lantern market, it was inevitable that she would lose her composure. I hope your Highness will be magnanimous enough to forgive her." Su Fengnian took large strides forward, and the spring thunder pierced straight at the whale. Xinyuan Jingqing held the book in his left hand and struck the spring thunder, swatting it away. Su Fengnian's right hand was about to unsheathe the embroidered winter sword when Xinyuan Jingqing, who had endured it time and time again, snorted coldly. His figure suddenly moved forward, and he pressed one hand on Su Fengnian's shoulder. With a gentle push, Su Fengnian was forced to turn his body, but he still took the opportunity to pull out the embroidered winter sword. It was the posture of pulling up a mountain. Xinyuan Jingqing sneered. "You don't know when to stop. How rude and unreasonable His Royal Highness is." Su Fengnian inexplicably sheathed his sword, and the spring thunder and embroidered winter sword returned to their sheaths. It was because of Huang Man-er. He smiled and said, "Last time when I went to the tomb outside Zhejiang City, I saw a few wine cups. Were they all yours, sir?" Xinyuan Jingqing nodded dejectedly and asked, "Why did you sheathe your sword at the last moment?" Su Fengnian pointed at Huang Man-er who was squatting in the distance and smiled. "My little brother knows if others have any ill intentions." Xinyuan Jingqing said with mixed feelings, "He was born in the Vajra realm." Su Fengnian was puzzled. "Pardon me for asking, but you are obviously a martial arts expert. How did you end up in such a state at Bulgang?" Xinyuan Jingqing calmly revealed the earth-shattering truth. Qingfeng's mother and Xinyuan Great Pan were dual cultivating to take revenge on me. Now this old ancestor wants Qingfeng to enter Bulgang again. Xinyuan Jingqing's voice was steady. He did not deliberately lower his voice to cover his ugliness. Murong Tonghuang and Murong Wuzhu looked at each other. Even the thick-skinned Su Fengnian was stunned. He was shocked beyond words. How could there be such a shameless old man who liked to take advantage of the grass around his nest? That was the daughter-in-law of his eldest grandson. In the end, he did not even let go of his great-granddaughter? You would rather kill the wrong person than let go of the wrong person? Compared to this sensational inside story, trying to kidnap the Murong Shuangbi was not worth mentioning. Shenyuan Jingqing said bitterly, this old ancestor did not indulge in beauty. It was because he wanted to achieve the immortal Jinren realm that he took an unorthodox path. Su Fengyin scolded, Bullsh *T. Whether it is the Dao sex bedroom technique or the esoteric sex dual cultivation, Shenyuan Jingqing, are you still a man? Shenyuan Jingqing said indifferently, I have learned all the secret exercises of Mount Hui's Wending Pavilion in 20 years. I have taken a fork in the road with no return. I'm not afraid of death. I only ask for the safety of the mother and daughter. Shenyuan Jingqing said slowly. He coughed a few times and covered his mouth. The blood stains were scarlet. It was a ghastly sight. Su Fengyin could not keep up with the thoughts of this sickly scholar. He asked, can you fight with Shenyuan Great Plate to the death? I heard that this old monster's strength is very strong. The Taoist classics in Shenyuan Jingqing's hands were already stained red. He put them behind his back. He smiled at Su Fengyin and said, I can. He wants to achieve immortality. I will let him experience it. However, the immortal Jinren realm that I have achieved is not really immortality. Therefore the outcome is 50-50. However, after I die, what will happen to the mother and daughter? I have been thinking about this problem. That is why I have been waiting for His Royal Highness. Today I came to see Your Highness. Your first blade was excellent. Not to mention that your bladesmanship is accomplished, your blade is even more ruthless. Shenyuan Jingqing sincerely asks for Your Highness' help. In this world, only Your Highness can save the mother and daughter. Su Fengyin was shocked again. Shenyuan Jingqing continued, once Shenyuan Great Plate dies, only my father Shenyuan Guiqi and my younger brother Shenyuan Jingxian will be troublesome in Mount Hui. If these two die, as long as Your Highness can protect Qingfeng's life, you can use her as a puppet to control the bull gang. Su Fengyin asked, is this a trap set by the Shenyuan family? Shenyuan Jingqing shook his head and said, no. Su Fengyin was helpless. He shook his head and said, if it is as you said, it is not difficult for me to do it. However, you must help to get rid of either Shenyuan Guiqi or Shenyuan Jingxian. Otherwise it will be too difficult for a helpless Shenyuan Qingfeng to swallow an elephant. Shenyuan Jingqing said without hesitation, all right. I will go up the mountain and kill Shenyuan Jingxian first. Su Fengyin was speechless. Was this man completely crazy? Shenyuan Jingqing looked at the navy blue bull gang and murmured, I am here. This mountain man went up the mountain to kill people. Chapter 300. This bull hill that confronted the mansion of Taoist Master was really a mixed group of good and bad people. Enjoying the good fortune of the land alone? Su Fengyin sat back on the hillside and wrote a few names on the ground with the spring thunder. He asked Murong Tonghuang, how much do you think Shenyuan Jingqing's words can be trusted? Murong Tonghuang sneered, even if Shenyuan Jingqing really endured the humiliation for 20 years, it's hard to guarantee that this lunatic won't attack His Highness. Killing Shenyuan Dandan and Shenyuan Jingxian, this person will definitely die. But Shenyuan, the Grandmaster of Swordsmanship, has been guarding Mount Hui for hundreds of years. How can His Highness's 100 cavalrymen easily suppress him? It's better to let two tigers fight than to lure the tiger away. I don't believe that Shenyuan Jingqing, as the legitimate son of Shenyuan sect, didn't have a few unknown schemes in the past 20 years. Once His Highness dies in the Bull Hill, Bailiang will only vent his anger on Mount Hui. The mother and daughter took advantage of the chaos to enter Jianghu. They are really free birds flying in the sky. If Shenyuan Jingqing is really sincere, kowtowing to His Highness 3 times and exposing his own scandal is nothing. Su Fengyin nodded, it's probably true that Shenyuan Jingqing wants to turn against his family. Su Fengyin sighed, 20 years to achieve immortality through unorthodox methods and overturn hundreds of years of foundation with his own strength. Why does it sound so chilling? Murong Tonghuang had a pair of silkworm eyebrows, but he usually looked more charming than heroic. At this time he raised his eyebrows and smiled even more gloatingly, the Shenyuan family should have fallen apart and died long ago. Su Fengyin took the hawthorn from Huang Man, and sat cross-legged. He put the hawthorn in his robe and threw one into his mouth. He waved to Murong Tonghuang and said, don't be in a hurry to say angry words. The onlooker sees the situation clearly. You're half an outsider. We're not in a hurry to go up the mountain. You can talk about it casually and see if you can find some clues. No matter how inexplicable it is, in the end there are only 2 paths, go up the mountain or not. Murong Tonghuang nodded and said, going up the mountain Your Highness has to take a lot of risks. I'm afraid this is also the original intention of Shenyuan Jingqing to endure until now. He may not be willing to fall out with his family until he has a chance to rely on a strong external force. Otherwise, with Mount Hui's family background, only a land immortal like Qi Xuanzhen can come and go like walking on flat ground. Shenyuan Jingqing is obviously not so strong. When the snipe and the clam fight, the mother and daughter will reap the benefits. In fact, it's better if your highness doesn't go up the mountain. Or rather, you can go up the mountain slowly and let Shenyuan Jingqing fight with all his strength. I believe that by that time, Hui Mountain's vitality will be greatly damaged. However, if you want to fish in troubled waters at this time, it's far better to take the risk and go up the mountain to hold the line for Shenyuan Jingqing. Su Fengyan always couldn't finish the hawthorn because he almost finished one. Huang Man had already carefully wiped a handful with his sleeve. Su Fengyan wiped the carelessly written words on the ground with spring lightning and threw some hawthorns to the siblings. He said with a smile, "Go up the mountain, we have to go up the mountain early." Murong Tong Huang frowned and said, "Why?" Su Fengyan stood up and looked at Bull Gang and said softly, "To watch a fight." Murong Tong Huang asked carefully and tentatively, "Your Highness is addicted to martial arts?" Su Fengyan said self-mockingly, "I'm just greedy for life and afraid of death. Of course, there are also the thoughts of chivalrous heroes who want to save beauty since childhood." Murong Tong Huang turned his head and couldn't help laughing. The words chivalrous heroes could be said by anyone, but it was said by the eldest son of Rin too, who made the whole Jianghu tremble under the sound of horse hooves. It was ridiculous. Su Fengyan said with a smile, "Laugh if you want." Although Murong Tong Huang had let down some of his guard, he didn't have the guts to be presumptuous in front of his royal highness. Of course he didn't dare to make fun of him. Su Fengyan patted Huang Manor's head and said, "Let's go to Mount Hui. Tear apart whoever blocks the way." Huang Manor's originally turbid eyes instantly blossomed with light. Su Fengyan turned to Bluebird and said, "Go to Xiaoyao Temple and tell the old god of swords and the Phoenix Battalion. You'd better bring the instant spear. We'll meet at Qinglong Creek. This time we'll play big. By the way, I'll remind the old celestial master Zhao Shituan that Mount Longhu better not get involved. You can explain to the old celestial master that Shenyuan Jingqing invited us to go up the mountain. Let him know that this is a family matter of Mount Hui and not me trying to make trouble for the Shenyuan family." Bluebird held the bamboo basket and nodded, "Got it." On top of the mud wall of Xiaoyao Temple, old Taoist Zhao stretched his neck and looked at the middle-aged Confucian scholar who was walking on the river. Li Chungang sneered, "This old man really doesn't understand the ways of the world." Back then, heavenly phenomenon aside, a Finger Shen realm cultivator could rank among the top 10 in the world. Now, Finger Shen realm cultivators are as worthless as roadside cabbages. Are they embarrassed to greet people if they're not in the Vajra realm? Zhao Shituan, who had just touched the threshold of the Finger Shen realm, blushed and said, "Old brother Li, you must be joking. These 30 years in the Jianghu are indeed different from the previous 30 years. There are many geniuses and freaks, but there aren't as many Vajras as dogs. His Royal Highness going out to travel is naturally different from ordinary people roaming the Jianghu. If Su Fengyan wasn't the son of the king of Beiliang and his Royal Highness could be hereditary, how could he have met Wu Luding who blocked the river? How could he have met the 11th Wang Mingyin? Even more so, he wouldn't have been humiliated by Shenyuan Jingqing who had just arrived at Mount Longhu. It's not that the Jianghu is changing too quickly, but that old brother Li is following this brat who's too eye-catching. How could a Jianghu person without any ability dare to humiliate himself in front of the heir of Beiliang? Let's not talk about old brother Li. These 100 elite Phoenix Battalion are enough to make a big pot of water. Small fishes and shrimps would have been slapped to death long ago. Li Chungang snorted and said, "What's up with this Shenyuan Jingqing who floated down the bull mound? What's up with your so-called immortal Jinren realm?" The old celestial master stroked his beard and squinted his eyes. "This young man has a tough life. He's very talented, but as the eldest grandson of the Shenyuan family, he chose not to walk the path of martial arts. When he went down the mountain to take the imperial examinations, he fell in love with a Jianghu woman who didn't know how to repay kindness. That woman didn't come from a good background, but she was stubborn. She probably didn't want to be brought up to Mount Huishan. Shenyuan Pan saw the opportunity and used both the carrot and the stick to dual cultivation. As for whether Shenyuan Pan had the intention to force his grandson to practice martial arts, only God knows. In the past 20 to 30 years, Shenyuan Pan had devoted himself to cultivating the joyful Zen and the art of sex. He had no taboos at all. A few yellow crowns from Mount Longhu had been killed by him. However, those Taoist nuns were also strange. After the incident they did not say a word. Instead, they took the initiative to be cauldrons at Yunyu Zhang's side. Xianyuan Pan's ability to control people was impressive. This old bastard was already popular with women when he was young. I heard that in the past 2 years he took a fancy to Xianyuan Jingqing's daughter, Xianyuan Qingfeng. I guess this time he finally crossed Xianyuan Jingqing's bottom line and no longer swallowed it. However, I'm not sure how Xianyuan Jingqing became an immortal Jinren. I only know that this kid has been borrowing books from the Celestial Master residence for the past 20 years. He's always been on good terms with my arrogant nephew, Zhao Danping. How strange, I'll have to ask Zhao Danping later. The old god of swords sneered, looking at his ocean of qi. It's the reverse path of seeking death. It's not worth mentioning. The old Celestial Master said regretfully, if this kid wasn't so eager for success, the land of bliss on the stone tablet would be worthy of its name. The old god of swords spat and said, if he didn't seek death and used his life to exchange for the realm, would he just watch his daughter enter the mouth of that old bastard Xianyuan Pan? Zhao Shituan put his hands in his sleeves and sighed continuously. He frowned and said, Brother Li, do you think His Royal Highness will take over this hot potato? Li Chungang said without hesitation, nonsense, it's at least a battle of Xian Finger against Xian Finger. It might even be the peak battle of celestial phenomenon. Would that kid not go? Zhao Shituan still sighed and said, if that's the case, Jiangdong Xianyuan will really be unable to recover for at least 30 years. Li Chungang sneered and said, Xianyuan and Sword Pool are already a few levels lower than the Wu family sword tomb. Back then, the Wu family sword master came out and defeated 10,000 riders with 9 swords. That's true glory. Xianyuan and Sword Pool are nothing. Can they stand shoulder to shoulder with the Wu family sword tomb? It's all the flattery of those bastards in the Jianghu. Seeing Blue Bird carrying a bamboo basket of hawthorns towards Xiaoyao Temple, the old god of swords asked, are you going to Mount Huishan later? The old celestial master laughed bitterly and said, I'm not feeling well. Li Chungang floated down the wall and said disdainfully, old woman, you still have such matters? Zhao Shituan stared but didn't dare to refute. Li Chungang added insult to injury and said, aren't you afraid that your disciple will be at a disadvantage? The old celestial master suddenly became spirited and said happily, my disciple won't be at a disadvantage. It's not that I'm boasting, but the number of people who can hurt Huang Manor can be counted on one hand. But if you want to kill my disciple, there might be 1 or 2 in Mount Longhu, but there aren't any in Mount Huishan. Next should be a small climax. Chapter 301. The buildings on the Bull Mound were very particular, with a strict hierarchy and complicated rules. For example, the rear courtyard where the eldest branch lived was small, but it had everything. There was also a banquet hall, vermilion lacquer, carved red sandalwood and flying beasts. A large plaque hung on the wall with the words, Heavenly Eternal Winter. There was a courtyard in front and a garden in the back. The east and west wings had a building above them, and there was a large glazed vat half the height of a person in the courtyard. It could hold several thousand caddies of water, and there were 8 or 9 lotus flowers planted there. They were slender and elegant, their roots visible, and a dozen or so fat red carps leisurely swam inside. It was early autumn, and yellow leaves covered the bluestone tiles under the eaves between the red walls and green tiles. No one cleaned the place, so it was cold and cheerless. A woman in a gorgeous palace dress stood in front of the glazed fish vat, holding a small porcelain bowl. She tossed bait into the vat, attracting red carps to swim happily. Her posture was graceful and her expression was languid. A tall and sturdy man in gorgeous clothes walked straight into the courtyard. A maidservant beside the woman hurriedly lowered her head, not daring to look at him. The middle-aged man's hands were on the edge of his onyx belt, and he habitually gave off an arrogant feeling. Even though he should be calling the woman's sister-in-law in this courtyard, he still refused to restrain his arrogance. He raised a hand and waved, driving away the maidservant who was staring at her feet. It was unknown how this submissive maidservant saw the man waving his hand, but she ran toward the door as if she had been pardoned. When she passed by the man, she was fiercely slapped on the buttocks, causing her to pale in fright. The woman with a cold expression was indifferent to this and continued to feed the carps. The middle-aged man walked in front of the glazed vat and extended 2 fingers to stroke the smooth walls of the vat. He smiled and said, Sister-in-law, we're a single man and woman, aren't we doing anything? The woman stared at the carefree red carps and coldly said, Xianyuan Jingxian, aren't you afraid that if you swallow my dumplings, you'll burn your tongue along with your heart, liver, spleen and kidneys? The man who was called by his name by the woman said indifferently, Sister-in-law lives in seclusion, so of course you don't know. After the ancestor came out of seclusion this time, he intends to entrust the position of the family head to me. It's no wonder that sister-in-law doesn't know about this. Sister-in-law and the ancestor haven't dual cultivated for some time, right? The man placed his palm on the colored glass fish tank and abruptly exerted his strength. More than a dozen carps and lotus roots were pulled to the side of the tank and stuck to it, unable to move. He bent down to look at the carps that were struggling on their deathbed and smiled. Xianyuan Jingxian has been drooling over sister-in-law for a long time. This is something that everyone in Mount Hui knows. Once I officially take over this large bull's nest, how could the old ancestor care about an old and worn-out cauldron? That bookworm big brother of mine worships you like a fairy, thinking that you're above the common populace, but he clearly doesn't understand a woman's thoughts at all. He's wasted all those sage books he's read. A woman in her 30s is like a wolf and in her 40s is like a tiger. Once she's tasted the sweet rain after a long drought, how could she endure loneliness? Isn't that right, sister-in-law? The woman was humiliated in such a way, but she remained unmoved. She only looked at the carps that were almost suffocating to death and indifferently mocked. Xianyuan Jingxian, what are you so impatient for? It won't be too late to vent your frustrations when you become the head of the Xianyuan family. That's right, do you remember when you went to southern border 6 years ago? Sister-in-law just happened to see that loyal and unswerving wife of yours on the large bull's bed, but she was extremely seductive. When she first came to Mount Hui, she called me a depraved slut every day. Haven't you wondered why she shut up these past few years? I might as well make it clear to you, it was sister-in-law who pitied her for being lonely, so rather than wasting energy scolding others, she might as well save her energy to serve others in bed. Sister-in-law was so merciful that she earnestly asked old ancestor to shower her with rain and dew. Xianyuan Jingshuan's expression darkened and he paused for a moment. His palm left the wall of the glazed fish tank and the lotus flowers all snapped. Blood seeped out from the scales of the dozen or so carps, and their corpses floated to the surface. Xianyuan Jingxian said the word good 3 times in a row, then grinned maliciously. Xianyuan Jingqing, this big brother can't do anything even after being beaten 3 times with a stick. I didn't expect sister-in-law to be so scheming, knowing how to use small tricks to retaliate. This is for the best. Today I'll carry sister-in-law back. I want to see if there's anyone in the eldest branch who can be as unyielding as sister-in-law. Or perhaps Xianyuan Jingqing will simply wantonly have fun with sister-in-law here. I heard that sister-in-law fell ill from longing for a portrait, so I don't mind hanging that portrait at the head of your bed to liven things up. Sister-in-law, what do you think? Isn't Jingxian much more amorous than Big Brother? The woman calmly gazed at the blood-soaked fish tank and smiled. Compared to Xianyuan Jingqing, you think too highly of him. Xianyuan Jingxian asked, Sister-in-law, when you're in bed later, you'll have to use all your skills. A woman's 18 types of martial arts. Xianyuan Jingxian, you're worse than an animal. An angry roar came from the door. When Xianyuan Jingxian heard the familiar voice, he couldn't be bothered to turn around. He laughed indulgently and said, Qingfeng, I heard that the bastard surnamed Yuan you thought so highly of is already half dead, so your mother's fate today will be your fate in a few years. Uncle has the patience to wait for that day. Uncle might even wonder if Qingfeng already has a young daughter by the time he reaches 60 years of age. In the past, I didn't understand the meaning of the words enjoying the blessings of the land alone, on the stone tablet. But now I understand that this kind of blessings is truly something that only immortals can enjoy. Xianyuan Qingfeng stood at the door, his fingernails digging into his palms. When she saw her daughter, a trace of panic finally flashed through the woman's eyes. She coldly said, Qingfeng, leave this place. Xianyuan Jingxian clicked his tongue and laughed. What a touching mother-daughter relationship. Chapter 302. A series of untimely coughs could be heard. Xianyuan Jingxian was stunned and slowly turned around. When he saw a figure appear in the doorway, he was subconsciously startled, but he was immediately amused by his own panic. He stood next to the large glazed vat and unbridled guffawed. The reason why he was surprised was because Xianyuan Jingxian knew that anyone could set foot in this large sect's inner court except for the man at the doorway. And that man just so happened to be the husband of the woman behind Xianyuan Jingxian. How absurd was this? Back then, his wife in her prime would rather dual cultivate with the old ancestor, causing the eldest son of the first wife to become a laughingstock. She would rather stare blankly at a yellowed portrait for 20 years than look directly at her husband. No one would believe it even if he told them. Xianyuan Jingxian, who was on the verge of tears from laughing, wiped the corners of his eyes with a sinister expression. He remembered the warm scene of the three brothers standing on the Aspiration Cauldron Pavilion's river-gazing platform when they were children, standing on their tiptoes and leaning against the railing. He clearly remembered that his eldest brother said that he wanted to be a civil official whose name would go down in history. His second brother said that he wanted to revive the family's prestige and surpass the Wu family sword tomb, and Xinyuan Jingxian declared that he wanted to be a martial artist like Wang Xinji who could smash the enlightened masters of Longhu into meat patties with a single punch. The three brothers were still as close as brothers at that time, but after they grew up, the three of them had completely different futures. Second brother Xinyuan Jingyi had the demeanor of a great general and was clever in all aspects, absorbing many forces in Jianghu that could not be underestimated. Xinyuan Jingxian himself had made great strides on the martial path and was now on the verge of stepping into the Grandmaster realm. His future achievements would only be greater than his father's. But as for his eldest brother, despite the great expectations and resources the old ancestor had bestowed upon him, he was still a useless piece of trash who could only be submissive when speaking to others and would only retreat when arguing with others. In the Xinyuan family, where martial arts were highly valued, how could a martial arts fanatic like Xinyuan Jingxian respect an older brother who had never touched a sword or a staff and only knew how to hold a few books? After coughing, the middle-aged scholar still did not enter the courtyard. He covered his mouth and said vaguely, "Jingxian, you should have waited a little longer. Unfortunately, you've never had much patience since you were young. This is not good." Xinyuan Jingxian seemed to have heard the funniest joke in the world. He had just stopped laughing when he couldn't help but laugh again. He placed his hands on his agate belt and looked straight at his sickly older brother, Xinyuan Jingqing. "Eldest brother, what do you think I should have waited? Should I have waited for you to become the head of the family with your righteousness and morals? Should I have waited for my niece to become a pitiful cauldron furnace, or should I have waited for my fathers to run out again?" Jingshuan's SS father, Jingshuan's father, but eldest, use my eldest, even my is tus tusizizis. Xinyuan Jingqing loosened his grip and nodded, "Go on." Xinyuan Jingxian chuckled. "I've endured it for many years and I really don't want to endure it any longer. S. 2. Xinyuan Qingfeng's expression changed drastically. The pale-faced scholar slowly said, "But you know that this kind of excessive enthusiasm is like a tree without roots. It has no long-term benefits to the martial path." Xinyuan Jingxian rubbed his stomach and sneered. "You sure are sincere when you say these words. It enlightens me. My stomach hurts from laughing." Xinyuan Jingqing turned to look in the direction of Bull Landing and murmured, "Mount Hui will only be cleaner when it snows heavily in winter. Our family is really too dirty." Xinyuan Qingfeng extended his hand and motioned for his mother to leave the courtyard and stay away from his uncle who had reached the finger-profound realm. But the woman did not move. She would never approach that man of her own accord. The middle-aged scholar stared deeply at her and smiled faintly. There was an indescribable sense of open-mindedness and relief. He, who had never set foot in this courtyard, actually walked over the threshold for the first time. She and Xinyuan Qingfeng were both dazed. Xinyuan Jingxian still had a disapproving and arrogant expression. He sneered, "Big brother, what? Are you going to beat me with a book?" Xinyuan Jingqing shook his head. "Mount Hui cannot be built without destruction. Xinyuan Great Pan has already led Mount Hui down a fork in the road. Today I will turn it back on the right path. In terms of martial talent, you and Xinyuan Jingqing cannot compare to me. You are the finger-profound realm, so I will kill you with the finger-profound realm." The middle-aged scholar spoke unhurriedly. The sleeves of his wide green robe fluttered elegantly. The mother and daughter only saw this man who had stood aloof from worldly affairs his entire life walk straight toward Xinyuan Jingxian. He seemed to be walking slowly, but he arrived in front of Xinyuan Jingxian in the blink of an eye. Xinyuan Jingxian, who was clearly already at the finger-profound realm, widened his eyes. The middle-aged scholar grabbed him by the neck with one hand and continued walking. They passed through the large glazed vat and arrived at the rear courtyard. The scholar stopped and threw Xinyuan Jingxian into the room. His body exploded in midair. The middle-aged scholar, who was bleeding slightly from his 7 orifices, turned around. He seemed to want to reach out and touch his wife, but in the end he did not have the courage. When he passed by his daughter at the entrance of the courtyard, he said softly, "Qingfeng, from now on, you will take care of your mother." The woman suddenly shouted, "Xinyuan Jingqing, where are you going?" The middle-aged scholar continued walking and smiled warmly. "To Bull's Descent Snow Field. After sweeping this house clean, you will be truly free. The saint said that if you do not sweep a house, how can you sweep the world?" Unfortunately, Shenyuan Jingqing can only reach this step in this lifetime. Shenyuan Jingqing does not regret marrying you back then. Chapter 303. Dead. Inside the room, Shenyuan Jingqian couldn't be any more dead. Even the legendary Earth Immortals wouldn't be able to survive if their sea of qi exploded and all their meridians exploded. Outside the room, the woman stared blankly at the shattered glass vat. More than a dozen red carps were hidden among the green leaves of the lotus flowers. Just now, the two of them had passed through the vat in an instant, causing thousands of pounds of water to pour out and wet her embroidered silk shoes. What a cool autumn day. The autumn wind and autumn chill spread from the soles of her feet to her entire body. Shenyuan Qingfeng leaned weakly against the door. Even though she had always been praised by her elders for being able to remain calm during major events, she had lost the ability to think. Her mind was blank. No matter how immoral her uncle Shenyuan Jingqian was, after all, a genuine top-notch martial artist. He had cultivated a Vajra physique for several decades by following the prescribed order. In Mount Hui he was publicly recognized as second only to the great ancestor and Shenyuan Guiqi, who possessed immortal qi. He had even claimed to have entered the mysterious Finger Shen realm. So what if he had just entered the Finger Shen realm and his foundation was still unstable? Only after reaching the Finger Shen realm could one truly become a towering tree that stood tall in the martial arts world. Taoist enlightened masters had hopes of ascending, living Buddhas of Buddhism could become Sariras, and unaffiliated martial artists outside of the three religions were even more ferocious and domineering. How did he die in the blink of an eye? Shenyuan Qingfeng was limited by her mediocre talent and constitution, so she wasn't suitable for martial arts. However, she had read many secret manuals since she was a child and was used to seeing experts fight. She especially had a photographic memory, so her eyes were very sharp. She could see that after Shenyuan Jingqian lost focus for a moment, he actually wanted to kill his opponent very quickly. However, his opponent didn't give him the chance at all. There was probably no way to die in peace more than this. As a Finger Shen expert, he was casually walked up to him and killed in a single move. In that instant, Shenyuan Qingfeng saw through some secrets. Shenyuan Jingxuan's body was like that of a Buddhist heavenly king's Vajra. Although he was still 2 levels away from the celestial phenomenon realm, where both the inside and outside of his body were in harmony with the world, at the very least, his body had already formed a majestic image of its own. The reason why it was shattered with a single strike seemed to be because after being grabbed by the neck, Shenyuan Jingqian had used a tyrannical and vicious method to guide the flow of qi. It was like the tortoise and serpent of the northern black tortoise entangling with each other, which ultimately caused his meridians to explode inch by inch. Shenyuan Qingfeng wanted to say something but hesitated. His lips trembled as he realized that he didn't know what to say. When she saw that her mother was about to turn around and enter the house, she finally gathered her courage and asked, "Mother, are we really not going to Bull's Descent Snowfield?" The woman turned her head and asked, "Are we going to see how Shenyuan Jingqing seeks death?" Shenyuan Qingfeng muttered to himself, "Since father was able to kill Shenyuan Jingqian, it's not impossible for him to." She stepped over the threshold and didn't even look at the badly mutilated corpse. She smiled and said, "So what? If Shenyuan Jingqing is not the Shenyuan Jingqing that we mother and son know, I will regret it so much that my intestines turn green, and I will cry like a weeping beauty to beg him to change his mind. Afterwards, we will treat each other with respect and grow old together at Mount Hui." Tears streamed down Shenyuan Qingfeng's face. "Mother, you really don't feel the slightest bit of heartache?" She smiled and said, I have long since forgotten the feeling of heartache. If you want to go, then go to Snowfield. Mother wants to be alone for a while." An old mama who had watched Shenyuan Qingfeng grow up hurriedly rushed over and respectfully reported, "Madam Miss, for some reason, Lord has gone to Snowfield alone." At the foot of the mountain, someone claimed that Lord had invited him to Bull's Descent Snowfield as a guest. It seems to be that domineering heir of Baelyang. He has already begun to climb the mountain and will soon arrive at East Sect. Those who blocked the way at the estate were all torn apart by an unremarkable youth. His methods were extremely swift and fierce. Rumor has it that the divine swordsman Li Chungang who humiliated our Shenyuan family in the past was also among them. Second Master has already brought people to stop them. After climbing the Bull's Descent Snowfield, there was a jade passageway paved with 300 steps, and a memorial arch built across the road. This was Mount Hui's Shenyuan Sect's East Sect. The words, "Reach the Peak of Perfection," were written on the plaque, and the words, "Martial Dao Contract Kunlun" were written on it. Their neighbor, Mount Longhu, also had a similar structure. All civil and military officials had to dismount from their horses in front of the tablet to demonstrate the reverence of the ancestral court of Taoism. When it came to Mount Hui, it was a reminder to all the Jianghu people who came to visit to voluntarily remove their swords and sabers. It wasn't that there weren't arrogant and boorish martial artists who didn't want to follow the rules, but those who succeeded like Li Chungang could be counted on one's fingers. The vast majority of them were thrown off the bull's descent snow field. The sallow and emaciated Su Longxiang was in a killing frenzy. He was simply invincible. Chapter 304. One must know that Mount Hui was said to be home to nearly 1,000 martial arts elites. The Shenyuan family dominated the southeast and could be divided into several types of people. The first type was the direct descendants of the family who were born with the surname Shenyuan. This branch was led by the third branch of the Mount Hui family. Under the head of the family, Shenyuan Guiqi, there were Shenyuan Jingshen and Shenyuan Jingshen supporting the family. Together, they formed the most luxuriant martial arts tree in the southeast of the dynasty. These people had the innate advantage of being close to the family. Based on their bloodline and talent in martial arts, they could go to the Wending Pavilion to obtain secret manuals. Then there were the lackeys that Shenyuan had raised with both secret manuals and a lot of money. There were two kinds of lackeys. Those who were of noble status were guests and enjoyed good treatment in Mount Huishan. Those who came from humble backgrounds and were not strong enough had to work hard for the Shenyuan family with their tails between their legs in order to earn a living. If Yuan Tingshan did not have a relationship with Shenyuan Qingfeng, he would belong to this camp and had to rely on his own ability to get what he wanted. Then there were the private forces that Shenyuan had carefully cultivated. There were two main forces. One was made up of 200 cavalrymen and 50 heavy cavalrymen who had spent a lot of money. The other was made up of 150 light cavalrymen who were relatively cheaper. The other group was made up of loyal men of sacrifice. Their identities were complicated. Some of them were warriors or rangers who had fled to Hui Mountain to seek refuge. Most of them were assassins who had been slowly cultivated by Shenyuan as pawns since they were young. Very few of them could live to 30 years of age, which showed how active the Shenyuan family was in the southeast Jianghu. His Royal Highness and Huang Manor stood together under the Yi Gate. Beside them stood the old man with the sheepskin fur coat. Blue Bird held the instant spear. Behind them were the halberd Ning Amei and 100 white horses. Near the two gates were a crowd of people. Sabers, spears, staffs and all kinds of weapons were present. Shenyuan Jingshen stood on the steps with a gloomy expression. Close to 100 archers with outstanding arm strength held the geographical advantage, ready to shoot. More than 30 guests had turned out in full force. They were all experts who had been famous in the Jianghu for a long time. Su Fengyan clicked his tongue and sighed. What a turbulent Jianghu. Dark clouds had already gathered overhead, and there was actually a sign of heavy rain. A few decades later, old man Li, who was now one-armed and without a sword, dozed off while standing. He did not say a word. Su Fengyan turned his head and asked, "How far is it from here to the thieves' lair?" The elderly god of swords opened his eyes slightly and said lazily, "It's not too far." Outside of Bull Landing, there was a large piece of flat land, which was the snow plateau. If I'm not mistaken, Shenyuan Jingqing will have a fight with Shenyuan Pan there. It is indeed a good place for people to die. Su Fengyan felt a headache coming on. There are so many first and second-rate experts and a few hundred men of sacrifice. How are we going to get past them? Li Chungang grumpily said, "This old man can easily pass through by himself. As for you, if you want to fight force with force, then you'll have to wait to die here. Do you think that the foundation of a large clan that has been established for hundreds of years is just for show?" Su Fengyan whispered, "To catch bandits, first catch the ringleader?" The elderly god of swords thought for a while and said, "You mean to take down Shenyuan Jingqing?" Su Fengyan smiled and nodded, eager to give it a try. The elderly god of swords rubbed his chin and narrowed his eyes. If this old man were to personally take action, it would be simple. However, without this old man's effort, you'll just sit back and watch the show. Kid, let Huang Man yell first to show your strength and tear a few people apart before talking about anything else. Then let this girl beside you who can play anything but the instant spear hold the fort. When this old man will take action, it will depend on his mood. Don't worry, I won't make you wait too long. This old man was also very curious about how high Shenyuan Jingqing could reach if he did not hesitate to exchange his life for his realm. It was not too rare for heavenly phenomenon experts to fight each other, but it would be interesting if both of them were trapped in a situation where they would fight to the death. If half a land immortal accidentally popped out, it would be a feast for the eyes. Kid, you don't have any other abilities, but you're just SOSO at stealing from others. Looking at Huang Manu taking large strides forward, the elderly god of swords said with slight sadness, "This old man's painstaking efforts back then have been wasted." Shenyuan Jingqing finally appeared after much difficulty, yet he still rebelled. "This big tree has been hollowed out in the hands of Shenyuan Jingqing. In the end it is still going to fall." Great Snow Plateau. The middle-aged scholar walked slowly against the wind. His sleeves fluttered in the wind, making him stand out from the crowd. After enduring silently for 20 years, he finally revealed his loftiness at this moment. Along the way he kept coughing and blood seeped out. No one could see through him. Shenyuan Jingqing thought of many things, good and bad, honor and disgrace, ups and downs. Shenyuan Jingqing stopped and looked at the tall figure at the end of the Great Snow Plateau. He muttered, "I've finally reached here." That figure was abnormally tall and sturdy. This was an old man with a technique to retain his youthful appearance. The old man who had a head full of white hair 20 years ago actually had black hair at his temples. He stood at the entrance of Bull Descendant's mansion without a smile. One man guarding the pass with a majestic aura. This old ancestor, the only one on Mount Hui who had the qualifications to say that he enjoyed the land's blessings alone, had a sharp gaze and a loud voice. "Jingqing, have you ever read To Resonate with Heaven and Earth?" His deep voice surged in the Great Snow Plateau. There was a string of wind chimes hanging under the eaves of Bull Descendant's house. Because of the strong wind at the peak of the mountain, they jingled all year round. At this moment it was silent. Like a person who was about to die with his neck strangled. Shenyuan Jingqing said calmly, "Whether it is a celestial phenomenon or not, we'll know after we try." The old man who had been in charge of the Shenyuan family for 60 years was able to return to his original state after nearly 20 years. He laughed heartily and said, "I'd like to see if this unfilial descendant of yours can endure 100 moves." Shenyuan Jingqing, who no longer needed to painstakingly suppress his realm, raised his hand. He stepped out with his right foot and bent his left foot slightly. He stretched out one hand and pulled back the other. It was too wonderful for words. In an instant, the dark clouds in the sky spun like a tornado and suddenly descended. Shenyuan Jingqing said softly, "I shake Kunlun."